Introduction. Socialism as Anti-Colonial Liberation, Contemporary Lessons from Losurdo, by Jennifer Ponce de Leon and Gabriel, Rockhill. 2. Imagine that social revolution is conceivable without revolts by small nations in the colonies and in Europe, is to repudiate social revolution. Whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see it. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. Lenin. According to Domenico Losurdo, the Russian Revolution inaugurated a new phase of global anti-colonial struggle, providing an example to the world of how to break the chains of imperialism. 2. After fending off 14 capitalist countries that immediately sought to strangle the Bolshevik baby in its crib, according to the choice words of Winston Churchill, the USSR proceeded to construct the first socialist state. The Third Reich picked up where these 14 countries had left off. Funded by the capitalist ruling class, it attempted to conquer and colonize the USSR in order to put an end, once and for all, to this beacon of anti-colonial liberation. The international fascist onslaught, of which Nazism formed a decisive part, was defeated, primarily due to the strength and monumental sacrifices of the Soviet and Chinese peoples. This opened what Losurdo refers to as a second phase of anti-colonial struggle in the age of imperialism. Commonly known as the Cold War, this era was marked early on by an expansion of the socialist world and a triumphant wave of anti-colonial revolutions, as well as horrific imperial aggression against the efforts of people in the regions of the world underdeveloped by capitalism to throw off the yoke of colonialism and neocolonialism. The United States not only took a leading role in endeavoring to enforce neocolonialism across the global South, it also subordinated other imperialist powers, bringing many of their colonial and semi-colonial possessions under its control. The dismantling of the USSR in 1991 opened a third phase of struggle, which commenced with a relatively short-lived moment of imperialist triumphalism. However, capitalist states proved incapable of overcoming their contradictions and repressing revolutionary projects. The resilience and subsequent rise of China is one clear sign among many others that the anti-imperialist project of building a socialist world is alive and well. Losurdo was born in Italy in 1941, at the onset of the Nazis' Operation Barbarossa against the USSR, and thus at the tail end of the first phase of anti-colonial struggle. Living through its second phase, the Cold War, he saw Italy polarized between what was at the time one of the strongest communist parties in Europe, the Partito Comunista Italiano, PCI, and imperial forces intent on rehabilitating fascism to combat communism in order to make Italy into a lackey of the United States and the capitalist camp. A lifelong militant, Losurdo joined the PCI in 1960 at the age of 19. Six originally founded under a slightly different name by Antonio Gramsci and others as a section of the burgeoning Third International 1919. 1943. The PCI had spearheaded the anti-fascist resistance and then emerged as the second largest party in Italy in the wake of the Second World War. The U.S. government was so fearful that it would win the 1948 election that it poured more than $10 million into funding anti-PCI groups, and the CIA made plans for a fascist coup d'etat if the communists won. Even though they ended up losing this particular election, due in large part to imperialist meddling, they remained a powerful political, economic, and cultural force. Losurdo's militant engagements testify to his dedication to what he refers to in his work on Gramsci as a critical communism, which eschews dogmatism in favor of an ongoing process of learning rooted in a concrete analysis of specific historical conjunctures. In the context of the Sino-Soviet split, Losurdo left the PCI in 1969 and then joined the China-oriented Partito Comunista d'Italia (PCDI), an organization named after the original Italian section of the Third International. Through the course of the 1970s, he wrote weekly commentaries and analyses for their newspaper. He continued to maintain his dedication to the international project of anti-colonial liberation through some of the darkest years of counter-revolutionary revanchism and the neoliberal assault on the working class. When the USSR was eventually dismantled in 1991, marking the onset of the third phase of struggle, many Western intellectuals feted the end of communism. Losurdo instead joined the Partito della Rifondazione Comunista, PRC, which repudiated the PCI's social democratic or liberal democratic dissolution into the Partito Democratico della Sinistra, PDS. He later continued his Marxist militancy with the Partito dei Comunisti Italiani, PDCI, which recovered the old name of the PCI in 2016 in an attempt to revive the legacy of this tradition. Losurdo's political commitments and intellectual practice were shaped by his close collaboration with German scholar Erdmut Brielmaier b. 1943, who was also actively engaged in Communist Party politics. The two had met while students at the University of Tübingen, where Losurdo studied. As an exchange student, they later married and moved together to Italy. There, Losurdo worked as a professor of philosophy at the University of Urbino, where he had earlier obtained his doctorate. Brielmaier's work with him made possible his publication of some 50 books on the history of bourgeois thought, Marxism, and the communist movement. As Andreas Wehr explains, Brielmaier proofread his texts, took care of quotations, and procured necessary literature. She was his most important advisor and at the same time took care of the daily things that had to be done at home, which meant that she had his back. Only because of this was it possible for Domenico to be so productive academically and in publishing. 8. Brielmeyer's translation of nearly all of Losurdo's books into German also contributed crucially to the international circulation of his scholarship. It is noteworthy that, in spite of Losurdo's international recognition as a leading intellectual, fewer than 10 of his books are currently available in English. We are thus very pleased to present his penultimate monograph, Western Marxism 2017, as well as the first English translation of an important lecture he presented on the topic in 2007.9. The culmination of decades of research on the history of the Marxist tradition and its internal struggles. It elucidates one of the major splits in global Marxist debates that marked Losurdo's generation and continues to structure many contemporary controversies. He described the emergence of this schism in the 1970s in an interview with Stefano Azzara, a scholar who has authored an insightful book on Losurdo's work. The Eastern Marxists, as he explained, were identified as those who actually exercised power, as in the USSR, Vietnam, Korea, China, Cuba, and so forth. The Western Marxists, by contrast, were intellectuals who opposed these efforts to construct socialism, rejecting the quest for power in favor of diverse forms of critical theory, while sometimes presenting their distance from power as an epistemological advantage for discovering so-called authentic Marxism. Losurdo's geographic references to the West and the East thereby tend to abide by the same logic elucidated by Ewald Ilyankov. The Western world is the part of the world based on private property, while the other part, that is, on the road to collectivization, that is, on the road to socialism and communism, is the Eastern world. 12. Far from being strictly geographic terms, however, Eastern and Western are used more generally to refer to two different political orientations, both of which have manifested themselves around the world. One of them is dedicated to the difficult and drawn-out process of building socialism in a capitalist-dominated world, and in particular, across the global South, which has been the principal site for such endeavors thus far. The other is generally dismissive of such practical undertakings, often belittling concrete struggles against imperialism because they do not live up to an imagined standard of theoretical or moral purity. 13. It is important to recognize that Losurdo is diagnosing a historical phenomenon that extends well beyond the work of self-declared Marxists. He focuses on philosophical currents coming out of the Frankfurt School and French theory, as well as some of the work that is in dialogue with them. While these traditions often draw on Marxism, they tend to treat it as one discourse among others, which they freely combine, in idealist fashion, with bourgeois or even radically aristocratic theories of various sorts. This has led some thinkers associated with Marxism to take explicitly anti-Marxist positions, as we shall see, what the Western Marxists examined in this book share. In common, then, is not their dedication to Marxism per se. Rather, it is their promotion by the US-driven theory industry as the most radical theory on offer. As a result, their work provides the historical foundation and referential basis for so many of the commodities produced by the business of contemporary theory in the imperial core. Much of what Losurdo diagnoses in this book therefore applies mutatis mutandis to many other trends promoted by the theory industry, some of which are openly anti-Marxist, including post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, liberal feminist and queer theory, Afro-pessimism, and so forth. 15. Western Marxism and the politics of defeat. Despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out, and are incapable of struggle. Lenin 16. This book is a rejoinder to Perry Anderson's Considerations on Western Marxism, 1976. The latter's Trotskyist assessment, written in dialogue with the editorial staff of the New Left Review, identifies some key aspects of Western Marxism. However, it is simultaneously symptomatic of many of the problems that Losurdo highlights in this tradition, including its patronizing Eurocentrism, idealism, and complicity with imperialism. Anderson's understanding of Western Marxism, in which he bizarrely includes Communist Party militants Georgy Lukács and Antonio Gramsci, is that it is a product of defeat. The failure of the socialist revolution to spread outside Russia, cause and consequence of its corruption inside Russia, is the common background to the entire theoretical tradition of this period. This purported failure contributed to Western Marxists' withdrawal from parties and into the academy, their shift away from political and economic issues in favor of philosophic and aesthetic concerns, and their injection of pre- and extra-Marxist theoretical elements into historical materialism. At the same time, Anderson asserts that the Stalinization of the communist movement transformed the USSR into a semi-literate backwater and led to an overall weakness of socialist culture, whereas major sectors of bourgeois thought regained a relative vitality and superiority over socialist thought. 19. In this regard, he repeatedly celebrates the radical novelty of the Western Marxists, who indulge in bourgeois culture while abandoning praxis, producing theories that have little to no use value for the struggles of the working and oppressed masses. 20. In perfect line with the precepts of bourgeois culture, and as an apparent rebuttal to the Marxist position that the validity of any claim depends on the primacy of practice, Anderson insists that the pertinent criterion here is not the validity of these innovations, or their compatibility with the basic principles of Marxism. It is their originality. Drawing on the historical experience of Europe, which he describes as, in certain critical respects, the most advanced in the world, Anderson goes on to assert that the innovative spirit of Western Marxism has been able to achieve a sophistication greater than that of any previous phase of historical materialism. 2. Anderson's work was published by New Left Books, later renamed Verso Books, only a year after the Vietnamese people, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, had handed a spectacular defeat to the most powerful imperialist army in the world. However, there is no reference in it to Ho Chi Minh thought, and little to no discussion of Vietnam or other socialist revolutions, aside from the peremptory assertion that they have failed to construct socialism. 23. Lest we forget, which would be easy to do when reading Anderson's book, the socialist world actually witnessed a massive expansion between the Second World War and the mid-1970s. Eastern Europe, liberated from fascism and authoritarian regimes, was integrated into the socialist camp, and revolutionary governments took power in Korea and Vietnam, both of which were drawn-out processes due to brutal imperialist interventions. After the Chinese Revolution of 1949 and China's formal alliance with the USSR in 1950, approximately one-third of the world's population was living in socialist countries. This trend continued, in fits and starts, through the following 3 decades as there was a veritable global surge in socialist revolutions and national liberation struggles, from Cuba to Guinea-Bissau and beyond. This was the precise period during which Anderson penned his Jeremiad on political defeat. It is important to add, moreover, that these socialist advances also contributed to both social welfare compromises and a relative strengthening of revolutionary socialism within the capitalist core. This is easily visible when compared to the subsequent era of counter-revolutionary revanchism known as neoliberalism. The supposed defeat that is the hallmark of Western Marxism, according to Anderson, actually only applies to Europe, and more precisely, Western Europe. Moreover, it only really means that communists did not succeed in seizing state power in the West, as they nonetheless exercised significant political, economic, and cultural influence. From the point of view of the global working class, this period was one of major advances and some remarkable victories, including the incredible rout of fascism, the global weakening of imperialism through successful anti-colonial struggles, and the imposition of democratic reforms and social welfare provisions in the West. From Anderson's vantage point as a prominent theorist in the imperial core, these achievements were apparently of little import, presumably because they did not bring about theoretical innovations of the sort cherished by intellectuals of his ilk. With the exception of the early Lenin, read as a progenitor of Trotsky, Anderson suggests that Eastern Marxists did not make any major theoretical contributions. The fact that they actually made revolutions, mobilizing theoretical and practical knowledge to raise millions of people out of abject conditions of slavery, exploitation, and oppression, pales in comparison to the intellectual novelties of Western theorists promoted as major commodity producers by Anderson's publication, Platforms. From the perspective of this grandee of the Western theory industry, it appears that the exchange value of Marxist theory, which is augmented by novelty and originality, is more important than its use value for human liberation. These positions are typical of Western Marxism, as it is understood and analyzed by Losurdo. Anderson's book is in fact a repository for many of its major themes: idealism and the primacy of theory, Eurocentric social chauvinism, in the sense of an attitude of patronizing cultural superiority, the dogmatic rejection of actually existing socialism, a politics of defeat based on historical misrepresentations, a willful dilution of Marxism with bourgeois theory and petty bourgeois theoretical practices, a celebration of marketable novelty at the expense of practical relevance, and self-promotional opportunism that perpetuates cultural imperialism and disdain for Marxism in the global South. 25. In the postscript to his 1983 quasi-sequel to Considerations on Western Marxism, Anderson laid his cards on the table by peremptorily asserting that socialism did not exist anywhere in the world, but that it should nonetheless remain an object of theoretical debate. Ironically, this was the same year as the socialist revolution in Burkina Faso led by Thomas Sankara. The reason for this is because of the purported need for a third way, meaning a social order beyond both capital and bureaucracy, i.e., actually existing socialism. The closest he comes to describing this anti-socialist intellectual orientation is by claiming that an open and inventive Marxism should simply no longer be Marxist, but instead find its province in a flexible balance between anarchism and Fabianism. 28. Third way politics of this sort has regularly been criticized by Marxists, who have identified it as an expression of a petty bourgeois class position, particularly within the imperialist core. Nikos Poulantzas, whom we do not necessarily follow on all issues, provided a lapidary summary of these critiques. The petty bourgeoisie actually has, in the long run, no autonomous class political position of its own. This simply means that in a capitalist social formation there is only the bourgeois way and the proletarian way, the socialist way. There is no such thing as the third way, which various theories of the middle class insist on. 29. Regarding Anderson's specific third way endorsement of Fabianism and anarchism, it is worth briefly recalling the long-standing Marxist critiques of both of these traditions. As Anderson presumably knows, Fabianism opposed the Socialist League, which was strongly supported by Engels, and distinguished itself from the start by declaring anti-imperialism central to the definition of socialism in the Marxian conception. In its manifesto, the Fabian Society openly embraced imperialism and rejected the principle of the self-determination of nations, which was central to Lenin and the Bolsheviks. As Zach Cope explains, the ideologically predominant Fabian section of the British Independent Labour Party was in the majority imperialist. Fabianism sought to weld socialism, narrowly defined as a more egalitarian redistribution of Britain's wealth, to the expansionist nationalism of British imperialism. As early as 1902, J. Hobson had underscored the existence of Fabian imperialists, a point that Lenin emphasized as well in his critique of the social imperialists more generally, meaning those who, like the opportunist Fabian Society, were socialists in words and imperialists in deeds. Moreover, Lenin's foundational critique of petty bourgeois revolutionism, which smacks of or borrows something from anarchism, includes a perfect summary of Anderson's overall orientation. The petty bourgeois, driven to frenzy by the horrors of capitalism, is a social phenomenon which, like anarchism, is characteristic of all capitalist countries. The instability of such revolutionism, its barrenness, its liability to become swiftly transformed into submission, apathy, fantasy, and even a frenzied infatuation with one or another bourgeois fad, all this is a matter of common knowledge. Losurdo, we can see here, is clearly following in Lenin's footsteps by redeploying and updating his insightful critiques of petty bourgeois radicalism, a la Anderson. Unlike Anderson and other Western Marxists, Losurdo begins with the primacy of practice and always centers the colonial question. His study of Western Marxism is not an ideological analysis that focuses solely on superstructural elements, nor is it an imminent critique or an ad hominem attack that lambasts these thinkers for their individual ideas. On the contrary, as in his other work, he elucidates the objective forces driving the ideology of Western Marxism, which he sees as a cultural product of the imperialist core. This is surely one of the reasons why he uses geographic terminology. It is not to imply that all Marxists in a particular region necessarily suffer from the same ideology, which would be reductivist. It is rather that there are very real material forces that foster within the imperialist center a particular ideology that can and should be resisted. One of the goals of the book, as the subtitle specifies, is precisely to reinvent Western Marxism beyond this anti-socialist ideology. Unlike many of the thinkers analyzed in this work, and in counter-distinction to Anderson's glorification of intellectual originality unmoored from practical validity, Losurdo does not concoct theories out of whole cloth. He also does not indulge in discursive chicanery or proliferate references to the latest theoretical commodities in order to market his work. On the contrary, all of his writings are characterized by a sober analysis of concrete reality that is profoundly historical. He clearly sought to understand and learn from material practice in such a way that his theoretical work is first and foremost grounded in the elucidation of the objective world. For it is practice itself that is the ultimate arbiter of truth, not the so-called marketplace of ideas or some imaginary realm of pure thought. Objective ideological critique of the Western left. One cannot live in society and be free from society. The freedom of the bourgeois writer, artist, or actress is simply masked or hypocritically masked dependence on the money bag, on corruption, on prostitution. Lenin 35. In a letter to Franz Mehring in 1893, Friedrich Engels wrote, "Ideology is a process which is, it is true, carried out consciously by what we call a thinker, but with false consciousness. The actual motives by which he is impelled remain hidden from him, for otherwise it would not be an ideological process. Hence, the motives he supposes himself to have are either false or illusory." 36. These illusory motives, Engels goes on to explain, are those of pure thought, meaning that the thinker in question assumes that their ideas originate in a conceptual realm, independently of concrete material reality. Rejecting this idealist approach, he proposes instead a materialist analysis of the objective forces that condition one's subjective thoughts, while simultaneously impeding one's conceptual apprehension of said forces. This account of ideology as false consciousness is central to Losurdo's work. In a telling passage in one of his books, he invokes Christopher Columbus's plan to reach the East Indies by sailing west from Europe as a useful metaphor. 37. Although the Italian explorer's subjective aspirations were to discover a western passage to the East Indies, the objective nature of the world made it such that he actually landed in the West Indies. From a dialectical point of view, subjective thoughts always need to be situated within the objective material world. The latter is primary, as the example of Columbus shows, since his subjective will could not bend objective reality to it. However, the relationship between these two dimensions is dialectical. They mutually inform one another because our apprehension of objective reality is itself mediated by subjective factors. Columbus thought the world was different than it actually is, insofar as we currently understand it. Ultimately, there is no God's eye view, so any apprehension of objective reality is mediated by subjective experience, which is itself conditioned by this very same reality. Losurdo's analysis in this book seeks to bring to the fore the objective social forces that have produced Western Marxism as a remarkably consistent ideology in imperialist countries, as well as in class strata in the periphery that aspire to imperialist rewards. As At the same time, it eschews mechanical explanations or reductivisms in favor of a complex and nuanced account of the dialectical play of forces between subjects and objective reality. This is attested to, among other things, by the fact that Losurdo himself was a Marxist working in the Western world who critically diagnosed and rejected its dominant ideologies in favor of supporting the anti-colonial struggle to build socialism. Losurdo draws extensively on V.I. Lenin's resounding diagnosis and trenchant indictment of chauvinism and racism in the socialist movement within imperialist states. Many of Lenin's searing critiques of revisionism, meaning the gutting of Marxism's revolutionary core, center on a condemnation of the social chauvinism that plagued European members of the Second International, 1889-1916. The Bolshevik leader criticized as opportunists those who supported the First World War, lining up on the imperial agendas of their national bourgeoisies against the interests of the global working class. In his 1915 text on the collapse of the Second International, he explained, "By social chauvinism we mean acceptance of the idea of the defense of the fatherland in the present imperialist war. Justification of an alliance between socialists and the bourgeoisie and the governments of their own countries in this war. A refusal to propagate and support proletarian revolutionary action against one's own bourgeoisie, etc." It is perfectly obvious that social chauvinism's basic ideological and political content fully coincides with the foundations of opportunism. It is one and the same tendency. In the conditions of the War of 1914-15, opportunism leads to social chauvinism. The idea of class collaboration is opportunism's main feature. 38. Lenin not only critiqued social chauvinism among European workers, he also identified its material basis in the imperialist world system. In his 1916 essay on imperialism, which set much of the political agenda for the Third International, he argued that the imperialist extraction of monopolist superprofits from peripheral societies had created a labor aristocracy among the European working class, resulting in their embourgeoisement, that is, their identification with the interests of their own national bourgeoisies, over and against those of their fellow proletarians in other countries. 39. Lenin's foundational elucidation of imperialism's tendency to exacerbate uneven development and the stratification of the global working class, as well as his insistence on the right of nations to self-determination, have served as a basis for countless subsequent analyses that seek to identify the material foundations of racism and chauvinism. It should be noted, moreover, that his theorization of dependency, superexploitation, and the regional differentiation of labor has also been widely used to analyze racialized social and labor hierarchies that obtain within single nation states, including in what has been subsequently identified as internal colonialism. 40. Losurdo demonstrates how the social chauvinism of many Western Marxists expresses itself in paternalistic attitudes toward the efforts of workers and peasants in the peripheries to struggle against imperialism. Like Lenin, he situates this condescending mindset as a legacy of the Second International, whose material basis is found in the socio-economic relations of the imperialist world system. Those who enjoy the wages of imperialism are more likely to have disdain for or disinterest in the complex struggles for national liberation in the periphery, which is dismissed as the savage barbarism of the East, in the choice words of Max Horkheimer, which equally represented the views of his close collaborator Theodor Adorno. 41. This chauvinistic attitude has become so foundational to Western Marxism that theorists in this tradition often behave as if there were no need to actually study the history of socialist states in any serious manner. In fact, the attempt to do so is often looked upon with suspicion as a sign that one might be a bore siding with the slaves, rather than a professional intellectual with a keen sense of what is worthy of scholarly inquiry. Michel Foucault is a case in point, since he rejected what he referred to as the totalizing approach of Marxism in favor of occupying the position of a specific intellectual who only addresses topics within his or her areas of expertise. Yet the author of The Order of Things readily pontificated about the death of socialism, even though he had little to no knowledge of its international history. According to this specific intellectual, who was purportedly opposed to totalizing narratives, everything that this socialist tradition has produced in history is to be condemned. The colonial geography underlying Foucault's chauvinism and ultra-crepidarianism could not be clearer, and it is to be found in the work of many of his fellow Western intellectual grandees. While the history of Western Europe, his privileged object of study, is infinitely complex and requires expert knowledge, the class struggles of workers and peasants in the imperial periphery can be dismissed out of hand as misguided without even studying them. Many Western Marxists have therefore come to embrace a form of critical theory that is skeptical of all forms of power and domination, while simultaneously celebrating the moral excellence of those who are oppressed and bereft of power, whom Foucault, like his anti-communist ally André Glucksmann, referred to as the plebe, Jacques Rancière calls the demos, and so on. Losurdo refers to this tendency as populism, and he identifies it as one of the major leitmotifs in Western Marxism. Thinkers like Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, for instance, express their sympathy for the oppressed but refuse to side with them if they gain real power and, in particular, control of the state. Citing their clear positions on this issue, Losurdo points out with trenchant irony that this ultimately means that they are on the side of the oppressed as long as they are losing. 43. He shrewdly recalls that this is the same position that G.W.F. Hegel criticized in Christians who, in order to accomplish their obligation to serve the poor, needed the institution of poverty to persist indefinitely. Those intellectuals Losurdo refers to as populists are generally skeptical of, if not opposed to, political parties, as well as the exercise of state power. For them, getting organized through the party form, like seeking to take over the state apparatus, inexorably leads to new forms of oppression that besmirch the moral excellence of the downtrodden. This is one of the reasons why rebellionism is another leitmotif in Western Marxism, celebrating insurgency and revolt for their own sake, often devoid of context or concrete political content. Many Western Marxists exalt the figure of the rebel, whom they present as anti-dogmatic, radically free, and morally superior to those denigrated as authoritarian, state-centric socialists and party intellectuals. Yet this libertarian orientation, which segues in key ways with liberal ideology, only amounts to what Losurdo calls a dogmatism of the subject, a thoughtless embrace of the figure in revolt, which is an obvious projection of Western Marxists' own self-image qua petit bourgeois enfants terribles. As he explains, drawing on important insights from Gramsci, rebellionism can lend itself to distinct and even opposed political projects, the deep and expansive. History of dissident politics clearly demonstrates this point, since the right-wing and often philo-fascist dissidents promoted by imperialist governmental agencies like the CIA were, and are, rebels opposed to socialist states. Slavoj Žižek, arguably the most contumacious of Western Marxists, first came to public attention as an anti-communist dissident. In the late 1980s, he candidly explained, "I myself was personally engaged in undermining the Yugoslav socialist order. Although much of what this pro-Western parvenu from the East writes is an unhealthy hodgepodge of sophistic chicanery, anecdotal triviality, and puerile provocation, he does indeed have a well-documented history of working as a dissident against the communist government of Yugoslavia. He was the main political columnist for a prominent dissident magazine that the Yugoslav Communist Party accused of being backed by the CIA. He also co-founded the Liberal Democratic Party and ran for president of Slovenia against the communists, advocating for planned privatizations and proclaiming like a dutiful capitalist ideologue. More capitalism in our case would mean more social security." 6. Those Western Marxists who do appear to propose some kind of alternative to the extant order often traffic in magical thinking and a belief in the most suspect forms of idealist, utopian salvation. Losurdo details how this type of Marxism has grafted itself onto religious ideologies deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Messianism is their lifeblood, and it is another motif of Western Marxism. Although the precise forms it takes vary considerably, there is a general tendency to project a vision of the future as totally other than what currently exists. Such a future cannot therefore be arrived at through the telluric path of extant institutions, including the rule of law, parliaments, parties, states, and so forth. In extreme ultra-leftist cases, all of this and much more needs to be abolished. The new world aspired to, since it is totally other, must break with everything and arrive on the scene, more or less miraculously. In Alain Badiou's version of Messianic Marxism, to take but one obvious example, this occurs through an inexplicable event that calls upon individuals to convert themselves into subjects by asserting their faith in its reality and taking it upon themselves to reconfigure the extant situation based on their fidelity to the unexplainable. Anyone with even scant familiarity with the story of Christ cannot fail to grasp the ideological progenitor of what Badiou has marketed as his grand new idea of communism qua constitution of a community of the faithful, under the banner of his philosophic brand. Losurdo is a realist who advocates for scientific socialism over and against the utopian socialism, anarchism, and defeatism of the Western Marxists. Socialism does not fall from the sky, nor is it simply the desideratum of an individual, or for that matter, a combination of both a la Badiou. Communism is not merely an idea or a desire, as figures like Badiou and Žižek have contended. Losurdo opposes theories and discourses of this sort, which combine wish fulfillment with what one can only hope is willful ignorance. Communism, he maintains with Marx and Engels, is the real movement which abolishes au fait the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the now existing premise. 7. The verb aufheben here does not refer to a total negation of capitalist society, as he reminds us in the present book, but to a negation that is also, crucially, an assumption of certain aspects of extant society, the bourgeois cultural apparatus and the compatible left. All revolutions fail forant. Everyone knows it, we pretend to rediscover it here, with the anti-communist writings of André Glucksmann and François Furet. You have to be a complete idiot debile not to know that, Gilles Deleuze. It is not the least bit surprising that Losurdo, while a prominent and important thinker, has by no means been promoted by the imperial theory industry in a manner comparable to the Western Marxists, whose global class standing and ideology he diagnoses with such remarkable acumen. In capitalist societies, the bourgeoisie does not only own the overall means of production after all, but it also owns and controls the means of intellectual production. Universities, research centers, think tanks, publishing houses, the press, the mass media, and so forth. The ruling class has a vested material interest in policing the limits of acceptable discourse, if forced to accommodate some form of Marxism, its preference for idealist discourses. Openly hostile to actually existing socialism is very well established. These discourses often promote, moreover, the dynamics of cultural imperialism, and they are promoted in turn by the bourgeois cultural apparatus, which peddles them around the globe as the only valid version of Marxism. Western intelligence agencies have been deeply involved in this project by running expansive and extremely well-funded propaganda campaigns aimed at redefining the very nature of the left. As CIA officer Thomas Braden candidly admitted, the goal of these endeavors has been to promote the compatible or respectable left, which is opposed to actually existing socialism. In much of Europe in the 1950s, he explained, socialists, people who called themselves left, were the only people who gave a damn about fighting communism. This is why the CIA lavishly funded anti-communist leftist intellectuals and promoted their work around the world. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF, one of its most important front organizations, has been described by Hugh Wilford as one of the largest patrons of art and culture in the history of the world. It established offices in 35 countries, mobilized an army of about 280 employees, published or supported some 50 prestigious journals around the world, planned or sponsored 135 international conferences and seminars, published at least 170 books, ran a press service whose reports reached 5 million readers, and much more. Prominent Western Marxists such as Horkheimer participated in its junkets. Others, like Adorno, had their work published and translated in its journals, while directly collaborating with CIA agent Melvin Lasky, who took the lead in the German anti-communist Kulturkampf. In 1975, when the Church Committee released its report on the U.S. intelligence community and its abuses, the CIA admitted that it was in contact with many thousands of academics in hundreds of institutions, and no reform since has prevented it from continuing or expanding this practice. The opportunism of the Western Marxists that Losurdo critiques must be understood via an analysis of class interest. They are all professional intellectuals ensconced in elite networks in the global north and are part of what some call the new petty bourgeoisie, meaning the professional managerial class stratum in the imperialist core. Afraid of proletarianization below, attracted to the bourgeoisie above, while often being resentful of its overlords but devoid of a long-term collective political project, the new petty bourgeoisie sometimes celebrates jackeries and supports greater access to power for its social group. However, it does not generally seek concrete system change because it does not want to break the ladders by which it imagines it can climb. 2. It is here that it becomes clear that many of the Western Marxists within this class stratum occupy the position of radical recuperators, presenting themselves as representing the interests of the oppressed, but devoid of a practical program for social transformation. They ultimately seek to recuperate potentially insurgent forces within the capitalist order by guiding the masses towards symbolic or discursive solutions, such as consumerism within the confines of the imperial theory industry. This false solution to very real problems has the added benefit of bolstering the social standing of the petty bourgeois producers of these intellectual consumer goods. Most Western Marxists have understood, at least implicitly, that in order to climb the social ladder in the capitalist world, they need to give to the system of knowledge production what it demands, in particular, opposition to actually existing socialism. In return for this, they will be festooned by the very system they feign to oppose. If they pursue their social ascendancy as the enfants terribles of capital with the rabid alacrity of a Zizek, they might even make it, like him, into the list of the top 100 global thinkers in foreign policy, a journal with ties to the U.S. State Department. This philosophic grifter's best idea, according to this magazine with links to the engine of U.S. imperialism, should be no cause for surprise. The big revolution the left is waiting for will never come. 3. Losurdo chose a different path characterized by a profound integrity and a humble dedication to the emancipation of the global working and oppressed masses. Rather than allowing himself to be determined by the objective forces of his existence as a professional intellectual in the West, he engaged in a self-critical examination of the very conditions of possibility of his intellectual production. This was surely facilitated by his being in constant dialogue with political parties and the global communist movement. His work is thereby a testament to the fact that subjective freedom is not enhanced by ignoring the objective forces that determine our thoughts and actions, but precisely by recognizing the extent to which our worldviews have been conditioned by social determinants. This form of objective ideology critique, meaning criticism of the objective determinations of our individual ideology, rooted in the economic base and global class struggle, is precisely what his work demands. Those in the imperial core need to ask if their assumptions about the world are not largely a consequence of forces, like the deep history of imperialism, of which they remain, perhaps willfully, ignorant. Socialism or imperial barbarism in the 21st century. The struggle against imperialism for liberation from colonial or neocolonial shackles, which is being carried out by means of political weapons, arms, or a combination of the two, is not separate from the struggle against backwardness and poverty. Both are stages on the same road, leading toward the creation of a new society of justice and plenty. Ernesto Che Guevara, 54. One of the dominant slogans of neoliberal ideology, proffered by Margaret Thatcher, holds that there is no alternative to capitalism. It is a historical irony that many Western Marxists, who are nominally committed to building a world beyond capitalism nonetheless, accept Thatcher's dictum. Ostensibly desiring an alternative to capitalism while regularly denigrating historical efforts to construct socialism has, in effect, produced an idealist version of Tina. The latter holds that the sole alternative to capitalism exists as an unrealized potential that only coheres in the ideas of professional intellectuals, but certainly not in the practices of people in socialist societies unless, in extreme cases, they are consigned to brief eruptions in the past. This idealist anti-capitalism, hegemonic in the West's supposedly radical intelligentsia, not only acquiesces to Western imperialism's triumphalist claims about the end of socialism, it also often accepts the ruse that imperialism no longer structures political and economic relations around the world. Hart and Negri's empire is one infamous example of such an account. 55. These two tendencies go hand in hand, as the dismissal of imperialism undergirds the denigration of socialist states' struggles against it, including and especially via their efforts to develop in order to avoid being turned back into colonies or semi-colonies of the imperialist powers. The confluence between this idealist version of Tina and support for imperialism is readily visible in the work of the illustrious director of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer. Although he never tired of dismissing actually existing socialism as barbaric and even fascist, he declared his unwavering support for the U.S. anti-communist intervention in Vietnam. This was his justification in America when it is necessary to conduct a war, and now listen to me. It is not so much a question of the defense of the homeland, but it is essentially a matter of the defense of the Constitution, the defense of the rights of man. Some 30 years later, the co-author of Empire, Michael Hart, repeated Horkheimer's claim nearly verbatim. NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia, which was part of the neo-colonial, neoliberal counter-revolution and openly violated international law, was not the deed of American imperialism, he flatly declared, but was actually intended to safeguard human rights. Losurdo's work offers an invaluable antidote to this anti-communist and pro-imperialist tendency within Western Marxism. He demonstrates how neoliberalism, which emerged in the 1970s and continues today, has always been an imperialist project aimed not only at rolling back gains made by the global working class, but specifically at countering the efforts of colonized and formerly colonized people to resist imperialist subordination. 58. He also provides a sober historical materialist analysis of actually existing socialism, which makes patently clear that an alternative to capitalism is not just an idea, but a practical process that may be long, but is well underway. The People's Republic of China, PRC, the largest and most prominent socialist state-building project, is central to Losurdo's understanding of the contemporary world. He has mobilized his extensive knowledge to dismantle myths about it promulgated by the Western bourgeoisie and its ideological gatekeepers, notably that it is capitalist and imperialist. 59. He has also foregrounded China's remarkable ability to learn from the successes and failures of socialist projects, including its own and those of the Soviet Union. Its ongoing revolutionary program is thus deeply rooted in what Losurdo calls a process of learning and a long-term commitment to building socialism. Step by step, he rejects the tendency on the part of certain Western Marxists to fetishize and misrepresent the Cultural Revolution as a great but lost opportunity to create a revolution within the revolution. He also critically dismantles the widespread idea in the West that the leadership of Deng Xiaoping led to a fulsome embrace of neoliberal capitalism. Against these established Western positions, Losurdo demonstrates how China's developmental project, not unlike Lenin's new economic policy in the USSR, has integrated elements of capitalism in order to develop the productive forces and gain access to the advanced science and technology of the West. 60. As Losurdo argues, Deng was integral to the project of liberating Marxism-Leninism from populist and pauperizing tendencies in order to develop socialism as the project of eliminating misery and fostering common prosperity. This does not mean that he idolizes Deng or simplistically champions him over Mao, nor does it imply that he misrecognizes the important foundations laid in the early decades of communist rule in China. It is rather that he advances a more dialectically nuanced understanding of the evolution of Chinese socialism that rejects the assumption, widely held in the West, that the reform and opening up constituted an abandonment of its fundamental principles. For independent nation-states that have historically been subject to colonial or neo-colonial domination, their struggle for national liberation has passed from a political-military phase, Losurdo argues, to a political-economic phase wherein the development of the productive forces is of paramount importance. 62. Development is needed if these countries are to maintain independence and avoid being subordinated to imperialist powers through relations of economic dependency. It is also required to meet the needs of people who have been subject to great privation owing to the conditions of underdevelopment imposed upon them. The PRC's gains on this front are remarkable, a fact recognized by sources that could not be suspected of pro-China bias, such as the World Bank. When the communists came to power in 1949, China was an underdeveloped country with a largely illiterate population that had suffered from a century of humiliation, meaning foreign conquest, capitalist rapine, and subordination to imperialist powers. In over 70 years of Communist Party rule, the country has been completely transformed. Life expectancy, which was only around 30 years in the late 1940s, has been increased to 77 years, surpassing life expectancy in the United States. 63. Aggregating data from multiple sources, including the World Bank. John Ross argues that China's rate of increase of life expectancy in the 3 decades after 1949 was the fastest ever recorded in a major country in human history. Ross also marshals extensive evidence to demonstrate that in 7 decades, China's economy will have gone from being only 1/6 the size of the U.S. to overtaking it. 60. This has required monumental sacrifices on the part of the Chinese people, which is one of the contradictions inherent in socialist development, in part because it does not rely on colonialism like capitalist development. However, the government has also set its sights on overcoming these and other contradictions. In this regard, it has overseen the greatest poverty alleviation program in the history of humanity, lifting 850 million people out of extreme poverty, more than the entire population of Latin America. The PRC also launched the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, in 2013, an ambitious project aimed at improving global infrastructure and fostering mutually beneficial economic growth. Offering a model for development that stands in stark contrast to the neo-colonial and imperialist paradigm promoted by the dominant capitalist countries, the BRI has attracted, as of fall 2023, the participation of 151 member countries. 67. China has also been a driving force behind BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other international projects aimed, among other things, at developing trade and organizational infrastructure for a multipolar world. The Chinese development model offers a crucial alternative to the capitalist West, as the Chinese Communist Party seeks a form of modernization, characterized by people-centered development and the harmonious coexistence between man and nature. China has John Bellamy Foster notes. China has implemented major ecological reforms, even as it has sought rapid economic growth aimed at bringing China up to a level with the West. These include pollution reduction, reforestation and afforestation, development of alternative energy sources, imposing restrictions in sensitive river areas, rural revitalization, food self-sufficiency through collective means, and the reduction of reliance on coal. Moreover, the PRC acknowledges that economic growth will need to be slowed in the coming decades in order for China to meet its stated goals of implementing an ecological civilization and reaching net zero carbon emissions by the mid-21st century. 71. Losurdo was always careful to avoid the idealist belief in anything like a perfect model, and he acknowledged the historical contingencies of class struggles. 72. While noting ongoing battles within the Chinese Communist Party between a primarily nationalist current and one with broader communist ambitions, he did not purport to predict their outcome. Nonetheless, he had a deep understanding of the world historical significance of China's socialist project. It is aimed at overcoming what he called the Great Divergence, or the international division of humanity between the labor aristocracy in the capitalist core and the workers and peasants in the colonial or semi-colonial periphery. China, he wrote, is the country that more than any other is challenging the international division of labor imposed by colonialism and imperialism and furthering the end of the Columbian epoch, a fact of enormous progressive historical significance. 73. Although many Western Marxists unquestioningly refer to China as authoritarian, capitalist, or even dictatorial, the PRC is a representative and consultatory, whole-process people's democracy founded on socialist principles of party control of the state and the towering heights of the economy. 74. There is indeed a capitalist sector and even a capitalist class stratum that has been allowed to operate in China, but it does not control the state or key pillars of the economy. Having emerged within a capitalist-dominated world and faced with the very real choice of develop or die, this has been a tactical decision for socialist China. Its overarching strategy of building socialism, however, has been clearly outlined and maintained, according to Losurdo, by the likes of Deng and now Xi Jinping. The PRC is by no means the only example of successful socialist state-building projects, and much could be added here about other important examples, but it is certainly the largest and most visible. This is precisely why the capitalist powers, and in particular the United States, are intent on subordinating China and attempting to overthrow its leadership. In spite of all of the propaganda that they pump out to demonize China, the power elite understands full well the reality behind its lies. The PRC is a very real threat to its imperial dominion. It refuses to return to the status of a colony or semi-colony, and it offers an alternative framework of international development that is more attractive to most of the world than the imperialist model imposed by the West. Class struggle in theory, from Lenin to Losurdo. Socialism or barbaric imperialism with an increasing risk of human annihilation. This is the basic choice that humanity faces in the early 21st century, when nuclear war and complete ecological collapse are imminent possibilities. The Western Marxists, as Losurdo predicted, have continued their practice of gesturing toward a magical beyond, while pursuing the terrestrial task of advancing their careers, opposing socialism in the real world, and, in numerous instances, openly supporting imperialism, as in Zizek's fulsome support for the US-led proxy war in Ukraine. 75. Losurdo invites us, instead, to contribute to the collective project of developing the rich tradition of critical communism. 76. Such an orientation endeavors to learn practical lessons from the global history of class struggle, rather than seeking refuge in the realm of ideas and purported theoretical blueprints. This requires engaging in an ongoing process of learning and humble self-critique based on objective reality and the primacy of practice, thereby contributing to the difficult but necessary project of charting uncharted territory, namely that of collectively building and supporting a world of common prosperity. For Western Marxism, and the Western left more generally, to shift its orientation, such self-critique is absolutely necessary, and Losurdo's work is an invaluable guide to this ideological realignment. 77. In 1918, when the recently minted USSR was being invaded and the imperialist barbarians were literally at the gates, Lenin reached not for a gun but for his pen. As if there were no more urgent task, which might seem shocking given the situation, he wrote a fiery reply to Karl Kautsky titled The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. From the vantage point of this peerless leader of the Russian Revolution, one of the most pressing tasks was to reorient the global communist movement away from Kautsky's social chauvinist support for imperialism. This required engaging in class struggle. In theory, fighting for the hearts and minds of the working and oppressed of the world, likely with the hope that the revolution would spread or, at a minimum, that the imperialist armies would lose some workers from their ranks. Although written in a very different context, Losurdo's work is characterized by a similar urgency and accountability to the needs of the struggle. In a world facing intensifying capitalist degradation and imperialist barbarism, with the increasing threats of nuclear apocalypse and the thoroughgoing destruction of the biosphere, it forces us to reply to the same straightforward question posed by Lenin: which side are you on, that of the imperialists and their well-paid ideological lackeys, or that of the people in their struggle for liberation and a sustainable world? Note from the translators and editors. Losurdo's referencing system is somewhat idiosyncratic. The translators and editors were able to fill in certain gaps. The edition of the book cited missing page numbers, some unreferenced quotations, generally when an endnote occurs. At the end of a paragraph, the quotations within that paragraph derive from the source cited in the note. In some places, the reverse is true. An end note covers quotations in succeeding paragraphs. The context is critical in these cases. There are a few cases in which it was not possible to find the exact source. In most of these, the editors found a source that conveys the ideas expressed in the text, and they created an appropriate endnote. Acknowledgements. I was helped in the bibliographical research and correction. The text by Stefano Azzara, Paolo Ercolani, Elena Fabrizio, Giorgio Grimaldi, who edited the Index of Names, and Aldo Trotta. To all of them, my thanks. Premise. What is Western Marxism? This book takes its title from a 1976 book in which an English philosopher, Marxist, and communist Trotskyist militant invited Western Marxism to finally declare its total distinctness and independence from the caricature of Marxism in the officially socialist and Marxist countries, all of which were in the East. The Soviet Union was particularly targeted. There, notwithstanding the October Revolution and the example of Lenin, Marxism was by now a memory of the past. Stalin and collectivization had put an end to all serious theoretical work. Nor did People's China come out much better. To see it as an alternative model meant confirming the political heterogeneity of Western Marxism. The condemnation included the Western communist parties, characterized by their absolute loyalty to Soviet positions and therefore were also de facto Eastern or Easternizing. The indictment did not spare even the party of Gramsci and Togliatti, which had constantly wedded affirmation of the universal value of the October Revolution with emphasis on the profound political and cultural differences between the East and the West, and so with theorizing the necessity of developing a national path to socialism, one adequate to the needs of countries in the West. The English philosopher was implacable. No intellectual or worker within a mass communist party of this period, not integrated into its leadership, could make the smallest independent pronouncement on major political issues. 2. And so, the figure of Gramsci was converted into the official ideological icon of the party, invoked on every public occasion, while his actual writings were manipulated or neglected. How the obtuse guardians of an arid cultural desert succeeded in attracting en masse fierce and sophisticated intellectuals, exercised an extraordinary influence and hegemony over Italian culture, and enjoyed great international prestige remains a mystery. Perry Anderson was not the first to note the divergence between Western and Eastern Marxism. Writing in the early years of the Cold War, an eminent French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, observed, "The revolutionary politics which, in the perspective of 1917, was historically to take the place of liberal politics, occupied with difficult organizational problems, with defense, and with improvements, has become more and more a politics for new countries, the means for semi-colonial countries, or for civilizations long since paralyzed, to change to modern modes of production. The immense apparatus that it constructed, with its disciplines and its privileges, at the moment that it shows itself to be efficacious for building an industry, or for putting a new proletariat to work, evacuates the terrain of the proletariat as the ruling class and forfeits the mystery of civilization which, according to Marx, the Western proletariat carried." The previous year at Dien Bien Phu, the powerful army of colonialist France was soundly defeated by the Vietnamese movement and the People's Army led by the Communist Party. Everywhere in Asia, echoes rang of the strategic victory of anti-colonialism that had brought about the founding of the People's Republic of China. Yes, communism was revealed as the leading force of the anti-colonial revolution, and once in power, of the accelerated development that the semi-colonial economies urgently needed. These were undeniable results and successes, but, asked the French philosopher, were they part of the communism that the Western proletariat had the historic mission of building, at least in the eyes of Marx and of Western Marxism? 5. Here we encounter the expression Western Marxism for the first time. It was not, however, contrasted positively to the Eastern kind. If anything, only in the context of a complex critique of Marx and communism could Western Marxism constitute the principal object. Once the initial hopes for a radically new society and for the withering away of the state apparatus vanished, one conclusion emerged. Today's communism verges on progressivism, and progressivism cannot ignore the concrete conditions of the country or the area in which political action takes place. Done once and for all with the messianic prospect of the total regeneration of humanity, it was necessary to go on a case-by-case basis. Where there is a choice between famine and the communist apparatus, the decision in favor of the latter goes without saying. And probably for the French philosopher, the decision went without saying when it was between colonial subjection and anti-colonial revolution, especially led by the communists. The West, however, presented a very different picture. Was the communist revolution really necessary and beneficial? And what would be its concrete results? This stance had many weaknesses. To better refute it, the French philosopher accentuated the messianic tendency in Marx and Engels. He did not consider that they speak of the withering away of the state, and sometimes of the withering away of the state in a strictly political sense. Only the former formulation can be accused of messianism and of anarchism. Second, Merleau-Ponty avoided interrogating the possible relationship between the end of colonialism in all its forms and the building of a post-capitalist society. Third, and above all, can we consider the anti-colonial struggle as an exclusive problem of the East? To support the struggles against colonial and neo-colonial subordination, absolving those responsible for such policies would be inadmissible. And not only for ethical reasons. The two world wars had demonstrated that colonial expansionism flowed through ruinous inter-imperialist rivalries to have a global impact. The flames ignited a few years earlier by Hitler in his attempt to build the German colonial empire in Eastern Europe had ended by burning down the West as well, and Germany itself. Having made this criticism, the French philosopher deserves credit for being the first to have identified the objective socio-political reasons that led to the bifurcation between the two Marxisms. In the East, and in practically all of the countries where communists had taken power, the principal problem of political leadership was not the withering away of the state apparatuses, but how to avoid the danger of colonial or neo-colonial subjection, and how, therefore, to make up for backwardness in relation to the more industrially advanced countries. Merleau-Ponty was far from disavowing Eastern Marxism in the name of the Western version. If we want to find a precedent for Perry Anderson's attitude, we must search elsewhere. Before the British and the French, philosophers, Max Horkheimer in 1942, called attention to the turn that had occurred in the land of the October Revolution. The Soviet communists had abandoned the abolition of the state to concentrate on the problem of accelerated development of the industrially backward fatherland. It was a fitting observation, unfortunately, formulated as a contemptuous condemnation. The Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow, and to regret or be indignant over the fact that the Soviet leaders were not worrying about how to realize the ideal of the withering away was grotesque. Hitler, in his way, would have shared such regret and indignation. The German philosopher did not realize that the behavior he reproached had enabled the Soviet Union to escape from the colonialist subjection and slavery that the Third Reich sought to impose on it. The desperate struggle waged in the East to resist a colonial war of decimation and enslavement seemed irrelevant to a philosopher who appreciated not Marx's program of the revolutionary transformation of what exists so much as the pursuit of a remote future ideal of a society free of contradictions and conflict, and therefore without the need for a state apparatus. More than a quarter of a century later, Horkheimer returned to the theme of the abolition of the state, albeit referring this time not to the authors of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, but rather to Schopenhauer. On the one hand, he paid homage to Marx. The time has come to finally make the Marxian doctrine, in the West, one of the principal materials of teaching. On the other, he expressed his annoyance with the idea that, in many Eastern countries, Marxism serves as a useful ideology for making up the advantage gained by the West in industrial production. The Marxian doctrine celebrated here bore no relation to North Vietnam's development of its productive forces, occupied as it was with defending itself against a barbaric aggression that was ready to use chemical weapons. But nevertheless, Horkheimer indulged and even supported it. As in 1942, so it was in 1968. Looked with disdain at the dramatic struggles in the East that were not a subjective choice, but dictated by an objective situation, but without recourse to this expression. Western Marxism had already turned its back on that of the East. We must ask, when did the bifurcation between the two Marxisms begin? With the rise of Stalin's autocracy, as Anderson maintains? And if, instead, we find it was already present the day after the turning point of 1917? And if the first cracks had already emerged when unity appeared as firm as ever, cemented by the chorus of indignation over the foul butchery of the First World War and the capitalist imperialist system accused of provoking it? And if the cracks and the subsequent alienation, beyond those of different objective conditions and cultural traditions, are because of the theoretical and political limits from the start of Western Marxism, that most sophisticated version, battle-tested on the academic plane? It was a long road to the manifesto in which Anderson proclaimed the excellence of Western Marxism, finally liberated from the suffocating embrace of Eastern Marxism. A bright new life seemed to be on the horizon for the former. In fact, its premise was suicidal. We are dealing with important but largely ignored political and philosophical chapters of history that my book seeks to reconstruct, with the aim also of interrogating the prospects for a rebirth on new bases of Western Marxism. Part 1, 1914 and 1917, The Birth of Western and Eastern Marxism. 1. The turning point of August 1914 in the West. The history that I propose to reconstruct begins between August 1914 and October 1917, between the outbreak of the First World War and the victory of the October Revolution. On the wave of these two epochal events, Marxism experienced a global diffusion that projected it well beyond the Western borders, where it had been confined since the Second International. There is, however, another side to the triumphal coin. The encounter through culture, geopolitics, and economic social conditions among very different peoples stimulated an internal process of differentiation, with the emergence of contradictions and conflicts unknown previously. To understand these, we must interrogate the deep-seated motivations that led to one adhering to the communist and Marxist movements that took form in those years. In the West, the radical, indeed apocalyptic historical turning point is undoubtedly represented by the scale and the flames of the First World War. The exhaustion, disgust, and indignation over the interminable slaughter promoted the rapid spread of the communist movement. What had already happened in Italy in the months or even weeks that preceded the rise of the Bolsheviks to power is symptomatic. Between February and October 1917, 2 delegates of the provisional government constituted in Moscow after the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy arrived in Turin to contact an allied country in the ongoing war and to counter rising pacifist tendencies. Before they had even arrived, the delegates made clear their hostility to the Bolsheviks, who demanded immediate peace. But when Kerensky's emissaries appeared on the balcony of the Sicardi Palace, the crowd of 40,000 workers that had been waiting for them started shouting, "Viva Lenin!" It was, to be exact, August 13, 1917. 10 days later, barricades went up to support the anti-war opposition, resulting in Turin being declared a war zone and the creation of military tribunals. We could say that the mass of protesters and rebels joined the October Revolution before it had even occurred and joined it on the wave of anti-war struggle. In our day, it is politically correct to speak of October 1917 in Russia not as a revolution, but rather as a coup d'etat. Except that we see the protagonist of this supposed coup provoke an almost revolution thousands of kilometers away before it had even taken power. This happened because his name and the party he guided were inextricably connected to an unequivocal condemnation of the war and the socio-political system accused of provoking it. This spiritual climate explains the formidable attraction that the October Revolution exercised in the West not only on the masses, but also on intellectuals of the highest level. One thinks of Georg Lukács. In his autobiography, he recalls, "My interest in ethics led me to the revolution. This interest was one with his opposition to the war. He saw this opposition as constituted by the most elementary forms of morality. I was sharply opposed to it from the outset. My hostility to positivism was partly politically motivated. For all my condemnation of conditions in Hungary, this did not mean I was prepared to accept British parliamentarism as an alternative ideal, but at the time, I perceived nothing with which to replace the existing order. From that point of view, the revolution of 1917 was a great experience since. It made clear that things could be otherwise. Whatever view one took of this, otherwise, it made a decisive difference to all our lives, or at least to the lives of a considerable proportion of our generation." Analogously, Ernst Bloch writes, speaking of the young Hungarian philosopher and himself, "At the start of the war in 1914, we felt completely lost. This war became a decisive factor in the development of each of us. For him, the link with the communist movement was both a support and a refuge. Even without forming organic relationships with the party and the communist movement, on the plane of ideas, the young German philosopher reached conclusions not dissimilar to those of the young Hungarian philosopher." Later, Bloch would write that he took in the Russian Revolution as an unprecedented liberating jubilee. In the spirit of utopia, composed mainly during the war years, a period among the most infamous in history, he wrote that if Europe, responsible for the war, prompts eternal death, the fact that the country of the October Revolution resisted the aggression of this or that capitalist power was to be celebrated. Yes, there stands, unbowed, a Marxist republic in Russia. In any case, more than ever, he called for the true total revolution invoked by Marx that will realize freedom and signal the beginning of world history after prehistory. The October Revolution was the truth finally discovered of how many had worked to make concrete the struggle against the war, even against the genocide Völkermord that was occurring. We turn this time to the language of 2 leaders of the socialist and anti-militarist movement, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. The future leaders of the October Revolution, some of whom had been educated in the West, also read and experienced the First World War as the definitive demonstration of the intrinsic horror of the capitalist imperialist system and the absolute necessity of overthrowing it. To give a few examples, Bukharin spoke of the horrid factory of corpses, and Stalin of mass extermination of the life forces of the people. The picture painted by Trotsky was particularly eloquent. The work of Cain of the patriotic press of the two opposed sides was the irrefutable demonstration of the moral decadence of bourgeois society. Yes, humanity had fallen back into a blind and shameful barbarism, trying to set fire to a contest of bloody folly by using the most advanced technologies too. Militaristic ends, it was a scientific barbarism, which raised up the greatest discoveries of humanity only to destroy the foundations of civilized social life and annihilate the human race. All the good that civilization had produced had been drowned in blood and the filth of the trenches, health, comfort, hygiene, the usual everyday relationships, the bonds of friendship, professional obligations, and in the last, analysis, the apparently indestructible rules of morality. Later, but still regarding the catastrophe that broke out in 1914, the term Holocaust emerged. On August 31st, 1939, Molotov accused France and England of having rejected the Soviet policy of collective security in the hopes of unleashing the Third Reich against the USSR, without hesitating thereby to provoke a new great massacre, a new Holocaust of the nations. 2. The turning point of October 1917 in the EAST. In Asia, the First World War did not arouse the same emotions as in Europe, not only because the battlefields were thousands of kilometers away. In the colonies and semi-colonies, the capitalist colonialist system had revealed its terrible capacity for oppression and violence well before August 1914. For China, the tragic turning point was the Opium Wars, to neutralize the British narco-traffickers and put an end to the opium trade whose devastating effects were, by this point known to all, the Taiping Rebellion erupted. Between 1851 and 1864, the bloodiest civil war in the history of the world, with an estimated 20 million to 30 million dead. After powerfully contributing to provoking it, the West became its beneficiary, since afterward it extended its control over a lacerated and even more defenseless country. A historical period opened that saw China crucified, the Western butchers were joined in the meantime by Russia and Japan. To the foreign bombardments and the most terrible insurrections in her history were added great natural cataclysms, to which the country, falling apart, could offer no resistance. Almost certainly, the number of victims involved had never been so high in the history of the world. Compared to this gigantic tragedy, the outbreak of the First World War is a small affair. Asked to intervene alongside Great Britain, Sun Yat-sen, the president of the republic born of the revolution of and the overthrow of the Manchu dynasty, replied in a famous letter to Lloyd George that quarrels among whites did not concern the Chinese. 8. The victory of one or the other side would not have changed anything in the oppressive behavior of the capitalist and colonialist West. What did provide a scintilla of hope at the end of the tragic era that began with the Opium Wars and made Sun Yat-sen enthusiastic was the rise of the Bolsheviks to power. That promised to put an end to the war, but also, above all, to colonial slavery. This second aspect led the Chinese leader to draw up the balance sheet on a chapter of history whose end could finally be glimpsed thanks to the October Revolution. The Indians in America have been almost destroyed by them, and a similar fate loomed over the other colonized peoples, including the Chinese. Their situation was desperate, except that the 150 million Slavs have risen to speak a word of justice for the oppressed nations, and to oppose imperialism and militarism. So, without anyone expecting it, a great hope was born for humanity, the Russian Revolution. Imperialism didn't take long to respond. The great powers attacked Lenin, because Lenin engaged in the actual work of liberation and self-determination. But humanity would not easily renounce the possibility of liberating the oppressed peoples from colonial domination. Certainly, Sun Yat-sen was not a Marxist nor a communist, but from the great hope he described in sometimes naive but moving language, we can understand the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, on July 1, 1921. In light of all this, the characterization of the 20th century as a brief century, that, according to Eric Hobsbawm, began with the traumatic experience of the First World War, is affected by Eurocentrism. An anti-literam critic of this view emerged from the speech on December 26, 1920, that the delegate of Indochina gave at the Congress of Tours of the Socialist Party of France. You all have known that French imperialism entered Indochina half a century ago. In its selfish interests, it conquered our country with bayonets. Since then, we have not only been oppressed and exploited shamelessly, but also tortured and poisoned pitilessly. Plainly speaking, we have been poisoned with opium, alcohol, etc. I cannot, in some minutes, reveal all the atrocities that the predatory capitalists have inflicted on Indochina. Prisons outnumber schools and are always overcrowded with detainees. Any natives having socialist ideas are arrested and sometimes murdered without trial. Such is the so-called justice in Indochina. In that country, the Vietnamese, discriminated against, they do not enjoy safety like Europeans or those having European citizenship. After making these grave accusations, the delegate from Indochina, who much later would become famous worldwide as Ho Chi Minh, concluded, "We have realized that the Socialist Party's joining the Third International means that it has practically promised that from now on, it will correctly assess the importance of the colonial question." Notwithstanding the cautious language, which was intended to avoid conflict, a point emerges. Clearly, the turning point in world history is not August 1914, when a tragedy that had been occurring for a long time in the colonies spread to Europe. Rather, it was October 1917, that is, the Revolution, that brought hope for the end of this tragedy to the colonies. Lenin stressed the horror of colonialism. The most liberal and radical personalities of Free Britain become regular Genghis Khans when appointed to govern India. 11. He had Marx's lesson on Ireland to back him up. Marx blasted liberal England's treatment of Ireland, a colony, even if located in Europe. It is a policy even more ruthless than Tsarist and autocratic Russia carries out in Poland. Indeed, it is a terroristic policy that is unheard of in Europe and can find an analogy only among the Mongols. Just as we see in the appeal launched by Ho Chi Minh to his party comrades to not lose sight of the colonial question, the lessons of Marx on the macroscopic terms of exclusion from liberal freedom find more attentive listeners in the East than in the West. It is the first such relevant difference, but it will certainly not be the last. In Europe, because the rejection of the war inspired the choice of revolution. Critics of the existing order aimed mainly at the state apparatus and the military. Lukács denounced obligatory conscription as the most abject slavery that has ever existed, and condemned the Moloch of militarism that devoured millions of human victims. Some years later, Walter Benjamin built on the critique of obligatory military service that was at the heart of militarism, understood as the obligation of the universal recourse to violence as a means for pursuing the ends of the state, to proceed to a global condemnation without the appeal of the existing order. The last war revealed the infamy of which it was capable. In an early unfinished 1915 essay on Dostoevsky, Lukács, horrified by total mobilization, the military code, and the execution squads, defined the state as organized tuberculosis and as organized immorality, manifested externally as will to power, as war, as conquest, as vengeance. Yes, says Bloch, the state reveals itself as a discrete, heathenish, satanic coercion materiality. It was necessary to do away once and for all with this monster, may it have a Bolshevistic function for a time as a transitionally necessary evil. It is the patriotic or chauvinistic pathos that feeds the militaristic state, the insatiable Moloch that devours men. And against this as well, Bloch breathed words of fire. The murderous coercion of universal conscription served not the nation as official ideology pretends, but the capitalist stock exchange and the Hohenzollern dynasty. Except that, together with patriotic and chauvinistic pathos, the very idea of nation itself ended up being rejected as well. To the rhetoric of the native soil and the traditionalism of Vaterland are counterposed the truly Christian idea of humanity and medieval universalism, which know no national or state borders. The influence of anarchism is quite evident, just as it is evident in Benjamin, who, aside from denouncing obligatory military service, ended up identifying and jointly criticizing violence, law, and power. It would be in vain to search for these anarchistic tones in the Marxist and communist movement that was forming in the East in the wake of the October Revolution. It is a difference whose foundations can be discerned already in the discourses of Lenin. During the war, with his eyes fixed on Europe, the great revolutionary repeatedly denounced militarization and total mobilization as military slavery imposed on the population. 17, it was not. Only the front that was regimented by the code of war and by terror. The rear was transformed as well, even in the more advanced countries, in cases of martial law for the workers, written and published while the butchery of war was at its most furious, and on the eve of the revolution called forth to end it. State and Revolution formulates the thesis that the victorious proletariat needs only a state which is withering away. It is the necessary but transitory evil that Bloch talked about. In another vein, Lenin defined imperialism as the presumption of being model nations and attributing to themselves the exclusive privilege of forming states. In other words, beyond its economic sacking of other countries, he characterizes imperialism by its political oppression of nations and hierarchy. The exploited and oppressed were branded as incapable of governing themselves or constituting independent states. The struggle to shake off this stigma was a struggle for recognition. It was about liquidating colonial subjection to construct an independent national state. What inspired the revolution of colonial peoples was not the password of a state that is withering away, but a state that is being built. We can well understand the tones that resounded from the East. Take Sun Yat-sen. He had long lived abroad and searched for motivations and inspiration to help overthrow the dilapidated Manchu dynasty and found the first Chinese Republic. He, therefore, can't be accused of xenophobia. However, he summarizes the thinking of the anti-colonial movement, including its communist faction, to preserve their privileged position in oppressed countries as well as their supremacy over the world, the imperialist powers are advocating the doctrine of cosmopolitanism to make the world submissive and obedient. These do everything they can to discredit patriotism as something narrow and illiberal. Behind Sun Yat-sen's position, as with the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, lie two events. On July 25, 1919, Lev Mikhailovich Karakan, Vice People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, declared that Soviet Russia was ready to renounce all territorial and other acquisitions of the Tsarist Empire on Chinese soil, and to annul all unequal treaties that China signed under threats of bombardment and invading armies. 21. That summer, the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War, transferred to Japan the privileges in Shandong that Imperial Germany had stripped from the Beijing government. A great wave of protest developed in China, the May 4th movement, from which emerged not a few of the leaders and militants of the Chinese Communist Party. By then, it was clear to all that the Western democracies, having waged war against the Central Empires, raising the banner of freedom and self-determination of peoples, would not hesitate to perpetuate the semi-colonial condition of China. The only hope came from the country and the movement arising from the October Revolution, to which Chinese communists looked, deciding to put themselves to the test in the struggle for national liberation. As Mao Zedong put it was through the Russians that the Chinese found Marxism. Before the October Revolution, the Chinese were ignorant of Lenin and Stalin and did not even know of Marx and Engels. The salvos of the October Revolution brought us Marxism-Leninism. 22. While he was occupied with the war of national resistance against Japanese imperialism, which sought to subject all of China and to make the Chinese their colonial slaves, Mao recalled his first introduction in the last years of the Manchu dynasty to the cause of revolution. In this period, I also began to have a certain amount of political consciousness, especially after I read a pamphlet telling of the dismemberment of China. After I read this, I felt depressed about 23. The future of my country, and began to realize that it was the duty of all the people to help save it. More than a decade later, on the immediate eve of the proclamation of the People's Republic, Mao recounted the story of his country. He invoked in particular the resistance to the powers involved in the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion against the Manchu dynasty, and against the Qing, servants of imperialism, the war against Japan in 1894-1895, the war against the aggression of the Allied forces of the Eight Powers following the Boxer Rebellion, and finally, the revolution of 1911 that broke out against the running dog of imperialism, the Qing dynasty. So many struggles, so many defeats, how to explain the overthrow, which finally came about, Mao observed. For a long time in the course of this resistance movement, that is, for over 70 years from the Opium War of 1840 to the eve of the May 4th movement of 1919, the Chinese had no ideological weapon with which to defend themselves against imperialism. The ideological weapons of the old die-hard feudalism were defeated, had to give way, and were declared bankrupt. Having no other choice, the Chinese were compelled to arm themselves with such ideological weapons and political formulas as the theory of evolution, the theory of natural rights, and of the bourgeois republic, which were all borrowed from the arsenal of the revolutionary period of the bourgeoisie in the West, the native home of imperialism. The Chinese organized political parties and made revolutions, believing that they could thus resist foreign powers and build a republic. However, all these ideological weapons, like those of feudalism, proved very feeble and in their turn had to give way and were withdrawn and declared bankrupt. The Russian Revolution of 1917 awakened the Chinese, and they learned something new. Marxism-Leninism in China, the Communist Party was born, an epoch-making event. Since they learned Marxism-Leninism, the Chinese people have ceased to be passive in spits and gained the initiative. The period of modern world history in which the Chinese and Chinese culture were looked down upon should have ended from that moment. 24. If, in the West, communism and Marxism are the truth and the weapon to end war and pull it up by the roots, in the East, communism and Marxism-Leninism are the truth and the ideological weapon to end a situation of oppression and being looked down upon by colonialism and by imperialism. It is a project that began with the Opium Wars, even before the founding of Marxism, Leninism, and Marxism as such. In 1840, Marx was still a university student. It was not Marxism that provoked the revolution in China. It was the age-old resistance, the ongoing revolution of the Chinese people that found and became aware of itself in Marxist or Marxist-Leninist ideology and put an end to colonial domination. A few days after giving the above-cited speech, Mao declared, "Ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation. We have stood up. The era in which the Chinese people were regarded as uncivilized is now ended." 25. Let's return to the delegate from Indochina, who in 1920 spoke at the Congress of the French Socialist Party. When asking the party to join the Communist International, he still called himself Nguyen Ai Quoc, or Nguyen, the patriot. He did not see any contradiction between internationalism and patriotism. Indeed, the latter, in the situation in which Indochina found itself, was felt to be a concrete expression of internationalism. Some decades later, having become the leader of Vietnam, which at least in the North had begun to taste independence, Ho Chi Minh urged the young to commit themselves to study, calling on them as follows: 80 years of slavery have diminished our country's strength. Now we must retrieve the heritage bequeathed to us by our ancestors. Will Vietnam achieve fame and glory? Will her people occupy an honorable place on par with the other peoples of the 5 continents? 27. 9 years before his death, on the occasion of his 70th birthday, while one of the most barbaric colonial wars of the 20th century raged in Indochina, Ho Chi Minh recalled his intellectual and political journey at first, patriotism, not yet communism, led me to have confidence in Lenin, in the Third International. 28. What led to such an emotional reaction were the appeals and the documents that had promoted the struggle for the liberation of the colonial peoples, emphasizing their right to constitute themselves as independent national states. The theses of Lenin on the national and colonial question aroused in me great emotion, enthusiasm, great faith, and helped me see the problem clearly. In his testament, after having called his fellow citizens to the patriotic struggle and to the commitment to save the fatherland, Ho Chi Minh added up his balance sheet. With my whole life, body and soul, I serve the fatherland, I serve the revolution, I serve the people. 4. The money economy in the West and the East. Seen as a consequence of the imperialist contest for market domination and for raw materials, and the capitalist hunt for profits and for superprofits. But above all, as a moralizing key, the product of the Arisakra fames a cursed hunger for gold, rather than as the result of a determinate social system. The First World War aroused in the West a spiritual climate that found its most significant expression in Ernst Bloch. In his eyes, the transcendence of capitalism must involve liberation from the materialism of class interests as such, and the abolition of poverty and all questions of economics. To that, not even the great revolutionaries have paid sufficient attention. Man does not live by bread alone. As extensively important as the external may be, and must be attended to, it still only suggests. It does not create, for human beings, not things, not their powerful process, outside of us and wrongly turned over onto us. Invent history. What must still come economically, the necessary economic institutional change, is defined by Marx, but the new man, the leap, the power of love and of light, morality itself, has not yet been allotted the desirable degree of autonomy in the definitive social order. Indeed, as Bloch emphasized in the first edition of The Spirit of Utopia, the Soviets in power in Russia were called upon to end not only every private economy, but also every money economy, and, with this, the mercantile morality that consecrates all that is most evil in man, together. With economic power, it was power as such that must be questioned. In the final analysis, the transformation of power into love must be accomplished. 2. Walter Benjamin observed, the modern economy, seen as a whole, resembles much less a machine that stands idle when abandoned by its stoker than a beast that goes berserk as soon as its tamer turns his back. In other words, it was not about making the machine of the economy more efficient or less devastating, thanks to a revolutionary upheaval. Instead, it was about caging, or perhaps annihilating that beast, that notwithstanding every socio-political transformation, continues to be the economy as such. Among the principal protagonists of the slaughter provoked by the imperialist competition was Russia, where, after the October Revolution, there likewise spread a vision that looked with disdain at the economic world in its totality, and not incidentally, therefore, screamed at the scandal of the new economic policy, NEP. The NEP, begun in 1921, followed on the heels of a war communism that brought an egalitarian but desperate and coerced asceticism. It is a very different vision from that just analyzed above regarding the West, and it was recalled by a Soviet Communist Party militant in the 1940s. We young communists had all grown up believing that money was done away with once and for all, recalled one Bolshevik in the 1940s. If money was reappearing, wouldn't rich people reappear too? Weren't we on the slippery slope that led back to capitalism? Only with difficulty and faced with charges of betrayal could Lenin bring to the center of attention the problem of economic development in a backward country that had exited the First World War and the Civil War devastated, and now had to confront an international situation thick with peril. Right before his death, Stalin felt obligated to engage in a polemic against those who, in the name of the struggle against capitalism, sought to end commercial production and commodity circulation and do away with the money economy. The situation was very different in China. Let's look at what happened in the liberated areas governed by the Communist Party from the late 1920s. The anti-communist Kuomintang and the Nanking government sought to force the communists to capitulate through military force and economic strangulation. During his travels, Edgar Snow observed, trade between red and white districts was prohibited by Nanking, but by using small mountain roads and by oiling the palms of border guards, the Reds at times managed to carry on a fairly lively export business, taking raw materials from the Soviet districts, the transport corps in the service of the State Trade Bureau, or the cooperatives, exchanged them for Kuomintang money and needed manufactures. Demonized in Russia and in Europe as an expression of a greedy and rotten world that needed to be demolished once and for all, the money economy and trade were instead synonymous here with physical survival and the defense of the revolutionary project to save China and to build a new and better world. The contrast between the East and the West was further accentuated in the succeeding years. After the rise of fascism and Nazism in Italy, Germany, and Japan, the struggle for wages and better conditions of life challenged production and war efforts, the aggressor's war machine, and the champions of revived colonial expansion. With mass rage over the Japanese invasion of China, we find what Mao defined as the identity between the national and the class struggle. From that moment, the commitment was to production and economic development because, above all, in the liberated zones controlled by the Communist Party, these were simultaneously integral to the national and class struggle. It is understandable, then, that even in the heat of battle, Mao would call on the communist leaders to give great attention to the economic dimension of the conflict. In the present war conditions, all organizations, schools, and army units must make great efforts to grow vegetables, breed pigs, collect firewood, make charcoal, expand handicrafts, and raise part of their own grain supply. At all levels, the leading personnel in the party, government and army, organizations, and schools should master all the skills involved in leading the masses in production. No one who fails to study production carefully can be considered a good leader. Let's return to the delegate from Indochina at the Congress of Tours in December 1920. We saw him travel for a long time in the West. Why? Trong Chin, who in 1930 participated with Ho Chi Minh at the founding of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, explains. Judging from his testimony, the future leader of Vietnam stayed in France to obtain a cultural education in that country and also science and technical knowledge. Analogously, starting with Sun Yat-sen, so did the Chinese revolutionaries. In Europe between 1896 and 1898, Sun became one of the most diligent frequenters of the library at the British Museum, the library so dear to Marx. Except for the future first president of the Chinese Republic, it wasn't about studying capitalist economics. The dominant interest of Sun remained the secret of the West, that is, technology in its various aspects and above all military technology. Later, intellectuals who went abroad in work-study programs and were committed to stealing the secrets of the West made notable contributions to the founding of the Communist Party. Some were destined to play major roles: Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, and Chen Yi. They found themselves in Paris at the same time as Ho Chi Minh, who may have helped put them in touch with French communists. It was a movement that was not foreign to Mao Zedong. Speaking with Snow, he referred to his decision not to travel to Europe. I felt that I did not know enough about my own country and that my time could be more profitably spent in China. This does not mean diffidence toward those who made a different choice. Mao continued to tell his story. Before leaving China, referring to the students enrolled in the work-study programs in France, these students planned to study French in Beijing. I helped organize the movement, and in the groups who went abroad were many students from the Hunan, Mao's home province, normal school, most of whom later became famous radicals. 1. This helped to create a division of labor. If Mao remained in China to deepen his knowledge of a country the size of a continent, other young revolutionaries went to France to obtain the West's culture and make themselves co-participants with their compatriots. Common to each was the conviction that to achieve national redemption, China needed to critically assimilate the science and technology of the countries that imposed the colonial and semi-colonial yoke on it. Zhou Enlai is illuminating in this regard. After being one of the leaders of the student movement of May 4, 1919, and having spent a year in prison because of it, he left for France. 42. The anti-colonial movement, which had organized large protests in China's public squares, momentarily traveled to one of the most advanced Western countries to learn science and technology. Some decades later, Deng Xiaoping called on his country to not lose sight of an essential point. Science is a great thing, and we should recognize its importance. 3. Faith in science and technology was not shared in the West. Bukharin, who, from 1911 moved back and forth between Europe and the United States, before returning to Russia in the summer of 1917, denounced the monstrous growth of the state apparatus that had occurred since the outbreak of the war. This is the new Leviathan, beside which the fantasy of Thomas Hobbes looks like a child's toy. By now, everything has been mobilized and militarized, and this fate also involved the economy, culture, morals, and religion. Not even medicine and bacteriology had escaped. In fact, all of the enormous technical, economic, and ideological machine had been transformed into an enormous death-dealing machine. We encounter a brilliant analysis of what will later be called totalitarianism. But one has the impression that this analysis tends to connect science and technology too strictly to capitalism, imperialism, and war. It is a recurrent tendency in the culture between the two wars in Germany and the country that perhaps more than any other between 1914 and 1918 was involved in the development of chemical arms and in the systematic application of science to the operations of war. Benjamin observed that for imperialists, technological sense resided exclusively in dominion over nature, which could also be utilized for war. In this sense, technology had betrayed humanity and transformed the nuptial bed into a bloodbath. 12 years later, before going willingly to meet death to escape his persecutors, Benjamin, in his theses on the philosophy of history, raises a cry of alarm. The progress in the mastery of nature and in the exploitation of nature could only go hand in hand with a frightful regression of society. The formidable war machine of the Third Reich was the radical and tragic refutation of the illusion, long cultivated by the workers and socialist movement, that science and technology could be in themselves instruments of emancipation. 45. The ideological climate described here ended up influencing an author organically linked to the communist movement. Lukács, in History and Class Consciousness, seems to identify the growth of mechanization with dehumanization and reification. In some ways, as has been rightly observed, the author of this work gives proof of hostility toward the natural sciences, something entirely foreign to all previous Marxist literature. That is, to a Marxism that had not yet passed through the horrors of the application of science and of technology to the operations of war. Independently of war, the devastating crisis of 1929 and the consequent mass unemployment are considered in the West as having demonstrated that technological progress was far from synonymous with emancipation. Leaving behind her initial sympathy for Marx, Simone Weil wrote, "The present production system, namely big industry, reduces the worker to the position of a wheel in the factory and a mere instrument in the hands of his employers. Any hopes in technological progress were vain and misleading. 8 years later, referring to the Great Depression, Horkheimer observed that machines have become means of destruction, not merely in the literal sense, as happened in the First World War. They have made not work, but the workers superfluous as happened following the crisis that exploded in 1929.49. All in all, we can say that a concern dear to anarchism had made a comeback between the two wars. Let's read Bakunin. And in this day and age, what is it that constitutes the principle underlying the power of the state? Why, it is science. Yes, science. And above all, military science with all its tried and tested weaponry, these formidable instruments of destruction which work wonders, the science of genius which has conjured up steamships, railways, and telegraphy, which, by turning every government into 1,000 armed Briareus, giving it the power to be, act and arrest everywhere at once, has brought about the most formidable political centralization the world has ever witnessed. In the eyes of the anarchist leader, not only on the battlefield but also in the factory, science and technology had revealed themselves to be synonymous. With domination and oppression, we need only list the machines, and every working man and honest advocate of the emancipation of labor would accept the justice of what we say. Therefore, bourgeois must be rejected and combated in the same way as bourgeois. Wealth, all the more so since the advances of science and of the arts, were the cause of intellectual slavery beyond that of material slavery. 50. Defeated by Marx in his time, this historical account, which liquidated science, technology, and modernity, sees its victory in the West with the First World War and the Great Depression. One can understand then the point of view expressed in the middle of the 20th century by two illustrious philosophers. But the totalitarian order has granted unlimited rights to calculating thought and puts its trust in science as such. Its canon is its own brutal efficiency. Even as it celebrates its triumphs on the battlefield, science makes its devastating effects felt at every level. At this point, we can summarize the contrast that appeared regarding science and technology. In the West, they are an integral part of the new Leviathan, to use Bukharin's language, utilized by the capitalist bourgeoisie to raise profits by squeezing the waged workforce to prepare the technological machine and the death machine for the struggle for world hegemony. In the East, science and technology are essentials for developing the resistance to the politics of subjection and oppression conducted by this same new Leviathan. If in the West, the Great War, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism and of Nazism, and the Second World War make the anarchist judgment credible, this judgment gains little ground in the East. There, the objectivity of the natural sciences, which in history and class consciousness was connected directly to the logic of calculation and of the exploitation of the capitalist economy, must instead still be accomplished to develop a modern industrial apparatus and to escape from underdevelopment and from colonial and semi-colonial dependence. And this accomplishment often implies conflicts with animistic and pre-modern visions that are obstacles to the application of science and technology to nature. Let's try to formulate an initial summary of the different forms that Marxism takes in Europe and in Asia. According to Merleau-Ponty, Marx imagined a non-capitalistic future that he hoped would be an absolute other. This vision, well represented in Western Marxism, is absent in the East. The underdeveloped countries, before they can completely tear down capitalism, first must, and want to, enjoy the miracle of the wonderful development of the productive forces that the Communist Manifesto rightly attributes to that social system. We find Mao in 1940 declaring that the revolution he was promoting, before moving on to socialism, must clear the way for capitalist development. Even if a capitalism strictly controlled by a political power and by a party determined to go well beyond it in carrying out the revolutionary transformation of the existing society. For the Chinese Communist leader, the post-capitalist future is not an absolute other to the regime that it is intended to replace, more than a total negation, we find ourselves, before a sort of Hegelian Aufhebung, a negation that carries with it, even if in a radically new context, the heritage of the high points of that which is negated. It is a question of transcending capitalism, but without compromising. It further strengthens the capacity for developing the productive forces to which it gives impetus. The diversity of objective material conditions and cultural traditions drives the bifurcation of Marxism. Judeo-Christian messianism has informed the West, reinforced by the horror of the First World War. With the end of the slaughter, there is an expectation of a world redeemed from wrong and sin. One thinks of Bloch, who in August 1918 sees the First World War as a crusade against radical evil. Represented by Germany and by the Central European powers, a crusade whose protagonists should be the Entente, but above all, Christianity in struggle, the Ecclesia militans. Immediately after the October Revolution, we see him invoke the transformation of power into love and transcending the mercantile morality, the original source of evil and sin. It is true, responding to the foreseeable objections, that many times the philosopher makes clear that what he seeks is a concrete utopia, founded on an ontology that does not confuse the existing with the factual and that does not lose sight of the not yet existing. Yet this category is so large and so lacking in reference to time and to ways of realizing the longed-for future that it could include even the most abstract utopia. The messianism of Benjamin is quite explicit. In 1940, and on the eve of his suicide, after having criticized in the theses on the philosophy of history the homogeneous and empty time on which an evolutionism incapable of understanding or even imagining the qualitative leap that alone can save us, is based, he turns to the messianic time of Jewish tradition. Here every second is the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. Rather than a cold and rational analysis, the gravest tragedy ever to occur in Europe had brought about a situation so desperate as to suggest waiting for the Messiah as an alternative to the present that appeared to be without any means of escape. Even an author like Lukács, who, in his younger years, and in the period in which the horror and the indignation over the war had not yet found an articulated political response, seemed to be influenced by the climate described above. Marianne Weber sees him animated by eschatological hope and looking toward the ultimate goal of world redemption to be brought about thanks to a final conflict between God and Lucifer. Even if this is a tendentious description, one is struck by the fact that in 1916, while the battlefield slaughter was raging, Lukács, taking up an expression of Fichte, speaks of his own time as an era of complete sinfulness. Later, the Hungarian philosopher scolds Fichte for having counterposed to the era of complete sinfulness a contemplated utopian future. It is a criticism that sounds like a self-criticism and a distancing from the apocalyptic tones of his youth. 56. It goes without saying that it would be in vain that we should search in China, in Indochina, and in Eastern Marxism in general for appeals to ecclesia militants and to the Messiah or to a vision that entrusts to the revolution the task of the liquidation of radical evil, of complete sinfulness, of the mercantile morality, and of power as such. I have already discussed how different the Chinese cultural tradition was. Certainly, midway through the 19th century in China, the Taiping Revolt broke out, which, breaking with Confucian tradition, sought a radically new order, the celestial reign of peace. Not by chance, however, the protagonist of this gigantic mass rising was convinced he was the younger brother of Jesus and was profoundly influenced by Christianity and Christian messianism. The tragic outcome of the Taiping Revolt, which cost rivers of blood and ended up accelerating the ruin of the country, and by consequence, its colonial and semi-colonial subjection, may have further immunized Chinese culture to messianic temptations, and that could have contributed to a more pragmatic reception of the theory of Marx. In Europe and the West, instead, the great historical crisis, the two world wars, and, between the first and the second, the Great Depression and the rise of Nazism and fascism, found its epicenter and flared up in a particularly traumatic way, immediately following the Belle Epoque and the 100 Years' Peace, 1815-1914. All this, together with the Judeo-Christian tradition, promoted the messianic reading of the tragedy of those decades. The fact remains of the longue durée of the messianic and utopian tendency of Western Marxism. It reacted with irritation when Lukács self-critiqued his messianic sectarianism and messianic utopian aspirations of history and class consciousness for the tendency to represent post-capitalism as somehow proclaiming a total break with every institution and mode of life stemming from the bourgeois world. 57. Yet in the 1960s, the ideal dear to Herbert Marcuse of a society founded on a substantial liberation from work and on the definitive triumph of eros over every form of domination, and perhaps also of power, was widely diffused and, at times, radicalized. The principal exponent of Italian workerism, Mario Tronti, called explicitly for the abolition of work. Decades later, he proudly proclaimed his consonance with the millenarian heresies of the workers of the 20th century. Still more telling is the remarkable success of a book published in 2000s. It concludes by evoking an extraordinary future of universal regeneration that recalls not so much the revolution of Marxian memory as the apokatastasis of which first-century Christians, and particularly enthusiastic theologians, spoke, signaling the rise of a final reconciliation not only of human beings with one another, but also of humans with nature and the animal species. We think of authors like Origen or John Scotus, the prophets of the apokatastasis. Here, finally, the animals, Sister Moon, Brother Sun, the birds of the field, the poor and exploited humans, together against the will of power and corruption. Biopower and communism, cooperation and revolution remain together, in love, simplicity, and also innocence. 7. The struggle against inequality in the West and the East, condemning with fiery words the carnage of war and the socio-political system that led to it. Bloch attacked the social polarization that characterizes capitalism, notwithstanding the homage it pays to juridical equality. This, says Anatole France, is equality before the law, that it forbids rich and poor alike to steal firewood or to sleep under bridges, that so little hinders actual inequality, that it actually protects it. For since the lawyers are trained in no other way than formally, precisely the abilities of the exploiter class. In calculation, mistrust and underhanded accounting find a cognate basis in this formalism, still apart from the fact that the contents of any possible economic system can be inserted without contradiction into the abstract amoralism of jurisprudence. All of law, far and away the preponderance of criminal law too, is merely the ruling class's means of maintaining a rule of law protecting its interests. 59. As we can see, the condemnation was radical, but it was based exclusively on the conditions of the popular masses in the West. This is true as well for Benjamin. He too took up the satirical comments of the French writer on the laws of bourgeois society that poor and rich are equally forbidden to spend the night under bridges, and that at the political level, transfer of power is only tolerated from the privileged to the privileged. He made no reference to the conditions of the peoples of the colonies. Indeed, as far as Bloch is concerned, we see immediately that in these years he polemicized against those who, in his eyes, excessively emphasized the colonial question. Obviously, Ho Chi Minh too had the cause of equality at heart, but his priorities were different. In the speech that called on French socialists to join the Communist International, he declared, "Such is so-called justice in Indochina. In that country, the Vietnamese are discriminated against. They do not enjoy safety like Europeans or those having European citizenship." Inequality was denounced with an eye primarily toward the conditions of the colonial peoples. For the Vietnamese revolutionary, it was not only a question of challenging the formal character of juridical equality, such legal. Equality was not realized in any way in the colonies. Enjoying a decidedly privileged treatment were not only the French, but also those Vietnamese and Indo-Chinese who had Europeanized, such as those who converted to Christianity, the religion of the dominant colonial power, and so, in a way, were co-opted into the civilization or into the self-styled superior race. For some time, Ho Chi Minh embraced the idea of translating the works of Montesquieu into Vietnamese, in particular, the spirit of the laws. The capitalist West puffs out its chest with pride in its liberal principles, but in the colonies, they have always been careful to not put them into practice, but to not even make them known. Ho also denounced material inequality, with a view, first of all, to the colonies. The Vietnamese live in misery when there is abundance for their executioners, and die of starvation when there is a bad harvest. Material inequality intersected with legal inequality, so the colonial peoples were forced to submit simultaneously to arbitrary arrests and desperate hunger. Algeria suffers from famine. Here is how Tunisia is ravaged by the same scourge. To remedy this situation, the administration arrested and imprisoned many starving people, and so that the down and out did not take prison for shelter, they were not given anything to eat. Some die of starvation during the imprisonment. 3. Above all, Ho didn't lose sight of perhaps the most important point. The anti-colonial revolution sought to achieve emancipation at every level, not only for the individual, but for the nation as well. It was necessary to end the formal nod due to the superior race by the vanquished race. 6. In other words, it was necessary to end the deferential bowing the Vietnamese were obligated to engage in when they ran into a Frenchman. We have seen Sun Yat-sen attribute to the October Revolution the merit of having risen up against inequality in defense of humanity. The inequality he referred to was global. During the Chinese Revolution, the demand for equality was constantly aimed at the humiliation suffered by the nation as a whole. Vibrant and recurring were the condemnations of the unequal treaties colonialism imposed on China. These had to give way to treaties based on equality. Also condemned was the extraterritoriality that the United States, above all, forced on China, which granted the right to U.S., and those converted to Christianity and westernized, in that great Asian country to organize and act as a state within a state. 66. In any case, the struggle to affirm on an international basis the principle of equality, mutual benefit, and mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty was an essential aspect of the anti-colonial revolution. 67. It goes without saying that neither Mao Zedong nor Ho Chi Minh lost sight of the problem of building a society free of the social polarization that characterizes both the pre-capitalist and the capitalist world. The fact remains that contrary to Europe and Asia, the communists hailed the October Revolution, taking from it the stimulus to liberate themselves from the frightful inequality that the more advanced countries, or that capitalism and imperialism, have brought to bear on the colonial peoples. 8. The blurred boundaries between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. I have distinguished between Western and Eastern Marxism, referring to Western Europe and Asia. But where should we place Soviet Russia? All of the members of the leadership group of the Bolshevik Revolution had, to varying degrees, taken up the lessons of Lenin on the centrality of the colonial question, and all to varying degrees tried to spread the revolution throughout Europe and to bring about an upheaval, a radical change without historical precedent. And so, at least for a time in Russia, there seemed to be no trace of the bifurcation between the two Marxisms. This bifurcation took form over time as the expectation that the arrival of a worldwide society characterized by the vanishing of the mercantile economy, of the state apparatus and of national borders, of a society that eliminates every source of conflict and disharmony, lost credibility. The more this exhilarating prospect faded, the more urgent the task of governing Russia, a country in the grip of historical backwardness and the devastations of the First World War and of Civil War, such that the Bolshevik leaders were forced to face, through oscillations and contradictions, a learning process that had to happen rapidly given the perils of the internal and international situations. The case of Lenin is exemplary. For some time, while the revolution seemed to spread beyond the borders of Russia, he shared the illusions of the other Bolsheviks to the point of making a risky prediction in the closing speech at the founding Congress of the International March: "The victory of the Communist Revolution is assured." The comrades present in this hall saw the founding of the First Soviet Republic. Now they see the founding of the Third Communist International. Applause. And they will all see the founding of the World Federative Republic of Soviets. In the early days of October, in a climate of lingering euphoria, Lenin reaffirmed, "The generation of people who are now at the age of 50 cannot expect to see a communist society. This generation will be gone before then. But the generation of those who are now 15 will see a communist society and will build this society. This generation should know that the entire purpose of their lives is to build a communist society. It didn't take long for the illusion of the arrival of a radically new world in the near future, under the banner of a total and definitive reconciliation, to vanish. 2.5 years later, in an important speech, Better, Fewer, but Better, published in Pravda on March 4, 1923, we hear a completely different tone, improving our state apparatus. We must strive to build up a state, create a republic, that is really worthy of the name Soviet Socialist. It was a long-term task that would require many, very many years. And to solve it, Soviet Russia must not hesitate to study the most advanced capitalist countries. Beyond the question of the state and the nation, a rethinking and a learning process also had to occur in the economy. Lenin had branded Taylorism a scientific system for squeezing sweat out of the wage slave. But after the October Revolution, he stressed that the Soviet power must know how to increase the productivity of labor, teaching the Russian worker, traditionally a bad worker, how to work better, and promoting the critical assimilation of the Taylor system and the more recent advances in capitalism. The distinction between Western and Eastern Marxism was temporal in the Bolshevik leadership group. Before the turning point of 1917, many of them had lived in the West, and they had lived not like the Chinese communists, staying for a brief time in France or Germany to learn science and technology to bring back to their homeland as soon as possible. Not a few among the future leaders of Soviet Russia had spent a considerable part of their lives in the West, without any certainty of returning home and remaining largely isolated in the countries where they had found refuge, but where? They could not obtain work in government or administration even at the most modest level. Even more than in the French Revolution, a group or class of abstract intellectuals was called upon, so to speak, from one day to the next, to transform themselves into a governing class. Beginning with the exemplary case of Lenin, we can understand the learning process through which the Bolshevik leaders had to pass. Before the conquest of power, they tended to think of post-capitalist society as the total and immediate negation of the previous socio-political order, with the first experience of exercising power. The growing awareness that the revolutionary transformation would not be an instantaneous and painless creation ex nihilo, but a complex and tormented Aufhebung, to use a central category of Hegelian philosophy to simultaneously inherit the highest points of the socio-political order that was being negated and overthrown. It goes without saying that not all achieved or were disposed to achieve at the same time, and in the same way, the learning process imposed on them by the objective situation. In other words, as far as Soviet Russia is concerned, the border between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism was of a temporal character on the one hand, and on the other, it ran through that very leadership group. The contradictions and conflicts that ended up tearing it apart prefigured in the final analysis the conflict between the two Marxisms. Trotsky, who saw the power achieved by the Bolsheviks as a trampoline to launch the revolution in the West, eminently represented Western Marxism. Accused by his antagonist of national and provincial sentiments, Stalin was instead the incarnation of Eastern Marxism. He never left Russia, and already, between February and October 1917, he presented the proletarian revolution as a necessary instrument for building a new social order, but also for reaffirming Russian national independence, which was threatened by the Entente that wanted to force it to provide cannon fodder for the imperialist war, and which treated it like a country in Central Africa. It was the vague presentiment that far from being able to export the revolution to the West Soviet Russia would have to work to not become a colony or semi-colony of the more advanced capitalist West. 9. The difficult reciprocal recognition between two. Struggles for recognition. From the start, Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism tended to follow different paths. Nor were polemical motives lacking, sometimes directly, often indirectly. In accepting the ideology of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, for whom the defeat of despotism, represented primarily by Germany's Wilhelm II, would have smoothed the way for definitive peace, Bloch distanced himself from Lenin, whom he criticized for having treated the two war coalitions as the same, and for not taking seriously the democratic character of Great Britain and its allies. In the eyes of the German philosopher, the Russian Revolution evidently reveled in the sovereign skepticism that sees nothing but the interests of capital and nothing else, and scolds the English over their protectorate in faraway Egypt. 3. Bloch rolled his eyes over the trifling colonial question. The greatest empire of all time was thereby absolved with the argument that it would be misleading to condemn it because of a single colony. Indeed, a single protectorate, and one that is far away from Europe and so not worthy of any particular attention. The German philosopher gave not even a nod to the ferocious repression that gunned down the Irish people who had rebelled against the war and colonial domination just a little earlier. What a difference from Ho Chi Minh, who followed that revolt with impassioned attention and for the national liberation of a people not in the faraway Middle East but in Europe. More generally, if Bloch scolded Lenin for giving excessive importance to the colonial question, Ho Chi Minh in 1923 criticized Marx for the opposite reason. Marx built his doctrine on a certain philosophy of history. What history? That of Europe. But what is Europe? It is not humanity in its entirety. 75. The minimizing of the colonial question is a direct form of Eurocentric chauvinism. For another thing, aside from the horrors of the carnage of war, officially unleashed on each side in the name of the defense of the fatherland, in large sectors of Western Marxism, an exalted and abstract internationalism spread that considered the national question transcended and, consequently, to delegitimize the movements for national liberation of the colonized peoples. This was an indirect form of Eurocentric chauvinism. It is against this tendency that Ho Chi Minh polemicized in his speech at the Congress of Tours in December 1920. Today, instead of contributing, together with you, to world revolution, I come here with deep sadness to speak as a member of the Socialist Party, against the imperialists who have committed abhorrent crimes on my native land. The world revolution risked losing sight of the most modest yet most concrete task of political support for the people struggling to throw off colonial subjection and constitute themselves as independent national states. Bloch never tired of criticizing militarism. He criticized Marx for having directed his attack almost only against capitalism, rather than concentrating his fire on militarism, whose embodiment would be represented by Prussia. Then Ho Chi Minh, whose argument was quite different, called attention to colonialist militarism, which had unleashed in the colonies the hunt for human material, for black or yellow meat, that the great capitalist powers arrogated to themselves the right to calmly immolate in a war for world hegemony. We see the Communist International launch, a year after its founding, a call to become protagonists in the revolution not only to the proletarians but also the oppressed peoples of the entire world, and that expressed a clear awareness of the centrality of the colonial question. However, in 1924, on the occasion of the 5th Congress of the Communist International, Ho Chi Minh still felt obligated to intervene in the debate with a brief but eloquent declaration that criticized the persistent underestimation of the colonial question. I feel that the comrades have not yet sufficiently grasped the idea that the destiny of the proletariat of the whole world is closely tied to the destiny of the oppressed nations in the colonies. 8. Along with Great Britain, Bloch tended to glorify the United States. These are the years in which, without renouncing its own colonies, the Philippines or the Monroe Doctrine and its neocolonial control of Latin America, the North American Republic, under Woodrow Wilson, sought to give itself an anti-colonialist image, waving the banner of the self-determination of peoples. Bloch joined this campaign enthusiastically, so he took no account of the colonies, the semi-colonies, or the treatment reserved for the peoples of colonial origin by the persistent regime of white supremacy, particularly black people. Now let's look at Ho Chi Minh. Seeking work after having arrived in the United States in 1924, he was a horrified witness to a lynching. The slow, interminable torture of a black man was attended by a festive and cheerful crowd of whites. Let's look at some of the particulars to better focus on the political conclusion. While on the ground, stinking of fat and smoke, a black head, mutilated, roasted, deformed, grins horribly and seems to ask the setting sun, "Is this civilization?" 79. And so, beyond the colonial peoples, likewise suffering oppression, humiliation, and dehumanization, are those, despite being citizens of the country that celebrates itself as the oldest democracy in the world, whose skin color betrayed their outsiderhood with respect to the self-styled superior race. The young Indo-Chinese, whose choice of being a revolutionary and a communist had matured, denounced the infamy of the white supremacist regime and the Ku Klux Klan in International Correspondence, the French version of the organ of the Communist International. 80 reflections on the treatment reserved for African Americans must have played a role in the development of Mao Zedong as well. According to an authoritative witness, he knew something about the Negro question in America and unfavorably compared the treatment of Negroes and American Indians with policies in the Soviet Union toward national minorities. He was interested when I pointed out certain great differences in the historical background of the Negro in America and that of minorities in Russia. 81. In the West and in the development of Western Marxism, Lenin's writings denouncing the carnage of the war and the total mobilization and regimentation resonated particularly strongly. In the East and in the development of Eastern Marxism, it was his targeting of imperialism and the pretensions of the presumed elect nations or model nations that dominated and robbed the rest of the world. We are in the presence of two. For recognition. As far as the colonies are concerned, this is evident from Ho Chi Minh's analysis of their dehumanization. The colonial peoples were reduced to human material or to black and yellow meat, to be sacrificed in more or less enslaved labor or by being immolated in a war in which they face thousands of kilometers away from home. People whose rulers were in mortal competition among themselves. A more careful analysis of the demand for recognition emerges from the struggle by the popular masses in the West against the First World War. Italy was dragged into the conflict, notwithstanding the opposition of the great mass of Catholics and socialists, and when by that point it was clear to all the enormous price of human life that was to be paid, we can understand, therefore, Gramsci's conclusion, treated throughout history as the equivalent of a multitude of children, and therefore considered incapable of understanding and making demands at the level of politics. The popular masses could be calmly sacrificed by the dominant class on the altar of its imperial projects. And so, as it happens, the working people didn't remain in the condition of a good prey for all and of simple human material, available to the elites, of raw material for the history of the privileged classes. There should not be any contradictions between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. We are dealing with two different perspectives on the same social system, each taking off from Lenin's analyses. In other words, two struggles for recognition called into question imperialism-capitalism. In the first, the protagonists were entire nations seeking to free themselves from the yoke of oppression, humiliation, and the dehumanization inherent in colonial domination. In the second, the protagonists were the working class and the popular masses who refused to be raw material available to the elites. However, unity and reciprocal recognition between these two struggles could not be taken for granted from the start. Part 2, Socialism versus Capitalism, or Anti-Colonialism versus Colonialism. 1. From the only proletarian revolution to the anti-colonial revolution. We have seen how different socioeconomic contexts and varying cultural traditions contributed to bifurcating the Marxisms in the West and the East. Now we must analyze the influence on this process exercised by the international situation's rapid transformation and the ever greater discrepancy between the initial hopes raised by the October Revolution and successive historical developments. The indignation over the First World War spread a firm conviction among European communists. On the order of the day was the overthrow of the socio-political system responsible for the horrendous carnage, and there were no intermediate objectives to pursue. Everything turned on the contradiction between capitalism and socialism, or between bourgeoisie and proletariat. This was also Lenin's view. He repeatedly stated, "Imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution. It was the highest stage of capitalism because, with its infamies and the mass it provoked, imperialism signaled the transition from capitalism to a higher socioeconomic order." The qualitative leap that loomed just over the horizon would be of an immeasurable magnitude compared to the upheavals of past events. In January 1917, to commemorate the 12th anniversary of the Russian Revolution of 1905, Lenin concluded that the imminent Russian Revolution would be the prologue to the coming European Revolution, and could only be a proletarian revolution, and in an even more profound sense of the word, a proletarian socialist revolution, also in its content, beyond merely the participation of the masses of the proletariat and the popular classes. The 1905 revolution was a bourgeois democratic revolution in its social content, but a proletarian revolution in its methods of struggle it aimed to overturn. The Tsarist autocracy and the feudal nobility, but not yet the capitalist bourgeoisie, however, its shock troops were constituted by the workers, the anti-capitalist class par excellence. On the immediate eve of the overthrow of the government of the imperialist carnage and of the conquest of power by the Bolshevik Party, the revolutionary leader reiterated that the great turning point of the time went well beyond Russia. It brought ever closer the world proletarian revolution, the international socialist revolution, and the victory of internationalism. But in his more reflective moments regarding the gigantic flaring up in Europe and worldwide, Lenin began to nurture doubts about this theoretical and political program. In the summer of 1915, he characterized the World War that had broken out the year before as a war between slave owners for fortifying and strengthening colonial slavery. The peculiarity of the situation lies in that in this war, the fate of the colonies is being decided by war on the continent. This formulation suggests that the original situation in which the slave owners, the great colonial and imperialist powers, held the initiative would not last long. The slaves of the colonies would not be long in revolting. Indeed, as Lenin noted a year later, the revolt had already begun. In Singapore, the British brutally suppressed a mutiny among their Indian troops. Something similar had happened in French Annam, Vietnam, and in the German Cameroons. It was a process that reached Europe itself. Ireland rose against London, restored by firing squads. This analysis reached a conclusion of startling foresight before the war had even broken out. Lenin indicated with precision the two epicenters of the gigantic revolutionary and national storm growing on the horizon that would mark the entire 20th century: Western Europe, Asia, and Eastern Europe on the one hand, and the colonies and semi-colonies on the other. Essentially, the first would see the unleashing of Hitler's project to construct a continental colonial empire for Germany. The second would contribute decisively to the fall, at least in its classical form, of the world colonial system. One thinks of the national liberation movements in China, India, and Vietnam. We are far from the prospect of the only proletarian revolution and of the world proletarian revolution, or of the international socialist revolution. Lenin himself had already become difficult to follow in his oscillations, having become conscious of the permanent and growing importance of the colonial question. Notwithstanding the victory of the October Revolution and its socialist and internationalist pathos, he encountered strong resistance among the ranks of the Marxist and communist left in Europe. Legitimate as they were, did the protests of colonial peoples and their struggles for national liberation still make sense? Didn't the gigantic conflict for world hegemony that broke out in 1914 between the opposed imperialist coalitions demonstrate the quixotic character of the oppressed nations' attempts to win their national independence? What could David do against Goliath? If, even by some miracle, they managed to win political independence, they would remain deprived of economic independence and would have continued to submit to one form or another of oppression by this or that great power. And so the real problem was to put an end once and for all, and on a world scale, to the capitalist imperialist system. So argued on the wave of indignation over the First World War and of enthusiasm for the October Revolution, an important strain of Western Marxists and communists, a strain that was highly active across Europe. Lenin referred to it, writing between August and October 1916 when he reported on a position held by one left group, namely the German International Group, whose members included Mehring, Liebknecht, and Luxemburg. According to them, National wars are no longer possible in the era of this unbridled imperialism. Given this assumption, one can understand the disdain with which a Swiss newspaper, the Berner Tagwacht, though firmly against the war, spoke of the insurrection of 1916 in Ireland, whose protagonists were a people seeking to liberate themselves from English domination and to constitute themselves as an independent national state. It was a putsch that caused a sensation, but was politically insignificant. In the era of imperialism, it made no sense to linger over obsolete intermediate and provincial objectives, losing sight of and weakening the only struggle that mattered, overthrowing the entire world system of imperialist capitalism. Lenin objected strongly to this thesis, which had circulated widely among the extreme left in Germany, Switzerland, and around the West. To imagine that social revolution is conceivable without revolts by small nations in the colonies and in Europe is to repudiate social revolution. So one army lines up in one place and says, "We are for socialism," and another somewhere else says, "We are for imperialism," and that will be a social revolution. Only those who hold such a ridiculously pedantic view could vilify the Irish rebellion by calling it a putsch. Whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. 8. Does this last critical observation not end by also bashing the only proletarian revolution we have seen Lenin call for during a moment of hopefulness? It is clear that the principal aspect of his thought for a long time was that the anti-colonial revolutions were an integral part of the era of imperialism and of the struggle against capitalism. The persistence of national oppression internationally and within countries that boasted of their democracy. For example, the oppression of African Americans demonstrated the immense significance of the national question. We understand well that this vision emerged in the first place in a country, Tsarist Russia, that had traditionally been known as a prison house of peoples, where national oppression could not be ignored, and which was moreover located close to the colonial world, properly speaking. On the national and colonial question in the imperialist era, a differentiation was developing between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. The demarcation line between the two is not to be understood as merely geographic, since, as we know, not a few of the Bolshevik leaders came from the West. And it is in polemics against two of them, Parabellum Radek and Kievsky-Platikov, that Lenin made clear his position. The division of nations into oppressor and oppressed forms the essence of imperialism, and the struggle for overcoming it must constitute the principal question of the revolutionary program. This division is most significant from the angle of the revolutionary struggle against imperialism. To reiterate and make official this point of view, in the summer of 1920, the Congress of the Peoples of the East took place in Baku immediately after the Second Congress of the Communist International. It felt the need to modify the slogan that concludes the manifesto of the Communist Party and the inaugural address of the Working Men's International. The new slogan went, "Proletarians of all countries and oppressed peoples of the entire world, unite." Now, alongside proletarians were also the oppressed peoples emerging as a revolutionary subject in their own right. Awareness grew that the class struggle was not only the proletarian struggle in the capitalist metropolises, but also that waged by the oppressed peoples of the colonies and semi-colonies. And it would be, above all, this latter type of class struggle that would define the 20th century. The October Revolution had come to power, launching an appeal to the West to make the socialist revolution and one to the East to make the anti-colonial revolution. The latter, therefore, was never lost sight of and within a short time assumed an unexpected centrality, one looked on with suspicion by Western Marxism. For all intents and purposes, the colonial and national question emerged with a force reaching beyond the colonial world. On this point also, Lenin showed himself to be extraordinarily lucid. We have already seen him hinting at the gathering storm over Eastern Europe. There is more. In July 1916, after having seen the armies of Wilhelm II advance to the gates of Paris, the great revolutionary reiterated the imperialist nature of the First World War then underway and called attention to a possible overturning. If the gigantic conflict were to end in victories similar to those achieved by Napoleon in the subjugation of a whole series of nation-states capable of independent life, then a great national war in Europe would be possible. 11. In this context, it is useful to reread an important passage in Lenin's essay Analyzing Imperialism, whose character was such that it strives to annex not only agrarian territories, but even most highly industrialized regions, if only to weaken its adversary. The imperialist competition for world hegemony knew no boundaries. However industrialized or ancient its civilization, no country was sheltered from the risk of seeing itself transformed into a colony or semi-colony. Not even the colonialist and imperialist powers could consider themselves safe. After the victories similar to those achieved by Napoleon, won by Hitler in the spring of 1940, France became a colony or semi-colony of the Third Reich. It is interesting to note that even before coming to power, Hitler proposed a racialization of the French people. Relegating them among the colonial peoples and inferior races, France did not truly belong to the world's white community. It was on the road to Negroization, Vernegerung. France did not protect itself in any way from interracial marriages and sexual relationships, and so shamelessly, Negroized its blood. So advanced was this ruinous process that France is racially becoming more and more Negroid, so much so that now one can, actually speak of the creation of an African state on European soil, indeed a Euro-African mulatto state. Driven from the colonial world, the French were forced to carry out a national and anti-colonial revolution to recover their independence and national dignity. What was happening in Italy was perhaps more significant. Mussolini entered the Second World War, voicing explicitly imperialist slogans, conquering a place in the sun, the return of the empire, on the fatal hills of Rome, etc. When he fell, Mussolini left the country not only prostrate and broken, but also in large part controlled by an army that acted like an army of occupation, and that considered and treated the local population as a colonial people, members of an inferior race. The diary entries of Goebbels for September 11, 1943, are revealing the Italians, by their infidelity and treachery, have lost every claim to a national state of the modern type. They had to be punished most severely as the laws of history demand. In effect, in the eyes of the Nazis' bosses, the Italians were by now Negroid, and so it was important to avoid sexual contamination. After the war, they were to be utilized as a more or less servile labor force, workers at the service of the Germans. Having participated in the unleashing of an imperialist war for the conquest of colonies in Africa and the Balkans, Italy found itself having to conduct a national liberation war to throw off the colonial yoke imposed by their ex-ally and recover their own national independence and national dignity. In conclusion, as in part foreseen by Lenin, in the heart of Europe, far from being only proletarian, the revolution ended up being anti-colonial and national. 3. The socialist countries in the epoch of the Napoleonic Wars, at least as far as Soviet Russia was concerned, was the contradiction: socialism, capitalism, or proletariat, bourgeoisie, unequivocally the principle. 1. While Lenin tried to convince his party comrades of the need to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, regardless of how humiliating it was, between February and March 1918, he observed, another epoch may, like the epoch of the Napoleonic Wars, be an epoch of liberation wars, not one war, but wars imposed by aggressors upon Soviet Russia. If this scenario were to be realized, the Bolsheviks would first have had to struggle for national independence. In that case, for the country of the socialist October Revolution, neither socialism, capitalism, nor proletariat, bourgeoisie would have been the principal contradiction, and such a situation would have lasted for an entire epoch. What concrete form would the struggle between Napoleonism and anti-Napoleonism have taken? At the end of the Second World War, it was clear that the Third Reich had conducted its campaign in the East in a different frame of mind than it did in the West. The advance in the East had racial and colonial overtones. At least for the most ultra-Nazi circles, it was about driving Russia back within borders before those established by Peter the Great, and opening an enormous area for German colonial and semi-colonial domination. Did the threat of colonial domination come from only one direction? Between the February and October revolutions, Stalin denounced the Entente, which sought to force Russia to continue fighting and furnish resources and cannon fodder for the great Western powers. The latter sought to transform the great European and Asian country through the conversion of Russia into a colony of Britain, America, and France. Not by chance did they behave in Russia as if they were in Central Africa. In effect, compared with the country born of the October Revolution, a frankly racist attitude was widespread among the dominant classes in the West. Could the country governed by those barbarians and savages that were the Bolsheviks still be considered an integral part of the community of civilized peoples and of the white race? In denouncing the rising tide of colored people in a book that was extraordinarily successful on both sides of the Atlantic, a U.S. writer handed down an irrevocable judgment. By inciting the revolt of the colonial peoples, Bolshevism must be considered and treated as the renegade, the traitor within the gates, who would betray the citadel, as the mortal enemy of civilization and the white race. Oswald Spengler in Germany took up this thesis. By becoming Soviet, Russia had thrown away its white mask to once again become Asiatic, indeed Mongolian. It has instilled into the whole of the Earth's colored population a hatred toward the white nations. On January 27, 1932, addressing the industrialists of Dusseldorf and all of Germany, and gaining their definitive support for his rise to power, Hitler made clear his vision of history and politics. During the 19th century, the white peoples had conquered an unprecedented dominion, concluding a process that had begun with the conquest of America and developing further. Under the banner of absolute, innate sovereign sentiment of the white race, by questioning the colonial system and provoking or aggravating the confusion of European white thought, Bolshevism was a mortal danger to civilization. If one wanted to confront that threat, it was necessary to reiterate in theory and practice the conviction of the superiority and therefore of the superior right of the white race. It was necessary to defend this economic superiority over the rest of the world. So with clarity, a program of colonialist and pro-slavery counter-revolution was announced. The necessary reaffirmation of the planetary dominance of the white race presupposes the assimilation of the fundamental lesson that arises from the history of colonial expansionism of the West. One must not hesitate to have recourse to the brutal ruthlessness required by the right to organize the rest of the world. Herrenrecht. These were the assumptions of barbaric aggression on which Nazi Germany sought to build in Western Europe its colonial empire, enslaving the indigenous, that is, the Slavs, seen as an inferior race, good only for servile labor. Checkmating this project was the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, born of industrialization, conducted as a forced march and at a terrible human and social cost. If this is how things were, was Soviet Russia's priority to build a new social order, or was it defending itself from the dangers of colonial subjection? Was it necessary to profoundly rethink and redesign social relations, or to undertake the development of the productive forces and the growth of industrial and military production in particular? In the workplaces and the battlefields, did an appeal have to be made to a specific class, the proletariat, or the nation as a whole, given that what was at stake was the defense of national independence? Other countries that underwent socialist revolutions faced analogous considerations. In China, the liberated areas governed by the Communist Party, which had sprung up from the retreat to the countryside made necessary by the disastrous defeat of the Workers' Revolution of 1927 in Shanghai, were forced to take note of the colonial expansionism of the Empire of the Rising Sun. Beginning in 1937, with a large-scale invasion by the Tokyo government, the struggle against colonialism ended up overwhelming every aspect of political life, to the point that Mao Zedong, under these circumstances, theorized the identity between the national struggle and the class struggle. This identity governed the war of resistance against Japanese imperialism, a war of direct resistance led by the Communist Party to save the entire Chinese nation from the enslavement that the Empire of the Rising Sun sought to impose upon it. In conclusion, the historical chapter that began with the October Revolution saw the emergence of socialist countries grappling with aggression or the threat of aggression and with an epoch of Napoleonic wars imposed by imperialist powers. It was an objective situation that made secondary the problem of building a socialist or communist society. There took place what we might call a turning point in the turning point of the 20th century. The epochal importance of the October Revolution must be clear to all. Yet, while the public debate and the political struggle seemed entirely to regard the dilemma between capitalism and socialism, there intervened, unnoticed by many, an entirely unexpected phenomenon. It became progressively clearer that the colonial question would play an essential role. Even in the socialist countries born of the October Revolution, we can now better understand why the hopes initially aroused by the revolution were not realized. The development of the objective contradictions placed as the order of the day and, on a worldwide scale, the conflict between imperialism and anti-imperialism, and between colonialism and anti-colonialism. And this conflict continued to take priority, even if it was communist forces sustaining the cause of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism that held firm to this political orientation. The great historical crisis of the first half of the 20th century ended with the defeat inflicted on Hitler's plan to build his colonial empire in Eastern Europe. So ended what has been called the greatest colonial war in history. This definition is 100% correct if we add a small amendment. It is one of the two greatest colonial wars in history, the other being that which ended with the defeat of the Empire of the Rising Sun, which had sought to emulate in Asia what Hitler was doing in Eastern Europe. Therefore, the revolutionary cycle that began in October 1917 ended with two gigantic national wars, the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union and the War of National Resistance against Japanese imperialism fought by China. Not only was a barbaric colonialist and pro-slavery counter-revolution defeated, but the world anti-colonialist revolution was born, which marked the 20th century and would put an end to a world system that had lasted for more than a century under the banner of the most illiberal and oppressive forces. All this counted for little in the eyes of those who, above all in the West, awaited the abolition of the state or the coming of the new man. To use an expression from The Spirit of Utopia by Ernst Bloch, 22. 4. Danielson's Dilemma and the Two Marxisms. We are concerned with an old problem that predates the October Revolution. Not long before his death, Engels observed that warfare became a branch of the grande industrie, so that large-scale industry became a political necessity. For a country that did not want to suffer subjugation, and it could have this grand industry in one form only, the capitalist form. His reflections were expressed in a letter to Nikolai F. Danielson, editor of the Russian-language edition of Capital. Do they not make explicit the dilemma in which socialists in Russia would find themselves once they had achieved power? Forced to undergo the process of industrialization, leaving a more or less ample space open for capitalism to make up for their backwardness compared to the more advanced countries? The collateral effect would be to aggravate the social polarization within the country, to bet instead on a slow and gradual socialist development starting with the mere, the village community traditionally characterized more or less by egalitarian relations. That would have perhaps avoided the inequality and the tragedy intrinsic to capitalist industrialization, but would have exacerbated the backwardness of the country and might leave Russia vulnerable to colonial domination by one or another of the world's great powers. Therefore, which of the two inequalities had to be taken up first, the one internal to Russian society or global and planetary inequality? Danielson's dilemma became much more urgent as the revolution led by a communist party spread to countries even more backward than Tsarist Russia had been. The priority of the struggle against global inequality and rapid modernization mattered not only to consolidate independence, but also to foil once and for all the danger of recurring famine and to make concrete the ideal of equality at every level. The case of China is exemplary here. Once assured of victory against Japanese imperialism, Mao hurried to make clear that the struggle against colonialism and neocolonialism was far from over. Genuine and actual equality required incisive transformations meant to overtake at every level the gap between China and the more advanced countries. Otherwise, there will be only nominal and not actual independence and equality. 25 announced while China was going through the most tragic period of its history. The goal of modernization assumed an ever more central role as liberation came closer. Mao clearly defined his government program: only modernization could save China. Modernization meant a commitment to overcoming backwardness compared to the more advanced countries, in a way that established a relationship of substantial equality with them, economically and technologically. Not even the conquest of power changed this political agenda. On the eve of the official proclamation of the People's Republic, the communist leader sounded the alarm. Washington sought to reduce China to having to live on U.S. flour to turn China into a U.S. colony. And again, rather than building a new social order, the struggle against colonialism and neocolonialism became a priority. The struggle had an essential economic dimension. Only the development of productive forces could make national independence real and end the threat of neocolonial dependence. Mao took his own measure of Danielson's dilemma, theoretically. He emphasized the necessity for his country to precede socialist transformation with a phase of new democracy. Although such a revolution in a colonial and semi-colonial country is still fundamentally bourgeois democratic in its social character during its first stage or first step, and although its objective mission is to clear the path for the development of capitalism, it is no longer a revolution of the old type, led by the bourgeoisie, to establish a capitalist society and a state under bourgeois dictatorship. It belongs to the new type of revolution, led by the proletariat, aiming to establish a new democratic society and a state under the joint dictatorship of all the revolutionary classes in the first stage. Thus, this revolution actually serves the purpose of clearing a still wider path for the development of socialism. In the course of its progress, there may be some further substages because of changes on the enemy's side and within the ranks of our allies, but the fundamental character of the revolution remains unchanged. 28. In the Marxian sense of the term, socialism is a transitional phase. The Chinese communist leader theorized a sort of transition within the transition. Far from being replaced or lost sight of, socialism became a goal spread over a much longer period than had been foreseen. On the other hand, it was called for and pursued in the name of the conquest and defense of national independence. We have seen that Mao, in 1949, identified Marxism-Leninism as the only scientific theory capable of leading the Chinese people to national redemption. The Chinese leader added 8 years later, "Only socialism can save China. The socialist regime has stimulated the rapid development of our productive forces." 29. Later, Deng Xiaoping said, "Only socialism can save China, and only socialism can develop China." Thus, socialism was evoked to ensure the economic and technological development that was the precondition for real national independence. He firmly stated the essential point: deviate from socialism, and China will inevitably regress to semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism. Even more than his predecessor, Deng Xiaoping insisted that, to achieve genuine political independence, a country must lift itself out of poverty. And together with poverty, technological backwardness must be eliminated. The gap between us and the countries with the most advanced science and technology was distressing also in international relations. But, just as the new leader was promoting policies of reform and openness to gain access to the technologies of the most advanced capitalist countries to bridge a gap that might endanger China's national independence, others in the West cultivated a different dream and counterposition. Some analysts even predicted that the special economic zones would become like American colonies in East Asia. The Americans believed that China would become a gigantic economic branch of the United States, thanks to a revival of the open-door system of the early 20th century. 32 rival. Economic new effacing instead. Themselves find they today and, as we have seen, the struggle between colonialism and anti-colonialism has characterized the history of the People's Republic of China throughout its existence. The same considerations apply to other, much smaller countries with a socialist orientation and therefore all the more exposed to the danger of losing independence. In the 1960s, Che Guevara called for vigilance against economic aggression and called on Cuba and the newly independent countries to liberate themselves not only from the political yoke, but also from the economic, imperialist yoke. In the small island threatened by the U.S. superpower and the Monroe Doctrine, the new power, born of the revolution, embraced the cause of socialism and communism, and continued to identify its principal task as the struggle against colonialism and neocolonialism. Western Marxism largely ignored Danielson's dilemma. At the end of the First World War, Ernst Bloch called attention to the colonial aims of the Germany of Wilhelm II, which not by chance treated the country of Tolstoy as if it were part of the Black Continent, and had recourse to brutality typical of colonial wars. Beyond annexing vast territories, Germany had destroyed the liberty and let drown 10 million Ukrainian Bolsheviks near the city of Taganrog. That did not prevent the German philosopher from accusing the Soviet government of postponing the building of socialism and achieving socio-economic relations of freedom and equality to a time that would never arrive. There was no justification for the policy followed by Lenin, the Red Tsar, because there still exists in the Russian countryside the old institution of the mir, or the semi-communist village communities. In accordance with that and the will of the majority of the Russian people, the agro-proletarian policy he wants can be achieved. 4. Max Horkheimer later expressed a similar attitude. While the German army was at the gates of Moscow, he denounced the Soviet government's lack of attention to the problem of the abolition of the state. Later, in a not dissimilar way, Perry Anderson celebrated the absolute superiority of Western Marxism over the Eastern version. The year before, the Vietnam War had concluded with the precipitous escape of the U.S. Army from Saigon. It was a defeat inflicted on an apparently invincible superpower by a small people in a little country. One led, however, by a communist party and supported by a communist movement that had contributed to making the war unleashed by Washington unpopular even in the West. However, just as the desperate resistance of the Soviet people and the Red Army was for Horkheimer, so the victorious People's Army of Vietnam was, without philosophical relevance for Anderson. These thinkers developed a fine and interesting analysis of the varying configurations of the relationship between nature and history, and between object and subject in the two Marxisms, but avoided posing any questions that, today would seem ineluctable, what philosophical theory and what political line had made possible this great new victory of the anti-colonial revolution, which followed that in China in 1949 and that in Cuba 10 years later? Why did this revolution continue to be guided by the communist movement, and what relationship was there between this revolution and the cause of building a post-capitalist world? Was the struggle for national independence definitely over in China, Cuba, and Vietnam, or did a new phase open under the banner of economic and technological development? On what, then, should the relations of production be modeled? Without such questions, the failure to realize the initial expectations and hopes of the October Revolution ended as the unambiguous result of the theoretical and political degeneration of Eastern Marxism. 5. The two Marxisms, the beginning and end of the Second 30 Years' War, along with the unexpected ramping up of the national and colonial question. The spread of Marxism worldwide deepened the differences between the West and East that had already emerged in the years that saw the birth of the international communist movement. Let's see what happened on the eve and at the start of the Second World War. In 1935, facing the ever-increasing threat of the Third Reich, the Communist International launched the Anti-Fascist Popular Front policy and promoted an alliance of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and the United States. This turning point did not meet with a chorus of agreement among black emancipation activists, didn't align with the traditional colonial powers and with the countries that incarnated the principle of white and Western supremacy both internally and internationally, mean turning one's back on the struggle for the emancipation of the colonial peoples? This was the opinion of the great black historian from Trinidad, the fervid admirer of Trotsky, CLR, James, who in 1962 described the evolution of another great activist in the cause of black emancipation, also from Trinidad, George Padmore. Once in America, George Padmore, became an active communist. He moved to Moscow to head their Negro Department of Propaganda and Organization. In that post, he became the best known and most trusted of agitators for African independence. In 1935, seeking alliances, the Kremlin separated Britain and France as democratic imperialisms from Germany and Japan, making the fascist imperialisms the main target of Russian and communist propaganda. This reduced activity for African emancipation to a farce. Germany and Japan had no colonies in Africa. Padmore broke instantly with the Kremlin. 35. Something analogous happened in South Africa, at that time a dominion of the British Empire. Suspected also in this case of undermining the struggle against the regime of white supremacy, the United Front anti-fascist policy was often criticized and rejected by the black communist militants, who called attention to Great Britain's role in the racist regime that exploited and oppressed them. 36. The position of Eastern Marxism was, you can't correctly evaluate the nature of a country by erasing that country's behavior toward the colonial peoples and those of colonial origins. It is necessary, however, to add that this was a provincial and short-sighted Eastern Marxism. Germany and Japan had no colonies in Africa, but they were preparing to impose an enormous colonial empire on Eastern Europe and Asia. Certainly, Germany and Japan did not count among the principal colonial powers, but they explicitly planned to establish slavery and to swallow whole peoples hitherto sheltered from colonial rule. In other words, the policy of the Anti-Fascist Popular Front was not in contradiction with the anti-colonial struggle. 4 years later, the international scene changed radically. In August 1939, the Non-Aggression Pact between the Soviet Union and Germany was signed. It did not arouse any particular disturbance among the colonial peoples or those of colonial origin. We find W.E.B. Du Bois, the great historian and African-American activist who was already moving toward the communist movement, continuing to compare the Third Reich to the United States since both sought to defend white supremacy domestically and internationally. Even a person as far from the communist movement as Gandhi, in an interview while the Soviet-Nazi pact was still in effect, compared Great Britain to Germany. He saw them as two great powers committed to defending or achieving colonial empires. The storm broke instead in the West and hit Marxists and communists hard, particularly in the North American Republic, where there was perhaps the most important section of the Fourth International, founded recently by Trotsky, and in this section, among the white activists, indignation knew no limits. The two countries that had signed the villainous pact must be put on the same level. They had come to an understanding because they both personified the horror of totalitarianism. Now this category, totally separated from the colonial question, included in its condemnation, on the one hand, the country that from the moment of its founding in the October Revolution had called on the slaves of the colonies to break their chains, and on the other, the country that intended to take over and radicalize the colonialist tradition, making it work in Eastern Europe as well, and even re-establishing slavery. Influenced by this climate, Trotsky resorted to using the category totalitarian dictatorship and put into the genus of this category the species Stalinist and fascist and Hitlerian, a usage that would become the common sense of the Cold War and the dominant ideology of today. And yet, this was not enough to avoid a devastating rift in the U.S. Trotskyist Party. The dissidents demanded that the Soviet Union be condemned as imperialist and co-responsible for the outbreak of the war on a par with Nazi Germany. On this point as well, the conflict between Western and Eastern Marxism emerged. Did the Second World War start on September 1, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland? Even if we want to remain focused only on Europe, why not add the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and the Italian-German intervention against the Spanish Republic, which had been supported by the Soviet Union but not by Great Britain and France? Above all, why ignore what was happening in Asia? In May 1938, Mao took stock of the situation. By now, 1/3 of the world's population has entered the war. Look, Italy, then Japan, Abyssinia, then Spain, then China. The population of the countries at war now amounts to almost 600 million, or nearly 1/3 of the world's total population. After attacking Abyssinia, Italy attacked Spain and Germany joined in, then Japan attacked China. What will come next? Undoubtedly, Hitler will fight the great powers. 37. Instead, the war had already begun and was aimed above all at the colonial peoples. Stalin shared this vision. A new imperialist war is already in its second year, a war waged over a huge territory stretching from Shanghai to Gibraltar and involving over 500 million people. The map of Europe, Africa, and Asia is being forcibly redrawn. From China's point of view, it was difficult to consider 1937, a year that brought the rape of Nanking by Japanese imperialism, with the massacre of 200,000 to 300,000 people, a period of peace. Far from sharing in the indignation of American Trotskyists and Western Marxists in general, the Chinese Communist leader expressed satisfaction over the non-aggression pact. It constitutes a great blow to Japan and a great help to China, since it will enable the Soviet Union to increase rather than decrease its aid to China by freeing it for some time from the threat of the Third Reich, and from the danger of fighting on two fronts to support China's resistance to Japanese aggression. The Chinese Communist leader was focused on the pro-slavery war of colonial subjection against his country unleashed by the Empire of the Rising Sun, a war largely ignored by Western Marxism. To conclude, the great historical crisis of the first half of the 20th century, which we have defined as the Second 30 Years' War, caused both at its start and at its end a bifurcation between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. At its start, Ho Chi Minh emphasized that the tragedy and horror had already begun to rage well before 1914 for the colonial peoples. Lenin called attention to the fact that the First World War was, in reality, the intersection of two wars, one raging in Europe among the slave owners and another, unleashed by the slave owners to round up slaves and cannon fodder in their colonies. The final stage of the Second 30 Years' War saw Western Marxism date the Second World War from its start in Europe rather than in the colonies, particularly in China. In any case, the defeat inflicted on Germany, Japan, and Italy flowed into the world anti-colonialist revolution, which would spread worldwide in the second half of the 20th century. Part 3: Western Marxism and the Anti-Colonial Revolution, a meeting that didn't happen. 1. The Bobbio-Togliatti debate in the year of Dien Bien Phu. For some time, thanks to the enormous prestige gained by the Soviet Union in the wake of Stalingrad, and the powerful echo sounding through Asia and around the world from the victory of the anti-colonialist revolution and of the Communist Party in China, the latent tensions between the two Marxisms seemed to be a chapter in a history now concluded. But this was only an appearance, as is demonstrated by the debate in Italy in 1954 among Norberto Bobbio, who was on the verge of becoming a world-famous philosopher, Galvano della Volpe, at the time the most illustrious philosopher of Marxism and Italian communism, and Palmiro Togliatti, General Secretary of the Communist Party and one of the principal leaders of the international communist movement. It was the first who initiated the debate. Bobbio recalls that in the years of the resistance and in those immediately following, he was one of those, believed in the by now irresistible force of the Communist Party. And, he adds, in the irresistible force of the revolutionary wave that continued to grow. We left decadentism behind us. It was the ideological expression of a class in decline. We had abandoned it because we participate in the birth and the hopes of a new class. I am convinced that if we have not learned from Marxism to see history from the point of view of the oppressed, gaining a new and immense perspective on the human world, we will not be saved. Either we will have sought refuge on the island of interiority, or we will have put ourselves at the service of the old masters. As a higher and more mature expression of modernity, Marxism here is not the thought of a single author so much as the starting point of a movement of social revolution that is still ongoing, and which seems unstoppable. It is not possible to turn history back toward the past. Whoever wants to reject Marxism wholesale knows they are preparing a quixotic effort. They must retrace the journey of 4 centuries and hurl themselves back into the Middle Ages. Beyond Marxism itself, Bobbio's judgment on the revolution it has inspired is positive. The October Revolution led to a radical transformation of the economically and socially backward feudal world. It brought forth a tumultuous and subversive wave that sooner or later would be uncorked and channeled into a more regular course. Indeed, we are in the presence of totalitarian regimes, but that was not cause for shock because these were a hard historical necessity, serious in the present but fated to be superseded. The praise of Marxism and communism was not addressed exclusively to the unresolved social question in the capitalist metropoles. Western civilization itself is put into question. Thanks to its technological success, it arrogates to itself the right to be the only possible form of civilization, and to consider therefore the course of human history as its exclusive prerogative. It was time to put an end to the philosophy of history that had overseen the colonial expansion of the capitalist West. History has only one direction, that is, the direction followed by the white civilization, on the margins of which lie only petrification, arrested development, barbarism. That there is not only one civilization worthy of the name, and that this one is the only one called on to exercise exclusive dominion, is the implicit assumption and the explicit consequence of the colonial expansion of the last 4 centuries that has not known any other form of contact with the other civilizations than to them in America, to enslave them in Africa, and to exploit them economically in Asia. We come to the debate of 1954. On the socialist states, the philosopher from Turin was somewhat more reserved. To their credit was having initiated a new phase of civil progress in politically backward countries, introducing traditionally democratic institutions, of formal democracy such as universal suffrage and elective offices, and of substantial democracy such as the collectivization of the forces of production. The new socialist state had to take to heart the mechanisms of liberal guarantees pouring a drop of oil in the machine of the revolution already accomplished. So far, this was a position that, with good reason, insisted on the essential character of formal freedom and its juridical institutional embodiment. Unfortunately, the Turin philosopher identified the cause of formal freedom with the liberal capitalist West, separating it from the colonial question. On May 7, 1954, at Dien Bien Phu, a popular army led by the Communist Party put an end to French colonial domination of Indochina and to the terror and infamy connected to it, which had already been forcefully denounced, as we have seen, by Ho Chi Minh. On the eve of the battle, the U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, asked the French Prime Minister, Georges Bidault, and if we gave you 2 atomic bombs? To use immediately, he meant. 9. In this same period, just to give another example, Great Britain responded to the challenge to its colonial dominion in Kenya by enclosing the civilian population in this country in terrible concentration camps in which the mass death of women and children was the norm. One understands, therefore, the position of Palmiro Togliatti, the secretary of the Italian Communist Party. When were these liberal principles, on which the British state of the 19th century is said to have been based, a model, I believe, for those who think like Bobbio, ever applied to the colonial peoples? The truth is that the liberal doctrine is founded on a barbaric discrimination between human creatures, beyond that of the colonies. Such discrimination rages in the very capitalist metropoles themselves, as is demonstrated by the case of American blacks, for the most part deprived of elementary rights, discriminated against, and persecuted. The Communist Party leader did not show any disdain for formal freedom. Of course, its realization cannot be heedless of the international situation, geopolitical context, or the terrible threats that weigh on the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries. But, notwithstanding the need to take into account the Cold War that, as the conversation between Dulles and Bidault demonstrates, was always on the verge of transforming itself into a nuclear holocaust, there was no doubt that freedom, mistakenly considered formal only by vulgar Marxism, was in fact essential in and of itself. The liberal and democratic upheavals have made clear a progressive tendency, of which the declarations of the rights of liberty are a part as much as are those of the new social rights. Rights of liberty and social rights have become and are the patrimony of this movement. Together with social rights, it is also and especially the demand for rights of liberty for the colonial peoples and those of colonial origin that constitutes the dividing line between the socialist and the communist movements on the one hand and Western liberalism on the other. 2. Marx, cut in half by Della Volpe and Coletti. Della Volpe, considered the most illustrious Italian Marxist philosopher of the time, intervened in the debate opened by Bobbio before Togliatti. One thing leaps out immediately: the difference in the positions of the great intellectual and those of the secretary of his party. Unlike the latter, the former made no mention of the colonial question, nor of the permanent state of exception imposed on the agents of revolutions looked on with hostility by the liberal West. Della Volpe instead followed a different strategy, concentrating on the celebration of libertas maior, the concrete development of individuality guaranteed by the material conditions of life and made possible by socialism. By doing so, on the one hand, he devalued the juridical guarantees of freedom by the liberal state, which he now happily demoted to libertas minor. On the other hand, he ended up confirming the transfiguration by which Bobbio made the liberal tradition into the champion of the cause of universal enjoyment of civil rights, formal freedoms of the libertas minor, of limitations on state power. Bobbio had called for studying and understanding liberalism by going to the school of Locke and Montesquieu and the Federalist Papers. Colonial questions and histories were eliminated. Beyond being a shareholder, In the Royal African Company, the society that organized the African slave trade, Locke was, as noted by the illustrious historian of the institution of slavery, David Bryan Davis, the last great philosopher who sought to justify absolute and perpetual slavery. As for Montesquieu, he had called for taking note of the uselessness of slavery among us, in our climes, and therefore wanted to limit natural servitude naturelle to certain countries. Finally, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, Madison, was himself a slave owner. The authors Bobbio regarded as teachers were the embodiment of the barbaric discrimination between human creatures that Togliatti charged liberalism with. John Stuart Mill's Hymn to Liberty in his most celebrated text, On Liberty, was particularly important to the philosopher from Turin. 14, and yet, in this essay, the English liberal justifies the despotism of the West over the still juvenile races, kept in a state of implicit obedience so that they can be set on the path of progress. In the 1950s, the despotism and the implicit obedience imposed by the West were felt in Indochina, in Africa, and throughout the colonial world. In the United States itself, at least in the South, blacks were exposed to the violence of both the local police and of racist and fascist bands, encouraged and tolerated by the authorities. And, overwhelmed by the celebration of Libertas Major, Della Volpe remained unconcerned or was unable to highlight Bobbio's glaring injuries. Unfortunately, Della Volpe was giving lessons. His disciples also distinguished themselves by their scarce attention to the colonial question. One thinks of Lucio Colletti. In his Marxist period, he demonstrated the underlying limits of the freedom so dear to the liberal capitalist world, referring to the workhouses or houses of correction, where, often on the simple word of the police, the unemployed and the poor, all those considered suspect of being idle vagabonds, were incarcerated, and defining them as concentration camps of the enlightened bourgeoisie. The argument was fitting, a shame that it was partially undermined by the actual concentration camps of the enlightened bourgeoisie reserved for the barbarians in the colonies. Consistent with this silence at the moment of his break with Marxism and communism, Colletti outlined a disastrous account of the historical events initiated by the October Revolution, without saying a word about the inspiration this event had given to the worldwide anti-colonial revolution. The crisis of Marxism, he observed in 1980, dates from many decades ago, but to be exact, a revolutionary Marxist like Karl Korsch had already identified it in 1931. He had identified it when the world colonialist system was still quite vigorous, so much so that Hitler proposed extending it to Eastern Europe to build the German Indies. Did the anti-colonial revolution, that subsequently exploded on a planetary scale, have something to do with Marxism and communism? It was a question completely absent in the work of the philosopher happily ensconced in the liberal capitalist world. Indeed, he mocked the interest that obstinate, incorrigible Marxists showed toward the underdeveloped countries and the peasants, the rural plebes, a subject not only extraneous to the Marxist tradition, but to which at least classical Marxism had often shown itself to be hostile. As if Marx had not dedicated a considerable part of his work to the struggle for the liberation of the Irish and Polish peoples, each consisting in large part of peasants, and as if together with Engels, he had not bitterly and repeatedly criticized the English working class for its substantial subordination to British colonialism. Ignored in particular was Marx's great thesis. The profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization lies unveiled before our eyes, moving from its home, where it assumes respectable form, to the colonies, where it goes naked. By reducing Marx to a critic of the respectable forms assumed by capitalist dominion and by erasing the colonial question, Colletti had no difficulty in developing a Manichaean evaluation of the chapter of history that began with the October Revolution, a revolution, as Lenin noted, that had exploded on the scene to put an end to the war between slave owners for the consolidation and strengthening of colonial slavery. In the view of the philosopher finally converted to the ideals of the liberal and capitalist West, these ideals permanently embodied the cause of freedom and tolerance. Indeed, he does not fail to mention the massacre of more than 1 million communists in Indonesia, nor the bloodbath that followed the military coup in Chile and the assassination of Allende in September 1973. In both cases, however, no reference was made to the role of the United States, which had decided to destroy Third Worldism, of which the Indonesia of Sukarno, whom they took aim at in 1965, was a leading example, and to uphold the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America. No, the massacre and the bloodbath were evoked only to reiterate the failure of communism and Marxism, which cut a poor figure compared to the West champion of the cause of freedom. 3. Workerism and the condemnation of Third Worldism. Disinterest in the colonial question can also be asserted and practiced in the name of a rigorous revolutionary theory and practice that, without letting itself be distracted by the countries of the periphery and by classes that, for the most part, are still linked to the pre-industrial world, instead concentrate on the capitalist metropoles and on the antagonist of class struggle par excellence, the working class. This is what happens in Italian upperismo workerism, and in particular in the work of Mario Tronti. Our workerism should be given credit for not falling into the trap of Third Worldism, of the countryside against the city, of the farmers' long marches. We're never Chinese. 21. The founding text of Italian workerism made clear, in unequivocal terms in the title Workers and Capital, who the social subjects that interested Tronti were. We are in 1966. In Vietnam, the struggle for national liberation dared to challenge the mastodon-sized military apparatus of the United States, which the year before had played a not-to-be-forgotten role in the repression in Indonesia, in the massacre of hundreds of thousands of communists, during the defeat inflicted on the Third World militants of that country. In Latin America, the struggle against the Monroe Doctrine was fierce, and in the name of that doctrine, in 1961, the Kennedy administration attempted to invade and subjugate Cuba. In summary, the struggle between colonialism and anti-colonialism had exploded, and this contributed to feeding a crisis that, starting with installing Soviet missiles on the rebel island, pushed the world to the verge of a nuclear catastrophe. Without letting himself be distracted by all this, Tronti imagined Lenin in England, as the title of a central chapter of his book has it, leaving behind a still scarcely developed Russia. The great revolutionary relocated himself to the center of the capitalist metropole, but not to analyze from within. The British Empire, which was involved in one colonial war after another, and was ready to battle for world hegemony as the country that exploits the whole world angles, and because of which, according to Marx's denunciation, the very same working class, infected by the dominant ideology, considered and treated the Irish, inhabitants of a colony, barbarically exploited and oppressed as niggers. No, instead, in England, Lenin was exclusively concerned with the factories and working conditions. In other words, the great revolutionary is here read as the kind of trade unionist he bitterly criticized. Instead of England in the 19th and 20th centuries, let's try to imagine Lenin in the United States in the 1960s. He would have found in the most developed capitalist country and leader of imperial and colonial oppression around the world, in the country where not a few times the workers and their unions threatened, and not only with words, students often of bourgeois origins protesting the draft and the war in Vietnam. However, from the theoretical point of view of workerism, Lenin should have only concerned himself with the working class. Tronti did not give up his search for a pure state of class struggle, and in a recent essay, 4 decades after the publication of Workers and Capital, he felt he could finally state that was the true annus mirabilis. In 1969, the issue wasn't anti-authoritarianism, but anti-capitalism. Workers and capital found themselves physically face-to-face with one another. Here, he refers not to England or the United States, but to Italy. It is worth noting that, to find a class struggle in a pure state, Tronti was forced to have recourse to a country where the Communist Party exercised an enormous influence, thanks to the same political line of grand alliances that the theoretician of workerism did not in any way share. However, there is no doubt that the autumn of 1969 saw great developments in workers' struggles. The workers were encouraged by and joined with a mass presence of students. Not a few of these were of bourgeois origin and arrived at militant political activity starting precisely from the struggle against authoritarianism, identified and denounced first and foremost in the family and at school. Others underwent a process of political radicalization on the wave of protest against the barbaric war waged against Vietnam, and also from their enthusiasm for the effective resistance of an intrepid people against the gigantic military apparatus of their invaders. These were the years when, in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, the anti-colonial revolution supported by the socialist countries achieved brilliant success, and U.S. imperialism was in serious difficulty. It was a climate that made itself felt in Italy, where there was a communist party, stronger than ever, to which a large part of the militants and leaders that organized the great popular and workers' struggles belonged. With a more attentive look, the class struggle, which in the eyes of Tronti seemed to have finally achieved its pure form, reveals itself to have been nurtured from the start by the most diverse set of contradictions, including that of an anti-colonial revolution. The polemic against the possible contaminations of the class struggle assumed militant tones. We have already seen the mockery of the campaign of the countryside against the city, of the farmers' long marches. Here, the greatest anti-colonial revolution in history, which in China achieved success through the victory of the countryside, is the target of workerist sarcasm, along with one of its high points, which saw the revolutionaries led by the Communist Party march for thousands of kilometers, under fire from reactionaries, to fight the Japanese invasion that sought to enslave the Chinese people. This type of more or less workerist sarcasm is not new. Proudhon was likewise concerned with safeguarding the purity of the struggle between the poor and the rich, or between victims and beneficiaries of the theft that he considered property to be. He made fun of the struggles for national liberation of the Polish people oppressed by the Tsarist autocracy. Marx, who had founded the International Workingmen's Association in 1865, dubbed this kind of mockery moronic cynicism. Tronti does not seem to have reflected on this page of the history of the workers' movement. Instead, he doubles down on the question the workers always had, they had to have, a mission to complete, and it was always saving something it had to be. This mission, save the factory, save the country, save peace, save the people of the Third World from imperialist aggression 25. It is not explained here what, for example, the Chinese workers should have done while their country was being invaded. Continue to make wage demands without worrying about the enslavement that loomed over them and their fellow citizens? The binary reading of social conflict, which sees only one contradiction between workers and capital, transforms this same contradiction into a prison marked by the most narrow-minded corporatism. And this corporatism distorts the reading of history. The 20th century is the age of worldwide civil war. In this frame, the world anti-colonial revolution has vanished, and it has vanished both as armed struggle and as economic struggle. while the countries that have achieved national independence sought to make that independence concrete and solid through the hard work of economic and technological development. Workerism called for the workers' suppression of work. 4. Althusser. Anti-humanism and anti-colonialism. However, even when it was cheered on and supported, the anti-colonialist revolution could be approached using categories that made it difficult to comprehend. Let's return to the barbaric discrimination between human creatures that Togliatti charged the capitalist colonialist system with. It was a denunciation that rang with humanism, and the humanism, as we shall see, was celebrated by Gramsci, but later on would be demonized by Louis Althusser. This thinker, unlike Tronti, could not pretend to never having been Chinese. The French philosopher referred repeatedly and positively to Mao Zedong, appreciating him most of all as a theoretician of contradictions and dialectics. It was a homage rendered to thought that had matured, starting from what can be considered the greatest anti-colonialist revolution in history, that saw the most populous country in the world and one with a millennia-old civilization confront theoretically and practically, and in a long struggle, multiple contradictions and enemies of diverse natures. However, Althusser undermines the homage to the world anti-colonialist revolution, then occurring with anti-humanist theorizing. This precludes comprehension of those class struggles that, far from being merely economic, are struggles for recognition. This is true especially for the struggles of colonial peoples and those of colonial origin, to the detriment of whom the dehumanization imposed by the capitalist imperialist system manifested in a particularly brutal way. This is why, throughout contemporary history, the great tests of strength between abolitionism and slavery, between anti-colonialism and colonialism, saw, ideologically, the pathos of the universal concept of humanity on the one side and its negation and denigration on the other. These struggles saw, in other words, the confrontation between humanism and anti-humanism. At the end of the 18th century, Toussaint Louverture led the great revolution of black slaves, invoking the absolute adoption of the principle for which no man, red that is, mulatto, black or white may he be, can be the property of his kind. No matter how humble his condition, men cannot be confused with animals, as was the case under the system of slavery. On the other side, Napoleon, determined to reintroduce colonial domination and black slavery to Saint-Domingue, Haiti, proclaimed, "I am for the whites because I am white. There is no other reason beyond this, but this is good enough." 28. Let's move on to the English-speaking world now. A celebrated abolitionist poster showed a black slave in chains exclaiming, "Am I not a man and a brother?" A few decades later, while the colonial system was at its apogee, at the entrance to certain public parks in the U.S., South signs said entrance forbidden to dogs and Negroes, while in Shanghai, the French concession defended its purity by making quite visible signs reading entrance forbidden to dogs and Chinese. It was a phenomenon of worldwide dimensions, fully used to being considered niggers after the Great Revolt of the Sepoys in 1857. The inhabitants of India in the spring of 1919 found themselves the subjects of a terrible humiliation. After making an essential contribution to Great Britain's victory in the First World War, they protested to demand, if not independence, some form of self-government. At Amritsar, the repression by the colonial power was distinguished by its brutality. It not only cost the lives of hundreds of unarmed protesters, it also required the inhabitants of the rebellious city to crawl on all fours to return home or to go out from their homes. The dehumanization of the colonial peoples is manifested in a way that is simultaneously flexible and repugnant. We can therefore understand the view of a 19th century author who would become dear to Nazism. Houston S. Chamberlain, while celebrating the dawn of the 20th century as the century of race and the century of colonies, mocked the so-called unity of the human race, which, in his view, science and history refuted, and which remained pathetically embraced only by the socialists. Later, the most illustrious ideologue of Nazis, Alfred Rosenberg, intoned against the dogma of a presumed general development of humanity and ironically commented on the persistent influence of religion and Jewish mythology. The old Jehovah is now called humanity. 29. It was a chapter of history that went well beyond Germany and Europe. The universalist pathos that resounded from the October Revolution and its appeal to the colonial slaves to break their chains was met with the theory of the Underman, Untermensch, the subhuman. It is a category that the American author Lothrop Stoddard would later formulate in a book soon translated into German that prescribes Hitler's campaign to colonize Eastern Europe, enslave the Slavs, and exterminate the Jews, along with the Bolsheviks, who were seen as ideologues and instigators of the revolt of the inferior races. For Italian fascism, likewise committed to colonialist and racist counter-revolution, the abyss separating one race or nation from another was unbridgeable, to the point that, in Mussolini's eyes, expressions such as the human race were too evanescent or even without meaning. Finally, in Asia, Japan continued its colonial expansion together with the dehumanization of the Chinese, who, from the late 19th century, had been represented as similar to beasts, often compared to apes or pigs. 31. Certainly, under pressure from denunciations that brought to light its inhuman character, colonialism was sometimes forced to assume a universalist guise. Historically, how did the protagonists of the movements for emancipation react? Du Bois has no difficulty in noting that the universalist keywords peace, Christianity, commerce, used so often by the British Empire and the American Republic, coexisted with raging hatred for the darker races that they accused each other of. The fact was that colonialism and imperialism were built on the inhuman exploitation of human beings, considered to be outside of humanity. The struggle for universalism led to a confrontation with a socio-political system whose practice of dehumanization was intrinsic. The communist movement's position was no different. Lenin called attention to the fact that, in the eyes of the West, the victims of the war and of colonial expansionism don't even deserve the appellation of peoples. Perhaps the Asians and Africans are peoples? They were excluded from the human community. Gramsci was even more explicit. Writing in the 1930s, he observed that even for a philosopher such as Henri Bergson, in reality, humanity means West. This is how the champions of the defense of the West argue and is the dominant culture in the West. Communism instead was synonymous with integral humanism, a humanism that challenged the prejudices and the arrogance of the white Superman 34, in other words, pseudo-universality, which consists of the arbitrary upgrading to a universal of a particular and often vicious determinate, is frequently masked by recourse to a truer and richer meta-universality. While politically compromising understanding of the great socio-political struggles of contemporary history, theoretically, anti-humanism leads to two relevant and quite negative consequences. Marx more than once insisted that his theory was the theoretical expression of real processes and movements, of a real class struggle. With Althusser, instead, historical materialism and the real movement that it contributed to and promoted were the result of an epistemological break. Just as for Della Volpe, they are the result of a scientific method that is the fruit of the teachings of Galileo, and before him, Aristotle, the critic of Plato. And so we encounter an idealist distortion of historical materialism, which came to us thanks to the work of one individual, who discovered a new continent. Following the discovery of the continent of mathematics by the Greeks, Marx launched the discovery of continent history. After having repeatedly accused humanism of obscuring the class struggle, Althusser, together with Della Volpe, would make the class struggle vanish from historical materialism. This idealistic regression was, at the same time, a Eurocentric regression. In Marx and Engels, historical materialism presupposed, on the one hand, the Industrial Revolution, and, on the other, political revolution, starting with the French Revolution. Neither of these revolutions is exclusively European. The former led to the formation of the world market, to colonial expansion, to the original accumulation of capital. The latter saw one of its highest points in the rising of the black slaves of Saint-Domingue and in the abolition of colonial slavery decreed in Paris by the Jacobin Convention. With Althusser, as with Della Volpe, the development of historical materialism is a chapter intellectual history conducted exclusively in Europe. We can well understand the reasons for the attitude taken by the French philosopher. These were the years when the banner of humanism was waved to mute the struggle against imperialism. It began the process that would later lead to Gorbachev's capitulation. Looking carefully, we see that the philosophical critique of humanism, which tended to obscure social conflict, was a way to distance oneself from conceptions tainted with reformism and opportunism, or quite simply revisionist, that were widespread during these years. 36. Unfortunately, this polemic took off from an erroneous position. In the first place, it is worth keeping in mind that the appeal to the human community and to morality and the call to science can lead to forgetting the class struggle. However, the French philosopher quite rightly took a position against the phrase that, condemning the interclassist view of science, counterposed proletarian science to bourgeois science. He recognized Stalin's merit in being opposed to the zeal of those who were making strenuous efforts to prove language an ideological superstructure. Thanks to these few simple pages, concludes Althusser, we could see that there were limits to the use of the class criterion that we had been made to treat science, a status claimed by every page of Marx. Oh, and as far as morality is concerned, to put on the same plain positions that demanded the unity of the human race and positions that denied and mocked it, to argue in the name of a self-styled purely proletarian class struggle meant losing sight of the real class struggle based on the dehumanization of large masses of human beings, degraded to untermenschen and destined only to be oppressed, enslaved, or annihilated. Arguing against a humanist reading of Marxism, Althusser never tired of repeating that Marx did not start from man or the individual, but from the historical structures and social relations. However, it's clear that the concept of man or of the individual is taken for granted. In reality, the concept of the individual and of man as such, independent of sex status or skin color, is the result of the centuries-long struggle for recognition, conducted under the banner of humanism so disparaged by Althusser. That also goes for women considered by nature incapable of being political actors and thinkers and of engaging in intellectually skilled work. For the waged workers of the metropoles, reduced to instruments of labor, to bipedal machines and to pack animals, and in a particular way to the colonized peoples, dehumanized in every way. The French philosopher recognized that a revolutionary humanism could also be born from the October Revolution. But on this point, he is somewhat hesitant. So he precludes understanding of the gigantic struggle conducted by the slaves of the colonies, to use a phrase dear to Lenin and aimed at gaining recognition of their human dignity. Althusser considered the category of man to be compromised by interclassism and incapable of calling attention to the reality of exploitation and oppression. But here, he made his second theoretical error. There are no terms that in themselves can express in a pure state social and political antagonisms. There are no ideologically and politically pure terms that were always and only utilized by revolutionaries and only in a revolutionary way. In the United States in the 19th century, Democratic referred to the party committed to defending the enslavement of blacks and the regime of white supremacy. This is also true for the categories that seem to be inextricably intertwined with the history of the workers' movement. In France, after the 1848 revolution, the banner of labor and respect for the dignity of labor began to be waved by conservatives committed to denouncing as idle and as bums revolutionary agitators or workers on strike to improve their living and working conditions. Further along this road than anyone else is Hitler, who, in the name of the party he founded and led, sets himself up as the champion of socialism and the German workers. Notwithstanding their different starting points, Althusser comes to the same conclusions as Tronti. The Italian author never tires of restating that universalism is the classical bourgeois vision of man. Fortunately, there are the workers. With them, and only with them, we can finally leave behind universal values because, from their point of view, these are always ideologically bourgeois. In place of universalism, Althusser takes aim at humanism. But we are in the presence of the same outlook. Without being aware of it, he ends up embellishing his target with a critique that, nevertheless, seeks to be intransigent and to eschew all compromise. In reality, stamping universalism or humanism as in itself bourgeois, or inclined to compromise with the bourgeoisie, means halting the critique of capitalist society halfway. It means reproaching the purely formal nature of civil and political rights, whose owner should be humanity as such, in its universality, but without mention of the frightening exclusion that deprives colonial peoples or peoples of colonial origin of civil and political rights, and economic and social rights. That is, it glosses over the colonial condition, which also, in Marx's view, reveals par excellence the barbarity of capitalist society. In that case, the dehumanizing character of the existing order was revealed in all its brutality and ended up manifesting itself explicitly, as was confirmed in a particularly sensational way in the United States, where theories of racial inferiority preceded the theory of the Underman Untermensch. In other words, Togliatti was much more consequential and radical when he denounced the barbaric discrimination between human creatures on which capitalist society is founded. 6. Bloch's legacy and the transfiguration of liberalism, notwithstanding their passionate denunciation of universalism and of humanism, which substantially eliminates the colonial question. Tronti and Althusser end up paradoxically converging on the position of Bloch, who, from the start, credited without hesitation both universalism and humanism to the Western liberalism he loved to boast about. During the First World War, we have seen that the German philosopher endorsed the ideology of the Entente, which claimed it wanted to bring to the Central Powers and the entire world the very democracy that was obstinately denied to the colonial peoples. The liberal West was counterposed positively by Bloch to not only the Germany of Wilhelm II, but also the country born of the October Revolution. On the latter, the young philosopher expressed a severe judgment without waiting for the withdrawal from Russia of the German army, or, even less, for the end of the Civil War. The proletarians of the world have not fought for 4.5 years against Prussia in the name of worldwide democracy. To then abandon freedom and the democratic line, the pride of Western culture, in the name of the conquest of socio-economic democracy, referring to Soviet Russia. As this last passage suggests, he made a comparison to the North American Republic. With the admiration for Wilson, already one could think, as socialists, that it would have been possible that the son of Washington would one day supersede the awaited son of Moscow, that freedom and purity could come from capitalist America. There is a duplicitous erasure at work here. We pass over the fact that the war provoked a climate of terror and witch hunts in the countries where the liberal tradition was most firmly rooted, and that, thanks to their geographic location, were a safe distance from the battlefields or from the threat of invasion. The most serious erasure, however, concerned the colonial question. Only a few years earlier, the United States that Bloch celebrated put down through merciless repression and genocidal practices the revolution for independence in the Philippines. On its own territory, between the 19th and 20th centuries, a terrorist regime of white supremacy repeatedly subjected black people to lynchings, to torture and slow and interminable execution staged as a mass spectacle for the festive white community. The Second World War saw an eruption of the colonial question well beyond the colonial world. Hitler sought to build a German Indies in Eastern Europe, at times comparing it to a kind of Wild West. Like the American Indians, the indigenous in the Third Reich had to be deported and exterminated to conquer their territory for the white and German race. The survivors were destined to work like the black slaves forever at the service of the master race. Not dissimilar was the practice of the Japanese Empire in Asia. However, the centrality assumed by the colonial question did not lead to any rethinking by Bloch. In 1961, Bloch published Natural Law and Human Dignity. As the title indicates, this is far from the underrating so dear to the Della Volpe of Libertas Minor. On the contrary, the defense of the legacy of the liberal tradition is front and center. The criticism of this tradition continued to be that which we have already seen the young Bloch express with the words of Anatole France in The Liberal Capitalist World. Equality before the law, that it forbids rich and poor alike to steal firewood or to sleep under bridges. In Natural Law and Human Dignity, the philosopher reiterated that liberalism is wrong to advocate for a formal judicial equality that remains purely formal. 2. This affirmation can be read in a book published in the same year that Paris police unleashed a merciless witch hunt against Algerians, drowning many in the Seine or killing them with their batons. And all this happened in the light of day, indeed in the presence of French citizens who, under the protection of the law, assisted while enjoying the spectacle, anything but formal equality. In the capital city of a liberal and capitalist country, we see at work the dual legislation that consigned to arbitrary will and to police terror a defined ethnic group. 3. If then we take into consideration the colonies and the semi-colonies, and we turn our attention to, for example, Algeria, Kenya, or Guatemala, a formally independent country but in fact a U.S. protectorate, we see that the dominant capitalist and liberal state has recourse on a large scale and in a systematic way to torture, concentration, camps, and genocidal practices against the indigenous populations. There is not a trace of any of this in Bloch. The colonial peoples and those of colonial origin continue to be absent. When the author of Natural Law and Human Dignity reconstructed the history of modernity and liberalism, he appreciates Grotius's and Locke's natural law approach but does not mention their efforts to justify black slavery. Referring to the American War of Independence, he paid homage to the struggle of the newly liberated states, but passed over in silence the weight of slavery in the socio-political reality in the U.S. Constitution itself. 44. Even more striking is his silence over the fact that it was in precisely these years that the African-American struggle to definitively abolish the regime of white supremacy developed in the Republic on the other side of the Atlantic. It was a development that caught Mao Zedong's attention in Beijing, and it is interesting to compare the positions of two such different personalities. The German philosopher denounced the merely formal character of liberal and capitalist equality. The communist leader instead emphasized the intersection of social and racial inequality. The blacks suffered from a higher unemployment rate than whites, were confined to inferior segments of the labor market, and were forced to accept reduced wages. Mao did not stop here. He also called attention to the racist violence unleashed by the authorities of the South and by bands tolerated and encouraged by them. And he celebrated the struggle of the American black people against racial discrimination and for freedom and equal rights. 5. Bloch instead criticized the bourgeois revolution for limiting equality to political equality. Regarding African Americans, Mao noted, most of them are deprived of the right to vote. Reduced to commodities and dehumanized by their oppressors, the colonial peoples for centuries have conducted memorable battles for recognition. But in Bloch we read that the idea that men are born free and equal can already be found in Roman law. Now, it should also be found in reality. Now let's look at the conclusion of the article by the Chinese communist leader devoted to the struggle of African Americans for emancipation, the evil colonialist imperialist, with the enslaving and trafficking of the black people, and it will certainly come to an end with the complete liberation of the black people. As we see in the citations from Mao, as in those we have noted by Ho Chi Minh, there is none of the undervaluation dear to Della Volpe and his Libertas Minor, nor the illusion, common in different ways to Della Volpe, Bloch, and Bobbio, that capitalism and liberalism would guarantee in any case formal equality or even political equality. 7. Horkheimer, From Anti-Authoritarianism to Philo. Colonialism. The incomprehension of the colonial question culminated in a current of thought to which we are indebted for its brilliant and acute analyses of the social, political, and moral problems peculiar to capitalist society. I refer to the Frankfurt School. In his 1942 work, The Authoritarian State, Max Horkheimer summed up the history that began with the October Revolution. The condemnation was unconditional. In Russia, there was not socialism, but state capitalism. Of course, we need to recognize that it increases production in an extraordinary way, and this was of great benefit to the economically retarded territories of the world, so that they could make up in rapid time their backwardness with respect to the more advanced countries. 50. At least this could be considered a positive result, right? In reality, it is true that the Russia the Bolsheviks governed with an iron fist succeeded in bringing about industrial and economic development and had become a model, but who feels its appeal? Instead of dissolving in the end into the democracy of the councils, the group, the Communist Party, can maintain itself as a leadership. Work, discipline, and order can save the republic and tidy up the revolution. Even when the abolition of the state is written on its banner, that party transfigured its industrially backward fatherland into the secret vision of those industrial powers who were suffering from their parliamentarism and could no longer live without fascism. 51. While these lines were being written, the Nazi army, after having subjugated the better part of Europe, was at the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. Their entire populations faced the threat of death at the hands of a terrifying war machine or through a merciless siege and the starvation stemming from it. In these circumstances, what sense did the evocation of the democracy of the councils, or even less the utopian idea of the abolition of the state have? At that moment, the accomplishment of Hitler's project seemed to be at hand, a project that explicitly aimed at enslaving the peoples of Eastern Europe to build a great colonial empire on a continental scale. If subjected to the formidable pressure of a gigantic military apparatus and of an experiment in brutal efficiency, The Soviet Union could resist because of the forced march to industrial development to which Horkheimer refers. But he paid no attention to all this, and saw as irrelevant the fact that in this conflict there was, on one side, colonialism and slavery, and on the other, anti-colonialism and anti-slavery. In the eyes of the prestigious exponent of critical theory, it was, if anything, the country of the October Revolution that was on the verge of being enslaved after its population was decimated that deserved the most severe judgment. Integral statism, or state socialism, is the most consequential form of the authoritarian state, which has freed itself from dependence on private capital. In integral statism, socialization is simply decreed. Private capitalists are eliminated. Integral statism is not a retreat, but an advance of power. It can exist without racism. 52. And so the crisis of critical theory emerged again. To Horkheimer, it seemed irrelevant that there were differences between a country committed to imposing a racist state and to decimating and enslaving the inferior races, and exterminating the political and ethnic groups, Bolsheviks and Jews, seen as instigators of the revolt of the inferior races, and a country that knew it was one of the intended victims of this racist state, and which desperately defended itself against it. Even with an eye to the past and on the level of the philosophy of history in general, Horkheimer pays little or no attention to the colonial or racial question. The French Revolution tended toward totalitarianism. So he targeted the revolution that, at the dawn of the contemporary age, spurred the great uprising of enslaved blacks in Saint-Domingue and pushed the Jacobin Convention in Paris to decree the abolition of slavery in the colonies. Two other revolutions, in 17th century England and in Britain's North American colonies in the 18th century, were immune from the of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. Both revolutions furthered the institution of slavery. In the North American Republic, revolution brought about the first emergence of the racial state, not by coincidence slave owners presided over it in its first decades. Horkheimer's condemnation of the French Revolution knew no limits. The sans-culottes Jesus heralded the coming of the Nordic Christ. 4. Robespierre. The figure stirred by the most radical currents of the French Revolution with a view to breaking down once and for all the quasi-naturalistic barrier that in the Ancien Regime separated the working classes from the elites is likened to the figure cultivated by the reactionary culture that resulted in Nazism and who was committed to re-establishing the natural barrier between peoples and races, swept away by the epic uprising of the Black Jacobins of Saint-Domingue and by the abolition of black slavery in Paris, achieved by Robespierre. Once the French Revolution and the October Revolution had been disposed of, all that remained was to genuflect before a liberalism mythically transfigured and identified with the slogan and the defense of the autonomy of the individual. It is a transfiguration that also affected Locke, whom Horkheimer read as a champion of the principle that all people are free, equal, and independent. And again, as if by magic, slavery and the defense of black slavery disappeared from the work of a philosopher who benefited materially from it, being a stockholder in the Royal African Company, which managed the traffic in human beings. Given these presuppositions, the lack of attention, the diffidence, and even the hostility with which Horkheimer views the worldwide anti-colonial revolution is not surprising. He read the history of his time as a struggle between civilized states and totalitarian states. This also went for the Cold War. I must say that if the civilized states didn't spend enormous sums on armaments, we would find ourselves already under the domination of those totalitarian powers. If one criticizes, one must also know that those criticized cannot act differently. It was 1970. The war against Vietnam raged greater than ever, and its colonial character and genocidal practices were evident to all. And yet, the most authoritative exponent of critical theory had no doubts. The civilized West must defend itself from the barbarians of the East. Nor did the African Americans struggle against the persistent regime of white supremacy in the U.S. South trouble Horkheimer's certainty. Yes, he discussed the current difficult situation of race relations beyond the Atlantic, but he emphasized the terrorism of the Negro activists over other Negroes that is much stronger than one thinks. The average Negro is more afraid of other Negroes than of whites, he wrote. 58. All in all, the worldwide anti-colonial revolution was pretty useless. The Negro-American issue could be rapidly resolved if the conflict between East and West did not exist, and if the same were true of the backward parts of the world. The discrimination that African Americans were fighting against was put on the bill of the Cold War and the anti-colonial revolution, as reflected in the critical reference to the terrorism of Negro activists in the United States and to the role of the Third World. In reality, things were exactly the opposite. In December 1952, the Supreme Court declared racial segregation unconstitutional in public schools, but only after the Justice Department informed it that a different decision would have radicalized the colored races and promoted the communist movement in the Third World and in the United States itself. The passage from diffidence to hostility is smooth. Our most recent critical theory has not fought for the revolution because after the fall of Nazism in the Western countries, the revolution would bring about a new terrorism, a terrible situation. It is instead a question of preserving that which has positive value, for example, autonomy, the importance of the individual, his differentiated psychology, some moments of culture, without arresting progress. 61. This declaration does not seem to distinguish between the West and the Third World. So even the anti-colonial revolution then occurring in Vietnam, or that which had been victorious some years earlier in Algeria was, compared to a new terrorism, Of a more general character is this additional declaration. Critical theory has the function of expressing that which, in general, is not expressed. It must therefore emphasize the costs of progress, the dangers that follow it, and that end up dissolving. Even the idea of an autonomous subject, the idea of the soul because it appears irrelevant in the presence of the universe. Now we want the world to be unified. We want the third world to no longer suffer from hunger or be forced to live on the brink of hunger anymore. But to achieve this goal, we must pay the price of a society that takes the form of a world administration. That which Marx imagined to be socialism, in reality, is the administered world. 62. We see the condemnation of socialism, the anti-colonial revolution, and the economic development of the peoples liberated or seeking to liberate themselves from the colonial yoke. We face a terrible alternative: resign ourselves to the poverty of the masses prevailing outside the West or fall into the horror of an administered world. And at least for the critical theorist, the second option is much worse than the first. 8. Adorno's imperial universalism. It is possible to ascertain an element of regression in Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. Regarding fascism, Dialectic of Enlightenment, the book they jointly published in the 1940s, observes that, before its spread and triumph in the heart of Europe itself, totalitarian capitalism and the totalitarian order had involved only the poor and savages. The preparatory stages of fascism were identified with the violence perpetrated by the great Western powers against the colonial peoples and consummated in the heart of the capitalist metropole against the poor and marginalized, trapped in a sort of concentration camp, the workhouse. It was acknowledged, to some extent, that Nazi fascism had made its first attempts at expansionism and colonial rule. It is true the victims were savages, rather than peoples with their own history and culture who sought to build an independent national state. However, it was still a condemnation of colonialism and the nexus between Nazism and colonialism. All this disappears without leaving a trace a few years later, with the coming of the Cold War, when the anti-colonialist revolution merged with the international communist movement and, reaching the Middle East, put into question the policies and even the existence of the State of Israel. At this point, the polemic against the revolutionary agitation of the Third World became a constant theme and was developed in the name of universalism. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno rejected the Hegelian category of the spirit of the people, that is, the attention to the national question, as reactionary and regressive compared to the Kantian universal of his time. Humanity now seen as affected by nationalism and provincialism in the era of world conflicts and of the potential for a global organization of the world. Even worse, it was devotion to a fetish, a collective subject, the nation, in which individuals disappear without a trace. In which it was a stance that, in retrospect, delegitimized the revolution promoted and directed by the National Liberation Front of Algeria, a people and a country undoubtedly more provincial, more backward, and less cosmopolitan than the France against which they were waging an insurgency. It also delegitimized the anti-colonial revolutions taking place under Adorno's eyes, beginning with the one led by the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. In the latter case, the philosopher's negative judgment was unequivocal and without nuance in The Security of America. An emigrant could endure the news of Auschwitz. It would be difficult to believe that Vietnam is robbing anyone of sleep, especially since every opponent of colonial wars must know that the Viet Cong, for their part, used Chinese methods of torture. Adorno made this declaration in 1969, the year before the My Lai massacre had occurred. A brigade, at the orders of Lieutenant William Calley, did not hesitate to kill 347 civilians, including the old, women, children, and newborns. It was the irrefutable confirmation of the genocidal practices by which Washington's army disgraced itself. Still today, 40 years after the end of that war, no count exists of the Vietnamese killed by dioxin sprayed without concern on the civilian population by U.S. aircraft. All this was compared to Auschwitz and reduced to a trifle, and such trifles did not make Adorno lose sleep. On the contrary, he mocked those who did lose sleep because of it, rather than because of the Chinese methods of torture attributed to the Viet Cong, who were, after all, the victims. It is a page that dishonors philosophy, but it is a page that does not constitute an isolated incident en route. Even as historical reconstruction and philosophy of history, Adorno did not pay any attention nor show any sympathy for the victims of the West and its expansionist march. Even the assaults of the conquistadors on ancient Mexico and Peru, which must have been experienced therein like invasions from another planet, murderously advanced the expansion of rational bourgeois society, irrationally for the Aztecs and Incas, all the way to the conception of one world, teleologically inherent in the principle of that society. 67. Albeit in an objective and irrational way, did colonial expansion contribute to bringing the human race closer together, to realizing a world finally united? One world is the collective subject in which the individual subject and even individual peoples disappear without a trace. To pick up the critique by Adorno directed at Hegel, in any case we have to ask, did colonial expansion not dig an unbridgeable gulf between the world's peoples, conferring on the superior race of the masters the right to enslave and sacrifice en masse the undermen and the untermenschen? If we move from the discovery conquest of America to the French Revolution, the framework doesn't change. The specific privation, at least of the Parisian masses, might have ignited the movement, while in other countries, where it was not so acute. The bourgeois process of emancipation succeeded without a revolution, and at first did not touch the more or less absolutist form of domination. 8. On the theme of the rise of modernity, different countries are compared without considering the colonial question. The more or less absolutist form of domination is denounced with reference to the Bourbon monarchy and Jacobinism in France. But never the power exercised over the black slaves by the white masters. The latter regularly held the office of president in the United States early years. Polemically turning on its head, Hegel's great dictum, "The truth is the whole," Adorno instead claimed, "The whole is the false." Except when he idealized the West's dominant country and the West itself. Adorno confirmed the validity of the aphorism in the Phenomenology of Mind, not the one he proclaimed in Minima Moralia. Hegel makes clear that in attenuating the social conflict beyond the Atlantic, the outlet of colonization had played a large role. 72. The view of the whole allowed the great philosopher of the dialectic to grasp the nexus between the freedom of the white community and the total unfreedom of the native population, which suffered a merciless process of expropriation, deportation, and decimation. This escaped a vision that, infantilizing and absolutizing a particular aspect of the reality investigated, ended up losing sight of the whole. A final consideration. The return to Kant by Adorno was anything but convincing. In the essay Toward Perpetual Peace, which negative dialectics alludes to, there is a memorable denunciation not only of colonial slavery and of colonialism, but also of universal monarchy, as synonymous with a soulless despotism, founded on the oppression of nations and, therefore, destined to fail. Nature has wisely divided the peoples from one another. And this allows for differences in languages and religions. The attempt to unite the world under the banner of international despotism would clash with the resistance of the peoples and would result, if anything, in anarchy. 73. On another occasion, tracing the historical and philosophical results of the French Revolution, Kant observed that if patriotism runs the risk of sliding into exclusivity and of losing sight of the universal, an abstract love of humanity cannot fail to dissipate this inclination through its excessive generality and risks in this way reducing itself to an empty declaration. It is a question then of reconciling global patriotism with local patriotism or with love of country. Whoever is authentically universalist in fealty to his country must have an inclination to promote the well-being of the entire world. Looking closely, Adorno laid claim to a philosopher who had already criticized and refuted his argument. Also keep quiet about capitalism and fascism. With the anti-colonial revolution in full swing, the two leading exponents of critical theory did not limit themselves to counterposing their imperial universalism. Let's read this eloquent declaration from the 1960s. Joy makes men better. It is impossible for happy men, capable of enjoyment, and who see many possibilities for being happy, to be particularly evil. Of Kant and Goethe, it is said that they were great connoisseurs of wines, which means that when they were alone, they were certainly not tormented by jealousy, and they had instead the possibility of enjoyment. They were enriched by 75 experiences. 75. So this is how things stood. Nothing good could come from the wretched of the earth, so dear to Frantz Fanon, or from the anti-colonial movement. And yet, this is the same Horkheimer who recognized that the industrialists approved of Hitler's program. Men who were presumably happy, perhaps because they were great connoisseurs of wines, no less than were Kant and Goethe, but who had shown themselves to be particularly evil in giving the green light to a program of war, colonial expansionism, and annihilation. 76. However, the motivation in question is also present in Adorno. For him, too, the source of evil is resentment, of classes, and of peoples in subaltern conditions, and the rancor that resentment strikes every happiness, even its own, and so a consequence is that satiety has become a term of rebuke a priori, even though the only thing bad about it would be that there are those who have nothing to eat. This last issue was a problem that could be solved technically, that is, not through political action by the disinherited, but by the beneficent intervention of the classes and countries that possess a superior culture and wealth and power. 77. In his time, Nietzsche had rejected any objectivity on the social question, putting it in the category of the resentment of failures. Analogously, the two principal exponents of critical theory likewise deal with the social question at the international level. We can therefore understand that the main target of Adorno's polemic is the revolutionary agitation of the Third World. Today, the fascist fantasy undeniably blends with the nationalism of the so-called underdeveloped countries, which already are no longer called that, but rather developing countries. So also, during the war, in slogans about Western plutocracies and proletarian nations, sympathy was expressed with those who felt that they had come up short in the imperialist competition and wanted to find a seat at the table. It's hard to say if and to what extent this tendency is already embedded in the anti-civilizational, anti-Western current of the German tradition. Whether in Germany, too, there is a convergence of fascist and communist nationalism. 78. After having psychologically delegitimized them as an expression of resentment, using Nietzsche's polemic against the socialist movement, the critical theorist condemns the anti-colonialist and Third World movement also ethically and politically. Behind the agitation is not the desire for justice in international relations, but the aspiration to participate in the imperialist banquet. In this framework, there is no place for the anti-colonialist revolution. The contenders are merely satisfied and now peaceful imperialists and potential imperialists who are more aggressive and dangerous. But to what political reality does Adorno allude when he denounces the substantially fascist character of the nationalism of the so-called underdeveloped countries, or the convergence of fascist and communist? Nationalism? 79. We are in 1959. At that time, only two countries were nurturing a fascist fantasy in a strict sense, Portugal and Spain. Neither of these two was part of the Third World. They were colonial powers, and both considered themselves integral to the West. The first was a founding member of NATO. The second was already on the way to joining this political military organization and would join in 1982. How can we explain, then, Adorno's discourse? 3 years earlier, there had been the colonial expedition by Great Britain, France, and Israel against the Egypt of Nasser, which had nationalized the Suez Canal, and which, enjoying the support of the socialist camp, had called on the Arab world to throw off the colonial and semi-colonial yoke. On that occasion, Anthony Eden, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, which until that moment had controlled the Suez Canal, and a loyal supporter of the empire, portrayed Nasser as a sort of Islamic Mussolini and as a paranoid with the same mental structure as Hitler. At this point, we find a perfect coincidence in the ideology of colonial war and in the philo-colonialist false consciousness of Adorno. The nationalism of Egypt, underdeveloped but determined to recover its national sovereignty and territorial integrity, was fascist, and the support of it by Moscow and Beijing constituted the confirmation of the convergence of fascist and communist nationalism. What is most striking in the declarations we have just seen is that they were made in an essay dedicated to coming to terms with the past, Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit. To take account of Nazism and the horror of the final solution meant taking one's distance from the anti-colonial revolution. It is the viewpoint of Horkheimer as well, who, as demonstrated by a well-informed scholar and admirer of his in our own time, should be recognized for the merit of having promptly identified the inhuman essence of imperialism and the line of continuity under the banner of anti-Western anti-imperialism that supposedly runs from the Third Reich through the national and revolutionary movements of the Third World and Third Worldism. 81. Horkheimer and Adorno began from the assumption that recognizing national differences and demanding respect for them is synonymous with nationalism, chauvinism, and perhaps even racism, so the discourse on the nation should be situated in an ominous political tradition leading to the Third Reich. In reality, the principal Nazi theorist explicitly condemned enthusiasm for nationalism in itself, for the slogan of the right of peoples to self-determination serves all the elements of the inferior races that are on the earth to help them demand freedom for themselves, as did the Negroes of Haiti and Saint-Domingue. 82, we hear stronger than ever here hatred of the national revolutions of the colonial peoples. The particularly barbaric character of Nazism lay, among other things, in its attempt to construct a colonial empire in the heart of Europe itself, with the intention thereby of abolishing the right to self-determination and of autonomous national existence for even those peoples who had until now been recognized by the international community as a whole. The line of continuity that Adorno fantastically declared erased from history the vaunted pathos of the West to defend at all costs against the rise of the colonial peoples of color who had been incited by the Jewish and Bolshevik agitators, as stated in the discourses of Hitler. Horkheimer is the author of a great saying, "Whoever is not willing to talk about capitalism should also keep quiet about fascism." It is a saying that, in a polemic against critical theory itself, could also be reformulated as, whoever is not willing to talk about colonialism should also keep quiet about capitalism and fascism. As we will better see below, the removal of colonialism also made any authentic coming to terms with the past impossible. Contrary to Adorno, Marcuse supports the Hegelian thesis that the truth is the whole. Given this theoretical assumption, he, in retracing the framework of the liberal West, cannot erase the relations it instituted with the Third World and with the colonial and ex-colonial countries. The war in Vietnam has revealed for the first time the nature of the existing society, and the necessity for it is innate in expansion and aggression. Vietnam is in no way just one more foreign policy event, but rather connected with the essence of the system. Beyond the inhuman and unnecessary violence unleashed on that country, what reveals the oppressive nature of the North American Republic considered as a whole is the treatment reserved for the population of colonial origin in the South. Murders and lynchings of blacks go unpunished, though the criminals are well known. The whole must not lose sight of this either when it examines the problem of wealth and poverty. The conquest of scarcity is still confined to small areas of advanced industrial society. Their prosperity covers up the inferno inside and outside their borders. It thus hides the areas of poverty in the capitalist metropoles, and above all, the desperate poverty of the colonies and semi-colonies. Therefore, it is essential to recover the categories usually left out of the dominant ideology. Indignation for the neo-colonial massacres must push us to end colonialism and abandonment of neo-colonialism in all its forms. Above all, the world is experimenting with an imperialism of a reach and a power unexampled until now in history. It is an aggressiveness that threatens not only small countries, faced with the immense aggressive force of the system of late capitalism and of the United States in particular. Eastern totalitarianism in reality was on the defensive, and indeed, it was defending itself desperately. Even if rediscovered with difficulty, in an uncertain and oscillating way, the category of imperialism tended to put in crisis that of totalitarianism. Marcuse well understood the problems facing the countries weighed down by the colonial yoke. They were inclined toward a widespread presumption that remaining independent would require rapid industrialization and attainment of a level of productivity. But industrialization in these backward areas does not take place in a vacuum. The transformation of underdeveloped into industrial societies must as quickly as possible discard the pre-technological forms. And here is the greatest difficulty. In these same countries, the dead weight of pre-technological and even pre-bourgeois customs and conditions offers a strong resistance to such a superimposed development. Therefore, Marcuse asked, can one reasonably assume that, under the impact of the two great systems of total technological administration, the dissolution of this resistance will proceed in liberal and democratic forms? This would be an unrealistic expectation. On the contrary, it rather seems that the superimposed development of these countries will bring about a period of total administration more violent and more rigid than that, traversed by the advanced societies, which can build on the achievements of the liberalistic era. To sum up, the backward areas are likely to succumb either to one of the various forms of neocolonialism or to a more or less terroristic system of primary accumulation. 92. The Soviet Union had found itself in a position not very different from the newly independent countries. We know the dangers from the immense, aggressive force of the capitalist and imperialist West weighed upon it. In what way could the USSR have confronted the threat? By the power of total administration, automation in the Soviet system can proceed more rapidly, once a certain technical level has been attained. 3. As for the newly independent countries, for the Soviet Union, the choice was between capitulation to colonialism and imperialism and accelerated economic and technological development, which could be accomplished only by sacrificing, to a greater or lesser degree, the exigencies of democracy. But, as if faced with this conclusion, which emerged from his own analysis, Marcuse retreated, shocked, and not from lack of intellectual courage, but because he did not fully grasp the progressive and emancipatory reach of the world anti-colonialist revolution. He warmly welcomed the struggle for national liberation of the Vietnamese people, who with the poorest weapons can keep in check the most efficient system of destruction of all times, representing a world historical novelty. More generally, the national liberation fronts can make a precious contribution to the crisis of the system of capitalism. And yet, causes for doubt were not far behind. Yes, the victory of the Vietnamese resistance is an immensely positive and constructive step, but this has nothing to do with the construction of a socialist society. For the newly independent countries, rapid economic and technological development was a question of life and death. However, is there any evidence that the former colonial or semi-colonial areas might adopt a way of industrialization essentially different from the model of capitalism and substantially copied by the Soviet Union? The philosopher who argued in this way was not touched by doubt. Didn't the transcendence of an international division of labor that saw a handful of countries hold a monopoly on technology and on technologically advanced industry to exercise a not purely economic power over the rest of the world have something to do with the realization of a way of industrialization, essentially different from the past? After speaking about the persistent scarcity outside the advanced industrial societies as an inferno, Marcuse seemed to consider the reduction of this infernal area irrelevant. He called attention to the scandal of extreme polarization between the comfort of advanced industrial society and the desperate misery of the third world, but then argued as if its development was not in any substantial way a novelty or alternative to the existing order. Why should reducing planetary social polarization be less important than reducing it within a single country? We think of the proverbial situation of not seeing the forest for the trees. The result was paradoxical, after having called attention to the conflict between the anti-colonial revolution and colonialist and imperialist reaction. Unsatisfied by the insufficiently different and new character of the political and social reality that was emerging, Marcuse invites us to take note that the world system is by now united for life and death, utopia. If Vietnam was the reason for the rift between the philosophers of critical theory and concrete utopia, their condemnations of the United States intersect and conflict with the declarations of support. Unity was re-established on the occasion of the Six-Day War, June 5, 1967, that saw Israel triumph over Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Certainly, this unity I refer to was far from being set in stone. Horkheimer and Adorno identified so completely with Israel that they did not even worry about defending it from the accusation of colonialism or imperialism that was leveled at that moment by anti-colonialist and third worldist forces. On the contrary, for the two exponents of critical theory, it was a question of putting these very forces on trial as the accused. Although on the most immediate political level, Bloch took a very similar position to Horkheimer and Adorno. On a different note, he also defended Israel from the accusation of colonialism or imperialism. It is true, he argued, that it was a country that enjoyed the support of the U.S. president, the Johnson of the Vietnam War, itself a colonial and imperialist war. However, we must not confuse different things. In conformity with his style of thought, the philosopher of the concrete utopia evoked a bright future under the banner of peaceful coexistence and symbiosis between Jews and Arabs. He declared further that he did not recognize himself in Zionism, and he regretted that the founding of Israel happened under the ideology of Herzl, the follower of nationalism, who was in no way inclined to the symbiosis with the other peoples residing in the territory. And so he explained the injustice that the new state imposes on Arab refugees and the Arab minority remaining in Israel. Things would have gone very differently if the political line and legacy of the internationalist and socialist Moses Hess, worthy heir to the great tradition of the Hebrew prophets, had prevailed instead. However, updating a glorious past, one can hope for a new symbiosis between Arabs and Jews, and even in case of necessity, an asymbiosis that sees the autonomy of Israel guaranteed in the context of an infinitely larger Arab state space. Unfortunately, despite the evocation of a radiant future and perhaps corresponding utopia, things looked quite different as far as the present was concerned. Bloch did not limit himself to totally identifying with Israel. He was not content to merely support the war against Nasser's Egypt. He went further. He accused Nasser of following a Nazi model, of being inspired by a hatred against Jews up to the final solution, and all this with the complicity of the entire Arab world, from which come mortal threats against Israel. And so the left that in some fashion supported the Arab cause itself emitted sounds of a pogrom, whether it was aware of doing so. So arguing, the philosopher of the concrete utopia ended up accusing anti-colonialism and third worldism in their entirety in the same manner as the two exponents of critical theory. It is worth noting that, even if they wanted to erase the Palestinian tragedy in the Middle East in those years, colonialism was alive, and well, even in its classical form and with racist connotations. Little over a decade earlier, in 1956, Egypt, for having nationalized the Suez Canal, was subjected to a joint attack by Israel, Great Britain, anything but inclined to renounce its empire, and France, which decided to teach Nasser a lesson to consolidate its shaky dominion over Algeria. Notwithstanding the disagreement and the rivalry between Washington and London, if Churchill had called on the West to sustain the presence of England in the Suez Canal to prevent a massacre of the whites, Eisenhower had lamented that with the nationalization of the Suez Canal, Nasser sought to overthrow the whites. Clearly, for these two Western statesmen, the Arabs continue to be part of the Negroid population. 100%. We know that the pathos of the white race was anything but foreign to Hitler, but Bloch still had no trouble putting Nasser in the same camp. On the occasion of the 1967 war, the most problematic seemed to be Marcuse. His recommended attitude does not imply a complete acceptance of the arguments of Israel nor of those of its adversaries. On the one hand, the founding of Israel as an autonomous state can be defined as illegitimate to the extent that it happened thanks to an international accord, on foreign soil and without considering the local population. I admit that to the initial injustice, others have been added on the part of Israel. The treatment of the Arab population was reprehensible, if not worse. Israel's policy has revealed racist and nationalist traits that we Jews should be the first to reject. A third injustice is the fact, I believe incontrovertible, that from the founding of the state, Israeli policy has followed too passively American foreign policy. Never on any occasion have the representatives or the representative of Israel in the United Nations taken a position in favor of the struggle for liberation of the Third World against imperialism. 101, on the other hand, the initial injustice cannot be repaired by a second injustice. The state of Israel exists, and a place of meeting and understanding must be found with the hostile world surrounding it. In the second place, we must also consider the repeated attempts at accord made by Israel and always rejected by the representatives of the Arab world. And in the third place of the declarations, not generic but clear and strong, by Arab spokesmen on wanting to conduct a war of annihilation against Israel. 102. Such a tortured calculus of the wrongs and rights seems like it must go hand in hand with doubts and uncertainties. Instead, the conclusion was peremptory. In these circumstances, the preventive war, as in fact was the war against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, could and must be understood and justified. It was a conclusion entirely based on the assumption of a war of annihilation that the Arab states are scolded for. That assumption had behind it the terrible memory of the final solution. Yet not only was it not demonstrated to be true, its meaning was not even made clear or precise. Historically, the annihilation of a state or a country has not been a rare phenomenon. One thinks of Poland at the end of the 18th century divided between Russia, Austria, and Prussia of the states, or statelets, absorbed into a larger entity in the course of the national unification process in Italy or Germany, of the disappearance of the Confederate States of America at the end of the American Civil War, of the dissolving of the Soviet Union, or the evil empire in the words of its implacable foe, Ronald Reagan. Or one thinks of the transformation of the old South Africa founded on white supremacy into a completely new South Africa. In all these cases, the political annihilation of a state, however arbitrary and unjust it may be, did not bring about the physical annihilation of its inhabitants. Marcuse flew above all this. His certainty, however, was fragile. On the left in the United States, there is a quite strong and entirely understandable tendency to identify with Israel. On the other hand, the left, particularly the Marxist left, cannot pretend to ignore that the Arab world coincides in part with the anti-imperialist camp. In this case, emotional and conceptual solidarity are objectively separate, indeed even split. Why does emotional solidarity win out over conceptual solidarity? At least for a philosopher, it should be the opposite. Marcuse justifies himself by recourse to his Jewish ancestry. You understand how I feel solidarity with, and I identify with Israel for very personal and not only personal reasons. Letting oneself give in to and wasn't letting oneself give into ethnic connections. the viewpoint of German social democracy of the era of Wilhelm II. And so, June 1967 was the August 4th of critical theory and of the concrete utopia, and, in fact, of Marcuse himself. 1968, and the mass equivocation of Western Marxism. During the 1960s and 1970s, mass equivocation characterized the Marxist left in Europe and the United States. The great demonstrations in favor of Vietnam connected happily with the homage paid to Adorno and Horkheimer, who considered the movements of national liberation backward and reactionary, and who watched from a distance, or, in the case of the latter, did not fail to support the war the United States unleashed in Vietnam. In those years, together with Vietnam, China also enjoyed mass support, but we find here another comedy of equivocation, and not only because the People's Republic, born of a centuries-old struggle for national and anti-colonial liberation, aspired to put itself at the head of the movements of national and anti-colonial liberation disdained by critical theory. There is another reason. In 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. In Italy, the Communist daily Il Manifesto saluted him in its first issue April 18th. With an article by K.S. Carroll that expressed pleasure that during the Cultural Revolution, the party and state apparatuses were strongly reduced. It was the start of the realization of utopia and the beginning of the withering away of the state. In reality, Mao had publicly distanced himself from that ideal some years before in exercising power on a national scale. By now, it was clear that the organs of our state would endure indefinitely. Let's take the courts. We'll still need courts 10,000 years from now, even after. The elimination of classes, the contradictions, even if no longer antagonistic, will have continued and survived under communism and require a juridical and state order to regulate them. 106 regarding the Cultural Revolution in 1969 on the occasion of the 9th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, Lin Biao. At that moment, the designated heir to Mao Zedong had made the objectives pursued by the leaders of Beijing unequivocally clear. As the 16-point decision indicates, the great proletarian cultural revolution is a powerful force for developing the social productive forces in our country. Our country has seen good harvests in agricultural production for years running, and there is also a thriving situation in industrial production in science and technology. The enthusiasm of the broad masses of the working people both in revolution and production has soared to unprecedented heights. Many factories, mines, and other enterprises have time and again topped their production records, creating all-time highs in production. The technical revolution is making constant progress. Grasp revolution, promote production. This principle is absolutely correct. 107. This was a point Lin Biao insisted on forcefully. We must firmly grasp revolution and energetically promote production and fulfill and overfulfill our plans for developing the national economy. It is certain that the great victory in the great proletarian cultural revolution will continue to bring about new leaps forward on the economic front and in our cause of socialist construction as a whole. 108. Mao Biatman's made against the deposed president of the People's Republic of China, Liu Shaoqi, was the doctrine of, namely, incomprehension of the fact that the Cultural Revolution would, in the eyes of its advocates, accelerate prodigiously the development of the productive forces, bringing the country rapidly up to the level of the more advanced capitalist countries. 109. The Cultural Revolution relaunched the Great Leap Forward that had been going on since 1958, through which China adventurously hoped to make record time in economic and industrial development thanks to the mass mobilization and enthusiasm for work and production. What did Western Marxism understand of all this? In Italy, the same people enthusiastic over the new course adopted by Beijing also welcomed the book whose central thesis was that the socialist revolution would suppress work, and in so doing, it will abolish class domination. Suppression of work by the working class and the violent destruction of capital are one and the same. 110. At this point, the comedy of equivocations reached its culmination. Already in 1937, in the essay On Practice, Mao had made clear the centrality of activity in material production to the growth not only of social wealth, but also of human consciousness. Indeed, the small scale of production limited man's outlook. Thanks to its pedagogical function, activity in material production was not destined to disappear, even in the classless society. In the West, instead, celebrating the leader of the Chinese Revolution could be connected to the expectation of the end of work. The essay On Practice was cited often, but only to discuss the class struggle, removing both the struggle for production and the struggle for scientific experimentation. With the principal slogan launched by the Cultural Revolution, Make Revolution, Increase Production, Western Marxism forgot Mao's thought to which it paid homage. Moreover, the slogan, Worker Suppression of Work, also broke with Marx and the post-capitalist scenario he had sketched. According to the Communist Manifesto, the proletariat will use its political supremacy and control of the means of production to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. These general theses assumed a particular importance in the East. After shaking off the colonial yoke, the countries and peoples of the newly independent states were committed to consolidating this independence. Economically, they did not want to depend on their ex-masters' alms and arbitrary will. They considered it essential to break the monopoly that the most powerful countries held, and in part and to a declining degree, they still hold over the most advanced technology. Mao, who in 1949 had already sought to guard against the danger for the Chinese People's Republic of economically becoming an American colony, felt a strong commitment to abolish two types of inequality, that existing inside of China, but also, and perhaps even more so, that which separated China from the more advanced countries. Powerfully accelerating the development of the productive forces, overcoming the former contradiction would have facilitated the overcoming of the latter. In this way, the Chinese nation would rise steadily, and the long struggle for recognition made necessary by oppression and the humiliation imposed by imperialism would be crowned with complete success, thanks to a political revolution to promote equality both domestically and internationally, and thanks at the same time to the powerful development of the productive forces, the Asian country would become an irresistible model for the world anti-colonialist revolution, and for building socialism. The Vietnamese communists expressed a similar view. While completely immersed in the war for independence and national unity, the then first secretary of the Workers' Party of North Vietnam declared that once power had been achieved, the most important task would be the technical revolution. Starting from that moment, it was the productive forces that played the decisive role. It was, therefore, a matter of working hard to higher level of productivity, stimulating the construction of the economy and the development of production. 113. Of the great conflicts going on in Asia and throughout the Third World, Western Marxism perceived only one aspect, that of the revolt against capitalism, more than that against imperialism. Scarce attention was reserved for the struggles for national liberation, and above all that of the revolt against power as such. It was in this sense that the West read the slogan, "It is right to rebel," with which Mao sought to rid himself of the adversaries who still occupied important positions of power in the Communist Party. If in China rebellion was invoked to free the enthusiastic commitment of the masses, at work and in the development of social wealth, in the West, rebellion against power as such made impossible the building of an alternative social order, and reduced Marxism to an impotent critical theory, or in the best of hypotheses, to messianic expectations. Anarchy was the objective and unforeseen result of the Cultural Revolution, remedied by the army's intervention. In the West, instead, the appeal to rebellion against power as such, in society and at work, served to reboot anarchism theoretically as well. Defeated with effort by Marxism during the Second International, anarchism was to see a spectacular revenge in the movement of 1968 and in important sectors of Western Marxism in those years. Even authors strongly committed to the struggle against colonialism could not resist it. Let's take Jean-Paul Sartre. As is made clear in a key chapter of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, various human conflicts ultimately derive from scarcity rareté, to which a decisive role is attributed. Scarcity, whatever form it takes, dominates all praxis. In reciprocity modified by scarcity, the same person appears to us as the counter-human insofar as this same person appears to us as radically other, i.e. the bearer of a death threat to US 114. The result of this assumption is devastating. To the extent that it appears to make a struggle of life and death necessary, the condition of scarcity ends up justifying the oppressors themselves, who are in some fashion also victims of a tragic struggle for survival that, in the present, imposes itself, and which in the future could be eliminated only by the development of the productive forces. On the opposite side, the oppressors appear moved first and foremost, or even exclusively, by the desire to escape from the intolerable conditions of life. But then, given that language, culture, identity, and national dignity play no role in this situation, it becomes impossible for the part of the social strata that enjoys a comfortable life or more or less considerable ease to understand participation in struggles against national oppression. The Wretched of the Earth by the Algerian revolutionary Fanon refutes Sartre. The French philosopher contributed a passionate preface to Fanon's book. Today, we know that in the first phase of the national struggle, colonialism tries to disarm national demands by putting forward economic doctrines. As soon as the first demands are set out, colonialism pretends to consider them, recognizing with ostentatious humility that the territory suffers from serious underdevelopment, which necessitates a great economic and social effort. The rejection of economic doctrines is, in fact, the critique of the thesis that would make the colonial question derive exclusively from scarcity. In Sartre himself, there was a contradiction. If the Critique of Dialectical Reason relies on scarcity, in the preface to The Wretched of the Earth, the heavy lifting is done by the paradigm of recognition, the enemies of mankind obstinately deny recognition to the race of less than humans, such as the Algerians and the colonial peoples in general. 116. As we see, indignation over the crimes of colonialism and empathy and solidarity with the colonial peoples in their struggle against oppression did not guarantee an adequate understanding of the national question. For Sartre, the protagonists of the anti-colonial revolution were always the wretched of the earth, engaged in a desperate struggle to liberate themselves from colonial domination. Missing, however, was any reference to the second stage of the anti-colonial revolution, which focused on economic construction. Fanon insisted forcefully on this, to make concrete and solid the independence won. Thanks to the armed struggle, the newly independent country must leave behind underdevelopment. The commitment to work and production thus took the place of courage in battle. The figure of the more or less skilled worker took over from that of the guerrilla fighter. When it is forced to surrender, the colonial power seems to say to the revolutionaries, since you want independence, take it and starve. And so, in this way, the apotheosis of independence is transformed into the curse of independence. This new challenge of a non-military character required knowing how to reply, now to do all this, other things are needed over and above human output. Capital of all kinds, technicians, engineers, skilled mechanics, and so on. What was needed was a gigantic effort by an entire people. 117. The impasse in many African countries that failed to move from the military phase to the economic phase of the revolution was somewhat to be expected. On the other hand, this turning point was achieved by anti-colonial revolutions, such as the Chinese, Vietnamese, and Algerian. We are in 1961. In that year, another eminent theoretician of the anti-colonialist revolution dedicated a book to Toussaint Louverture that also was a summing up of the revolution, of which the great black Jacobin was a central protagonist. After the military victory, he posed the problem of economic construction. To this end, he fostered a culture of work and productivity, and even sought to utilize white technicians and experts from the defeated enemy. This was exactly what Lenin would do in the years of the NEPI, introducing into workplaces the end of indolence and the most rigorous discipline, and turning to bourgeois specialists. It is a point that was difficult for Sartre to understand and accept. The theory of revolution formulated in the Critique of Dialectical Reason expressed disappointment that the fused group, a protagonist of the overthrow of the ancien regime filled with revolutionary enthusiasm, tends to transform itself after the assumption of power into a practico-inert structure, with new hierarchies that take the place of those overthrown. But it is not the fused group that can achieve economic and technological development in a newly independent country, an anti-colonial revolution, or one in a country at the margins of the more advanced capitalist world and therefore exposed to the dangers of aggression. And colonial or neo-colonial subjection is truly victorious only if it can boost economic construction. Given Sartre's philosophical assumptions, he showed little interest in understanding this problem. The pathos of the subject, our point of departure is indeed the subjectivity of the individual, and the polemic against the myth of objectivity flowed from a subjective idealism. What is needed is, in a word, a philosophical theory that shows that human reality is action, and that action upon the universe is identical with the understanding of that universe as it is, or, in other words, that action is the unmasking of reality and, at the same time, a modification of that reality. We are led to think of Fichte, for whom the French Revolution found its theoretical expression in the philosophy of Fichte himself, which liberated the subject from the constraints of things in themselves, from external influences, and in the final analysis, from material objectivity. It is a vision that can perhaps stimulate the overthrow of the ancien regime of colonial domination. But that is of little help as soon as economic construction necessary for establishing real independence is called upon to take account of material objectivity with things in themselves. 121. We have seen Sartre stress action as an instrument for understanding and transforming political reality. The action he speaks of is exclusively political. Quite different is the argument of the leaders of the anti-colonial revolution. In 1937, Mao Zedong insisted that the truth comes not from solitary speculation, but from the process of social practice. But Mao quickly added that beyond the class struggle or political action, material production and scientific experimentation were both integral parts of social practice. Engaged in governing the liberated areas during the anti-colonial revolution, the Chinese leader could certainly not ignore the challenge of material objectivity inherent in fulfilling the unavoidable task of economic and technological development, concentrating his attention only on the desperate efforts of the wretched of the earth to break the chains of their colonial enslavement, and reserving his empathy exclusively for the fused group. The subject of a magical but brief moment of the revolution, that of the collective enthusiasm that accompanies the overthrow of the universally hated ancien regime. Sartre championed an anti-colonialism that was passionate and praiseworthy, but that remained populist and idealist. It was an anti-colonialism that could not understand the phases of the revolution involving the construction of a new order. So, as Fanon explained, technical competence became the slogan of the day. To cite the Algerian revolutionary again, the grandiose effort of an entire people is needed, or, to use this time Césaire's phrase, the end of indolence and the most rigorous discipline at work. 14. Timpanaro, anti-colonialism, and anarchism. Sebastiano Timpanaro also demonstrates an understanding of the colonial question, and he harshly criticizes the Marxism developed in the capitalist metropoles for being incapable of seeing beyond itself. Between the 19th and 20th centuries, the Marxism of the Second International was in the grips of a schematic and tenaciously Eurocentric philosophy of history that paid little attention to the militarist and reactionary adventures of the bourgeoisie and the imperialist phase of capitalism. And the turning point with the October Revolution? Unfortunately, only a partial one. Eurocentrism and the scarce attention paid to the tragedies inflicted by Europe and the West on the colonial peoples were anything but transcended by Western Marxism, which was inclined to anti-Leninism. And it became accentuated. It was a ruinous tendency became accentuated, although necessary. De-Stalinization, because of the confused way in which it was prosecuted and the potentially social democratic character, which it all too soon acquired, led to a reflorescence of westernizing tendencies. But, as with Sartre, even in the case of this Italian philologist-philosopher, though in a different way, we find a mismatch between the political platform and the theoretical categories. It is true, referring to Lenin, that Timpanaro recognized the continued existence of national questions, 127, which were legitimate given the oppression by imperialism, and that he unhesitatingly supported the struggle of the Vietnamese people against U.S. imperialism. However, he cast a heavy shadow of suspicion on national liberation movements when they assimilated racial hatreds and national conflicts. On AD, the individual may feel, because of mystifying ideologies, national, religious, or racial solidarity above class solidarity. But it is precisely in each case mystifying ideologies that seek to conceal the inconsistency of race and nation as biological cultural categories. We have seen that an oppressed people's desire for national redemption can be well combined with a universalistic pathos that puts into question the arrogance and the racist intrigues that the colonial powers exemplified. Timpanaro's impassioned anti-colonialist commitment contradicts his theoretical platform on many levels. He takes the Marxist thesis of the withering away of the state and further radicalizes it with an explicit reference to the anarchism of Bakunin, 131. Already unrealistic, the expectation of the vanishing of every norm directly contradicts the military struggle or the economic one and the building or defense of independent national states. The urgency of economic and technological development, an unavoidable precondition for real independence, brings about in China, Vietnam, and Cuba an opening to the market and concessions to the national bourgeoisie, whose entrepreneurial and managerial competence is needed, and the international bourgeoisie, whose assent is needed for access to the most advanced technology. Yet Timpanaro formulated a critical judgment on the policies that in Soviet Russia ended so-called war communism. The NEP, in Lenin's intention, was to be only a transitory catching of breath, whereas, after his death, it became an enduring reality. 132. Together with the nation and the state, the philologist-philosopher seemed to dream of the withering away of the market, a messianic and anarchist vision of post-capitalist society. When he analyzed nation and race, Timpanaro found himself in a dilemma without an escape. Either the nation is biological, as theorists of biological racism maintain, or once we have put aside this ominous vision, there is only the inconsistency of the nation itself. In either case, there was no place for the national or colonial question. With the later Lukács, we can say, either social being is not distinct from being in general, or else it is seen as something radically different without having any longer at all the character of being. What character? We have arrived at the Western philosopher who, together with Gramsci, most intensely identified with Lenin. His early great text, History and Class Consciousness, did not pay much attention to the colonial and national questions. And even in his more mature works, it is curious that the historical account of the period from 1789 to 1814, from the overthrow of the Ancien Regime to the Restoration, lacks any reference to the abolition of black slavery in the colonies, the work of Toussaint Louverture and Robespierre, or of its reintroduction by Napoleon. However, it is a great relief that, in his 1924 book dedicated to Lenin, he analyzes, with precision, the revolutionary role of the nations oppressed and exploited by capitalism. Their struggle was an integral part of the world revolutionary process. He harshly criticizes those who, searching for a purely proletarian revolution, neglect the colonial and national question and end up losing sight of the concrete revolutionary process. 135. Thanks to the attention paid to colonialism and its intrinsic barbarism, the Hungarian philosopher was far from the idealist transfiguration of the liberal West, of which Bloch, Horkheimer, and Adorno repeatedly wrote. He called attention to Marx's denunciation of the enslavement of Ireland, won the British X by the British Empire, and lamented that this denunciation had found little echo in the contemporary English labor movement and the Second International. Unfortunately, we must add that even the thesis that Lukács derives from Lenin of the centrality of the colonial and national question in the context of the world revolutionary process found little echo in Western Marxism. Despite being characterized by various positions, ranging from a committed anti-colonialism but an often fragile theoretical platform to a declared pro-colonialism, on the whole, Western Marxism missed the meeting with the world anti-colonialist revolution.